Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. I sat cross-legged on a white platform in an endless purple expanse. This zone had no sky, no sun, and nothing resembling the waking world. Promise floated near where I tied off a bandage. When I cinched it tight, wincing at the slight stroke of pain, my glowing dagger glided smoothly in, cutting off the bare excess of white cloth. I was going to have another scar on my arm when that healed. Thankfully, it wouldn't debilitate me in a fight, but I wondered when my body would have more scar tissue than normal skin. Your mastery of the first phase has improved dramatically, my bond commented, staring out into the purple nothingness. It fascinated and unnerved the Asura in equal measure, where I simply dissociated until such things didn't bother me anymore. Coming from another world tended to have that effect on your ability to suspend disbelief. I can't use it too often, though, I said, flexing my hand. The leather of my gloves creaked as I clenched and unclenched my fists. The red washed out of them surprisingly easily, considering how many times I bled on them. Though there was a faint tinge that I couldn't remove anymore, my basilisk blood remains close to the surface. If I use the will in succession too many times, it's sure to wake. I usually waited a few days between uses of my will and only engaged the acquire phase when absolutely necessary. I'd been in this zone for a couple of weeks so far, traveling from platform to platform. It was the same zone Arthur had traveled through soon after the creation of his ether core. These were the same platforms that brought forth the creation of the destruction rune and allowed Regis to gain a corporeal form. At least I thought it was the same. Some of the platforms differed slightly from the description. Did that mean this was a different zone, or did it simply adapt to my presence? And your use of the will is partial as well, contractor, Lady Dawn said. Akin to a man who uses an axe only to cut down foes, rather than fell a tree. The phoenix watched as a paper poster drifted in the endless etheric expanse past my glowing white platform. It was far enough away that I would be unable to reach it, even with telekinesis. The words on the front read, Fall Out Boy, and the men displayed clearly resembled the members of the band. Except there were tiny details wrong. A nose a bit too large, a smile too thin, a hairstyle out of place. It was as if the band were drawn from memory. I'd gotten used to random objects that looked like they'd be from Earth drifting in the etheric atmosphere after the first week, where they popped up every couple of days. This one still threw me for a loop. Patrick Stump had an absolutely appalling bowl cut in that poster, and I was nearly certain that the lead singer for Fall Out Boy never wore such an atrocity against nature. If he did, I'd have to stop humming centuries to myself when I cut through hordes of ether beasts. I shook away my bewilderment at the image. What am I missing, then? I asked, taking a glance at the next platform. It hovered in a seemingly endless void, a few shimmering steps of solidified ether inviting me to follow. They followed a predictable pattern: white, red, orange, blue, then black. I just managed to kill the boss monster on my 6th black platform. The full goal of the will is to assimilate the knowledge into yourself, much as you assimilate mana into your muscles, bones, and organs. You disperse this to your very being, instead of using the knowledge of countless phoenixes as a power boost. I rolled that knowledge around in my mind for a moment. Maybe when I get to a place where I can afford to meditate, I said. I made it out of the last boss battle with minimal injuries. I'd improved by leagues working through this zone, the regular testing and increasing difficulty serving as the perfect whetstone for the blade I was. But as ever, I was going to savor this white platform. After a quick meal of protein paste and water, I withdrew my violin from my dimension ring. After the high-octane battle I had just been through, I took this time to try and center myself with one thing I was truly gifted at, music. The clear wood finish of the violin rested comfortably against my collar. But as I set my bow against the strings, I watched Lady Dawn gaze out into the endless abyss. There was something lonely about that image, like a sailor's wife, staring out at the sea for signs of her wayward husband's ship. Do you know any songs? I asked. Anything at all, really? The phoenix didn't respond. The emptiness I felt over our bond seemed to widen, making me feel guilty for asking. If you don't want to. No, contractor, the Asura interrupted, cutting across my thoughts and words. It has been many long years since I have sung. I wonder if I still know how. I settled my violin down, the instrument forgotten for the moment. As with anything, you've just got to try, I said, trying to be encouraging. There were several more moments of almost uncomfortable silence. I opened my mouth to add something more, but then I felt the swell of emotion in her mind. Then she began to sing. It was a quiet, slow song. Her voice was an instrument unto itself, carrying a melody I could never catch with my own. Oh, oh, oh. We are all here for you. We are masters of the sky. Oh, oh, oh. The phoenix's voice was soft as a mother's caress, and though I felt no change in the ambient sound mana, the melody she played sounded like magic. Go kiss your young farewell, my dear. Go sleep, you child, there's no need to fight. Birds and wraiths dance without fear. They feel their joy while the day is bright. And drift in silence when we are here. It continued on for several more verses as I listened, mesmerized. It sounded like a lullaby. If you are happy, you'll find peace first. You work your way to a life filled with gold. If you have hope, it will quench your thirst. And leave you well, that's what I'm told. When Lady Dawn finally finished, her hauntingly smooth voice reaching a higher note before slowly tapering off, I watched her in obvious awe. You wondered if you still knew how? I asked, a bit incredulous. I had the distinct impression my bond was uncomfortable under my odd gaze. I quickly shut my mouth. It is an old phoenix lullaby, my bond said, her emotions still settling. I do not know how long it has been since it was created. My mother sang it to me when I was a chick, and I hummed it to my own son when he was young. She was silent for a moment. I wonder if my son will sing the words to his children, or if the song dies with me. She misses her hearth, I realized, understanding the loneliness and sense of loss. I missed Earth and all the opportunities I had lost as well. I smiled slightly, trying my best to add a measure of hope to the Asura. I think I might sing it to my own children if I ever have any, I promised. And I'll tell them they're the next in a very, very long line of children to hear it. The phoenix side-eyed me, but she stayed silent. I didn't know if my words had done any good, or if they were leaves on the wind. The next morning or whatever counted for morning in the relic tombs I faced off the next platform. Orange platforms gave me a unique enemy to fight, forcing me to think outside of the box. Blue platforms had unique puzzles and mind-bending logical puzzles. Black platforms were home to difficult boss monsters that drew all my latent powers and abilities to the fore. But the red platforms, the first in the repeating cycle, were some of the most difficult. They tested my physical and mental fortitude, bombarding me with rampant emotions and sensations that I had to push through. From pervading electric shocks to overwhelming hunger, it seemed that nothing was off the table. Promise floated of its own accord toward me, sheathing itself on my right hip. I had used it earlier to change the bandages on my forearm, which needed cycling after 8 or so hours of rest. Lady Dawn watched the platform with her own kind of apprehension. She wasn't afflicted with the effects of the platforms, but she felt the effects over our bond. Are you prepared? My bond asked me. My apprehension was no secret. As ready as I'll ever be, I thought back, watching the opaque red platform with no small amount of trepidation. I took a single step onto a shimmering red stair, then another. The white platform slowly began to fade behind me as I continued on, the stairs following suit. And soon I was on the red platform. I blinked. I didn't feel any different. Before, the effects had been immediate and like a tide, smashing into me all at once. From the jittering tangle of electric shocks making my knees buckle and the overwhelming hunger both felt as if some switch had been flipped in my brain. I thought, anxious. If I wasn't feeling the effect, that meant I was missing something. I slowly began to track toward the orange stairs, so far away. My footsteps slowed unconsciously as I walked, trying to think of the reason for this platform. They were supposed to make me stronger, weren't they? I spotted the Fall Out Boy poster again as it drifted on invisible currents. Another reminder of my previous life passed by, distorted slightly in every way. I took another step, wondering, would I eventually remember my previous life like that? Images slightly wrong, memories refracted by the glass of time? I wondered sometimes about my previous life. Actually, I thought about it a lot. I was going to be something there, with dreams and aspirations. And maybe I could accomplish some of those in my new world. I could find love, make a successful life for myself, complete with a family and a legacy to enjoy. I took another couple of steps. But there are some things I'll never get back, I thought a bit sourly. Like computers and book clubs, and my family and friends. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered how they were taking my death. Did they mourn me, as I mourned Morgan? I vaguely remembered a car crash. Did the other driver survive? I couldn't remember the circumstances surrounding that last night very well, but I hoped I wasn't a murderer before I was reborn. But if the other driver was at fault, would my family pursue them with the same vengeance I did Kale and Joan? My walking slowed. I missed my old world so much. The constant pain and suffering of Alacria was almost overwhelming at times. I felt so powerful, so sure of my own abilities. I could conjure a fire in my hand and distort the very vibrations of air. And yet people around me starved and died of bladh overdoses. How could I be so powerful in one way and so weak in another? I stopped in the center of the platform, my thoughts coming faster now. After I got out of these relic tombs, I would have to simply go back in again. To increase my strength faster, even as the weakest of them, Nico was a scythe. If I wanted to prevent the legacy's reincarnation, I needed to become at least as powerful as Arthur was near the end of Decathlon's war. Could I even do that? I asked myself. Arthur had his failings, sure, but he was so much more than I was. He grasped his power with his own two hands, driven by his desire to protect others and shelter his loved ones. And yet all around me, people died. How could I ever compare? How could I delude myself into thinking I could kill a scythe? Arthur was a man with nearly 40 years of worldly experience when he reincarnated, compared to my measly 20-something. My knees shook slightly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to simply lay down. The pressure came like it always did, working up my legs, grasping at my back, then weighing on my shoulders. And there it stayed, the lives of countless people depended on my ability to stop the legacy's return. But I should wait to rest until I got to the next platform. That was a better idea, more logical. But what use is logic? A traitorous voice whispered in my mind, in the face of divinity. You seek to kill a demigod. My legs trembled and I opened my mouth, my tongue working like a fish drowning on dry land. Lay down here for a moment, the voice said. Sleep your troubles away. Maybe you'll feel better afterward. Or maybe not. This world doesn't need you, does it? You are not a part of its story. Would it not be simpler to let the world continue as it should? Yes, that was true. I was an outsider to this. How could I tell myself that my actions wouldn't damn this place to hell? I'd failed so many times already. How many people died during that Clearwood Forest expedition? How many brothers did the Jones execute before I got to them? I began to kneel. No, contractor, a quiet voice brushed against my thoughts, but it was small and insignificant compared to all the other voices that vied for my attention in my skull. You are more than this, Torrin Dane, the voice said again, the warmth in its tone pushing back against the hissing thoughts. You are no failure. How am I not? I asked aloud. My voice sounded alien to my own ears, like I was listening to it from far away. I can't expect to do this, to actually alter this world's future. Any change I make can make things so much worse. But I'm just me, quote. And yet you acknowledge the power you have over a predestined fate, the voice soothed. I could recognize it now. My bond was sending a deluge of warmth and comfort over our tether, seeking to reinforce my psyche against the pervading dark. If one touch can make a tower topple, then that touch must be significant indeed. Your story is not one of failure. I straightened slightly. She was right about that. It wasn't all failure, was it? And you wanted to change this world for the better, did you not? I took a few more steps, my vision refocusing on the orange stairs not far away. Yes, I thought. I hated Alacria. I despised it with every ounce of my being. The death, the struggle, the common person broken under the yoke of tyrannical gods. My previous world was not perfect, but it was far easier to grow and thrive when you were allowed to think. And the things I hated about this world were going to change, weren't they? My feet neared the edge of the platform. The voices in my head seethed. But you have already failed, Torrin Dane, they said. How many have died under your watch? How can you compare to the powers you seek to face? You are alone. You stand as a rock amidst a swirling ocean. You may stand for a while, but time weathers all. But the voices were wrong. I couldn't see it at the start, the pervading void encompassing my sight. But there was a kind light that anchored me, pushing through the cold nothingness with the guiding light of a North Star. I rejected the message of despair, leaving my doubts behind. Maybe I would fail. Maybe I would make this world worse through my actions. But I would stand strong in my convictions. I was not alone. I stepped off the red platform. Thank you, Aurora, I thought, sending quiet gratitude toward my bond. Chapter 69, Offer. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alacria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alacria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. I sat on the corpse of a giant beast with dark skin and a disproportionate body. Its tail was segmented in several places, and I knew from experience that it could attach and detach at certain points to create a complex fighting style. I slowly let my acquire phase drift back into my core. The red chains on my arm slowly dimmed, then ceased glowing entirely. I knew that the runic feather stems that shone under my eyes had disappeared, and my pupils which had turned to molten fire reverted to their normal hazel. The heart fire in the ether beast's chest had extinguished a few moments ago, yet I knew that my ability to see a person's life force had vanished in turn. I would need my bond's assistance to work through the assimilation process again soon. Using my phoenix will accelerate the need for dispersing mana through my bones and organs. That wasn't so bad, I said with a weary smile as oath and promise drifted into their sheaths. Truthfully, my rate of improvement and growth had outstripped the challenges thrown at me as I ascended these platforms. Except for one. Your control and technique have indeed improved, Lady Dawn affirmed from the side, appraising the corpse. I collected a few accolades from the monsters I'd slain so far, good materials and remnants that an artificer or instiller could use to improve their works. This body was no different, seeing as a few horns I'd cut were hovering toward me in an outline of white. You do not have nearly as many injuries as you did before. That was also true. As I'd gone through the zone, I had relied heavily on my innate healing factor to rest on the white platforms after boss battles on the black platforms. Yet as my power increased, I was able to avoid taking devastating hits every fight. A shimmering purple portal appeared near the end of the platform. I blinked as I inspected it, unable to see through to the other side. So we're finally done with this zone, I said with a sigh. That was good. I didn't want to go through another red platform. Lady Dawn must have sensed my unease at the idea of continuing on in this zone. I should have recognized that trials effects on your psyche sooner, contractor, she said, a hint of regret in her tone. I will not fail you in such a manner again. I bit back a sigh. The red platforms in this zone tested your mental and physical endurance. But the last one had nearly claimed me, making doubt and despair scrape against the insides of my skull. I get why you didn't notice, I said in a short tone. I wasn't upset with her for not realizing the effects. I hadn't noticed them either. The other red platforms bombarded me with emotions and sensations that were unfamiliar and foreign. One of them made me itch incessantly on every inch of my skin, making it nearly impossible to simply take the steps I needed to get out. Another focused on my sense of amusement, making me feel almost drunk with humor. But I always had those nagging, depressive thoughts at the back of my mind. What happened to the people I loved in my previous life? How could I hope to change this world? Those weren't thoughts I hadn't encountered before, so they did not seem out of the ordinary until it was nearly too late. My bond remained silent, side-eyeing me as her feather red hair rustled in an unseen breeze. I hopped off the large corpse, using a measured push of telekinesis against the ground to slow my fall. I loped to the portal, looking at its liquid purple finish. I had spent 3 weeks or so in the relic tombs. With how time worked in the outside world, only a week or so had passed since the New Year's festival. It seemed I might have to go through a zone or two more to reach an exit portal. I exhaled, then stepped through the pane of light. I went rigid as I saw the next zone. An asphalt road stretched under my feet into the horizon, endless hills curving the landscape. Streetlights adorned a makeshift sidewalk, and 2 portals loomed at the end of a miscolored town. I was in the same zone I'd entered with the unblooded party. The one with strange, 21st century architecture and unnerving design. Except now, the zone had changed. The houses lining the road weren't perfect by any means. There were still small discrepancies. Maybe a window was too large, or the paint on the slats was too bright in contrast to the others. But it appeared as if a mishmash shape made of clay had finally solidified into what it wanted to be. The zone had improved its depiction of American housing in the time since I'd been gone. I felt goosebumps rise along my arms as I turned about warily. I felt like I was being watched, scrutinized by some unseen force. Just as before, it was as if the layers of my soul were being peeled away. I dashed toward one of the houses, wrenching open the door. Instead of an empty white expanse inside, furnishings and decorations for a living room greeted me. A rug was along the floor. A flat-screen TV sat parallel to the window, with a leather couch opposite. My frantic eyes darted over these things for a moment, then I rushed to explore the rest of the house. The kitchen was similar, with a microwave and oven, modern appliances. From poking at them, I knew they didn't work. The cupboards were empty, and no pictures hung on the walls. Hastily, I left that house, darting into the others. They were all the same in their changes. They were like a doll's house, all outward appearance of reality, but once you looked a bit deeper the facade wore away. I wondered then, with an almost manic rush, who the doll was in this scenario. That watching gaze never left me. I felt it from every angle all at once, and simultaneously, none at all. I didn't know whether my senses had improved dramatically from when I'd last been here, or if my watcher was more blatant in their spying. But how many times did an ascender go through the same zone twice? I racked my brain for information in the long binge of relic tombs knowledge I'd gone on before my preliminary ascent. And I came up empty. No ascender had ever entered the same zone twice. It couldn't be a coincidence. My nerves began to settle slightly as I trudged toward the exit portal. I'd been able to leave without incident the last time, but what about now? Instincts had been ingrained in me to fear this dungeon. I turned around, inspecting the repeat zone with hesitant eyes. Nothing jumped out at me. The trees that dotted the far-off landscape didn't hold any monsters or beasts, and the watching gaze never changed. I gulped, then stepped into the exit portal. A while later, I was sitting in a simple waiting booth at the Relic Tombs Ascenders Association. I had dropped off the bulk of my accolades here, and the association's dedicated appraisal teams were looking over what I brought and cataloging how much they'd be willing to pay for them. And so I waited. I quickly confirmed after exiting the tombs that only 10 days had passed on the surface since I entered the Relic Tombs, and I was nervous to see what had happened to my friends in East Fiatra with indoctrination looming over their shoulders. I hope great she's doing all right, I thought, remembering the kindly woman. She's got enough on her plate without the entire district to worry about. She is a driven woman, my bond affirmed, though I have doubts as to how long she will last with such stress. I hummed, distracting myself by counting the number of repeating patterns on the intricate ceiling above me. The Ascenders Association buildings were grand, with decor and aesthetics fitting for a palace. It always struck me as incongruous, seeing giant mountains of men with half their chests exposed waltzing around these buildings. Someone entered my field of view from the side, drawing my eye. They wore dark trousers and simple chainmail armor, but their stark white hair set them apart from many of the random mages milling about. The man seemed to be searching for something, his head turning about slowly and eyes roaming. When they landed on me, however, I felt apprehension rise. Those teal eyes were vaguely familiar. Nerves, I thought, the ascender I'd met in the Shimmerkin's horde. He strode toward me with purpose, a confident and graceful gait accompanying him. There was something strapped to his hip that I couldn't make out just yet. I stood slowly, feeling a strange mix of dread and calm. My last conversation with this ascender shouldn't have revealed much about my abilities or the effects I had on the relic tombs, but I got the sense this mage was looking for me in particular. He approached me without a hint of caution, giving me a critical once-over. Torin Dane, good to see you again, he said in greeting, his voice unconcerned. I see you just got done with an ascent. I narrowed my eyes, feeling immediately suspicious of Nerves. Had he sought me out in particular? I did, I said slowly, though I'm afraid I don't have time to talk. I'm trading in accolades now, and then I'll be on my way. What are you here for, Nerves? Nerves was unfazed by my obvious attempt to ward him off. Ah, I remember the first time I submitted my accolades for appraisal, he said, nodding. Where's your team? Did they not accompany you to turn in their own cut of the accolades? I squared my shoulders more. I ascended solo. I didn't have a team. That made Nerves start, looking at me with something approaching respect. You're going the path of a solo ascender? He asked, questioning. Immediately after your prelim? I raised a brow. I survived, didn't I? Nerves shrugged. There aren't many solo ascenders, and I'm one of the few. Are you sure you don't want a bit of time to learn the ropes? I think I've managed well so far, I said, trying to piece together Nerves' implications. The mage across from me crossed his arms with a slight sigh, looking me up and down once more. I'm going to be frank with you, Torin Dane. My blood can offer to sponsor you on your future ascents. You seem promising, and you've already gone on a solo ascent after your prelim and made it out alive. I felt a wave of disorientation wash over me from how quickly Nerves switched tactics. It sounded like he was trying to be subtle at first, but dropped the act out of nowhere. Okay, hold on, I said raising a hand. I don't know you or your blood, Nerves, and I don't know what you want in return. The white-haired man kept his arms crossed, tapping a few fingers against his arm. I do not like the cloak and daggers of politics, Torin Dane, so I'll tell you straight. High Blood Denor can sponsor you with anything you need to succeed. New armor, better weapons, teammates who can help you train, the best elixirs in. High Blood Denor? I said a bit breathily, cutting Nerves off. You're from High Blood Denor? A few mages were giving me envious looks at my outburst, but I ignored them. The man in front of me smirked slightly, his white teeth matching his beard. Severin of High Blood Denor, at your service, he said, causing my shock to drop into something deeper. And our blood constantly sponsors promising ascenders, taking a cut of their earnings as payment. But you don't need to do that for our favor, he said, talking through the shock I must be displaying. Instead, you only need to do one thing for me. I forcefully dismissed my surprise at hearing the name Severin Denor. I made a little box and dumped all of my questions into it, then locked it away. It wouldn't hold, but I needed peace of mind in this interaction. And what would single favor be? I asked. God, why couldn't I see it before? Nerves was literally Severin backward. I'll go on a few ascents with you, Severin started. I want to see more of the relic tombs, and the best way is to go with different people. Sierra said the same thing as Hadrig when she approached Gray. I remembered, thinking this entire situation was rather ironic. The young woman probably heard it from her brother, then. Was this how Arthur felt, being accosted by a strange man and asked to go on an ascent? No, I said without hesitation. A bit of shock rolled over the people eavesdropping, and I watched Severin's face scrunch up slightly. I'm a solo ascender. If you want, we can set the exact number of cents in a legal contract, including your own benefits, Severin began. I cut him off, waving a hand dismissively. No, that's not what I meant. I mean that I won't take people with me, at all. With how the relic tombs reacted to my presence, I was unwilling to bring people with me. How long would it take for someone to put two and two together that items from another world were popping up around me? How long would it take before that drew the attention of the sovereigns? No, I could only be a solo ascender, even if it meant rejecting the status that would come with being associated with one of the most powerful high bloods in Alacria. I heard a few gasps from the nearby ascenders who were doing a poor job of hiding how they were listening in. Severin's face went carefully neutral, but I could swear I saw a spark of something flash in his teal eyes. I stood straight, keeping my posture firm and reinforcing my rejection of his offer. I'm afraid that's non-negotiable. I can do other things for you, even give your blood a cut of my earnings. But I ascend alone. Severin scrutinized me with a piercing look. As he did so, that little box I'd shoved all my questions into began to slowly overflow. Sierra said that Severin was extremely knowledgeable about the relic tombs, even having unintentionally divined some of their true purposes in bestowing insight. The more I thought about it, the more my apprehension built. This mage had sought me out expecting my presence to change the relic tombs. How much did he know? How much could the unblooded party even tell him? All right, Severin said slowly, reaching into a pocket. As his hand moved, I spotted a large dagger strapped to his side, the white bone handle standing out starkly against his dark clothing. A simple hexagon was scratched into the handle. If you ever change your mind, he said, holding out a metal card, you can contact me here. High blood Denor can be generous, Torin Dane. I took the card hesitantly just as the receptionist called my name over a speaker, signifying my accolades were done being appraised. I nodded toward Severin in acknowledgement. Thank you. I will hold on to this, in the off chance I do change my mind. Better to keep him hopeful rather than burn bridges. I walked past the scion of high blood Denor, heir to one of the most powerful noble families on the continent, toward the receptionist. You're an idiot, kid. Never seen someone with an ego large enough they'd want to stay a solo ascender after that sort of offer, an older mage muttered nearby. Ungrateful, you are. I shrugged off the insult, keeping my gaze forward. I felt Severin's eyes on my back all the way to the desk. Severin Denor. I watched Torin Dane leave the Ascenders Association with a noticeable tenseness in his every step. The young man was strung tighter than a lute. I'd received word from my sources quickly after Torin had exited the relic tombs. I'd been worried when he entered solo, fearing that my next lead would die on his second ascent. Except the weary-looking young man had been resting in the Ascenders Association, waiting for his earnings to be tallied. The result only reinforced my guess that this ascender was different from the rest. His utter insistence on ascending alone might be viewed as a vain sense of ego by anyone else, but I knew better. If Torin's presence changed the relic tombs as he stepped through them, it made sense that he would want it kept close. After all, if he managed it right, he could get a relic. Not even all the assurances of high blood Denor would make up for that. I thought back to my last conversation with Sierra. I felt like I was close to a revelation into my new subject. I just needed another push, some sort of connection. I was hoping that the new scenery I might see in the relic tombs alongside Torin Dane might add that final puzzle piece. But if Torin didn't contact me himself, I had other ways to follow through. Simulates were not the most complex artifacts to dissect and understand, especially with the assistance of my regalia, scouring purpose. I flipped open my ether compass, noting the brilliant purple dot on its face slowly fading as Torin walked away. Chapter 70, Oppression. Published by web novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alacria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alacria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. The air of Theatra was a biting kiss on my cheek, the January weather unabating and demanding. Though the streets radiated warmth under my feet, the wind didn't care. I was walking toward East Theatra, intent on checking up on my thieves in arms. There wasn't any snow on the roofs, but I was certain it would eventually come. The city of canals never went a winter without a storm. I walked over one of the canal bridges, noting the lack of people out and about in East Theatra. I slowed in my trek, sensing something amiss. It was late afternoon right now, and usually I would see some people out and about on the streets. The fact that I couldn't made me uneasy for a reason I couldn't define. Lady Dawn, I asked my bond, jumping to the rooftops on instinct. Do you sense anything off? See anything amiss? There is no foot traffic in these streets, the Asura said, affirming my earlier observation. The common folk should be walking home from their work at this time of day. Yet you can see lights on in most of the windows visible. I squinted, peering around. I was in the lower middle class area of East Theatra, close to where my old apartment used to be. As such, I was able to spot a dozen lights on. So people are home, just not about, I thought, frowning. What could this mean? My bond and I were in agreement that it couldn't be good. The streets were surprisingly empty all throughout East Theatra, even where I was used to seeing those down on their life wallowing in the low shadows and cold corners of the road. Trepidation grew as I moved from rooftop to rooftop, but I soon noticed people out and about. Except they were not natives. I could tell that simply from their blatant monosignatures, radiating outward as they walked in pairs. I squinted as I spied them from a rooftop, noting their doctrination robes with growing anger. The robes were noticeably shorter than the usual style, and from how the men stepped lightly, I realized it was to avoid getting mud on their clothes. Of course, they couldn't stain their pristine dark coats. But once the flash of anger passed, this only increased my growing desperation. If the doctrination was doing something in the streets, were Nareni, Wade, Carcian, and Hoffel all right? How was Greed faring? Was she safe? I couldn't seem to move fast enough as these questions sounded in my head. I bounded over rooftops, using controlled bursts of telekinesis and free running to move through the city. Now that I knew what to look for, what to sense for, I was able to feel the monosignatures of doctrination vicars patrolling all about East Theatra. The numbers made my fists clench with worry. Easily several dozen pairs were patrolling the streets. I dropped into the cistern without bothering to cushion my fall. I focused my senses out with a hint of desperation, but I immediately felt relief when 4 monosignatures blared to life in my mind. But before I even walked into the cistern's main room, I felt the tension thick in the air. I slowed, entering from the side. Nareni was curled up on one of the couches, holding on to Apple the Scander, who was for once not panting like a dog. If a monobeast could look sullen, I thought, that would be it. Carcian was staring at the map, his hands clenched tight. Hoffel was sitting in another chair, his eyes slightly glazed over. A broken pipe sat in his hands. And Wade looked furious. His knuckles dripped red blood onto the floor, their ruined surfaces bleeding profusely. I could see red spots on the wall where he punched the bricks with his bare hands. Hello, I said, breaking the silence. Nareni perked up a bit. Oh, hey Torin, she said quietly. I noticed the doctrination patrolling outside, I said, walking into the room slowly. And I couldn't see anybody outside. They took them all, Wade said harshly, turning on me with a glare that bore into my skull. The doctrination locked them away in their warehouses, saying anybody loitering was wasting the time they could be using to help our sovereigns. What? I said, moving closer to the group. That's absurd. Surely this is illegal in some way? I asked, remembering the high hall and the trials. It absolutely is, Nareni said sadly, nuzzling Apple. But who wants to fight the doctrination? There's no way they'll be getting out. And it's your fault. Wade cut in with a hiss, turning an almost maddened stare on me. If you hadn't antagonized that vicar at the bestowment a week ago, they wouldn't have my mother and sister. You shouldn't have defied them. I stepped backward, surprised by Wade's outburst. I was immediately overcome with a sense of shame. I recognized that my actions were probably foolish, even at the moment. But I always suspected that they would come back to haunt me, not the people I cared for. Hoffel interjected next. That's not fair, Wade. Your family wasn't targeted explicitly, and we both know that Torin's actions weren't enough to spur such an outrageous reaction. This is for some other reason, one we don't understand yet. The sentry huffed, then stalked out of the chamber. I watched him go, still feeling a bit guilty. Thanks, Hoffel, I said, moving over to a chair and sitting down with a thump. Though Wade was right about one thing, I probably should have just let it go. None could have foreseen this, Carcian spoke up. His mask was on, obscuring the deep burns I knew were underneath. But that doesn't mean we will just let it go. I oriented on the man. What are you planning? We need to know the state of those captured. The Doctrination only took those walking under the sun into custody, and Wade's rats were able to track the Vickers to a large warehouse near the refurbished temple. I nodded along. Is there any sort of rescue plan? Any way to get those people free? Hoffel clenched his hands around the two pieces of his pipe. Maybe, but nothing will stop the Vickers from just rounding them up again. Like Woggarts in a pen. I felt a wave of familiar helpless anger coast over me. It felt the exact same as when the Jones had butchered my brother, the illegality of the action irrelevant to the authorities. Except now, it was a vast amount of people in an entire subdistrict. So many Norgans, I thought, gritting my teeth, and none who were willing to simply stand and fight. The rats were willing to risk life and limb for change, but I held no illusions that they'd be able to outmuscle the Doctrination. The Jones were a petty family. The Doctrination held sway over the hearts and minds of all men. But maybe there was a way to outmuscle the Doctrination, I thought, an idea popping up in my mind. I brushed my hand across the metal card Severin Denor had given me, standing out prominently in my pocket. If I accepted Severin's offer of support from the Denors, would that allow me to push back against the Doctrination here? Maybe get some real legal support? After all, the Denors were the ones to get Grey out of the High Hall. My hands feathered over the smooth engraving as I thought. No, I wouldn't be able to guarantee the Denors would go against the Vritra Doctrination, but it was a card I would be able to play if all else were lost. So it's just a scouting mission, Carcian continued. He gave me a once-over. You've gotten stronger, Torin. We'd be happy to have your assistance with this. I nodded, grinding my teeth. What can I do to help? The three of us stood on a rooftop not far from the refurbished temple, which I had yet to see. Nareni and Carcian were busy looking toward the warehouse's position, a rat sitting on Nareni's shoulder. Hoffel wasn't with us for this particular mission, as it would require mobility and stealth beyond his ability. I took a glance at the night sky. I could see the stars here once again, but they seemed dimmer in the wake of this crisis. I was wearing a new rat masquerade mask since the last one had been destroyed. The rat on Nareni's shoulder squeaked, then jumped down, following a few steps to reach another roof. She immediately moved to follow, the rest of the rats trailing after. This is a new way to scout, I said quietly, allowing my voice to be heard with sound magic. It's got something to do with Apple, Nareni replied, also hushed. Wade said he's able to spread his reach farther and give more complex commands to his little minions whenever Apple is close to him. She narrowed her eyes back at me, which is why you can't kill him. He's an important member of the team, now. I rolled my eyes. I might have protested before, but fighting never-ending waves of tree demons had a way of making Scanders seem like an afterthought. Sure, my first encounter with Scanders almost ended up with me dead. But every tree demon I'd met had nearly ended with my death. But Nareni's words also got me thinking. These bonds and wills were practically non-existent in Alacria, for reasons I couldn't fathom. But it was theoretically possible, wasn't it? Had Wade bonded with his Scander in the magical sense? There's a patrol ahead, Carcian said softly. Wait until I tell you all to jump. Wouldn't want you to be discovered snooping, We watched as a couple of Vickers trailed along the streets below, their faces visibly plastered with disgust as they avoided a puddle of mud. Carcian waved his hand forward as they passed, giving us the go-ahead. We continued to stealthily move closer to the warehouse. Our quest was simple. Right now, the rats and I were behind in information. We knew the people of East Fiatra were being held in a warehouse, but we didn't know their condition or why they had been detained in the first place. That was our quest, to dip in, see what we could find, then get out. I muffled our collective footsteps as we got closer. The Doctrination patrols were heavier here, but I'd come a long way since the first time I had to quiet my own steps. With a mix of Carson's direction, Wade's rat, and my stealth efforts, we quickly reached the edges of the warehouse. It didn't look like a warehouse. Religious symbols were marked in freshly dried paint on certain parts of the building, the freshly raised stone standing 4 stories tall at the least. It towered over every other building in the area, the black tone making it seem even darker in the night. There were no windows to be seen, immediately telling me how difficult it would be to get in. The rat, however, spared us those problems. It bounded down the rooftop, scampering on 4 little legs through the dark. It scurried toward one patch of the wall, nudging it with its nose. The 4 of us slowly crowded around it. There was a small door here, presumably a side entrance. I've got it, Nareni spoke up, stepping forward and withdrawing that strange artifact she used on our heist to pick locks. She knelt in front of the door, getting to work. I scanned the deathly still night, my nerves ratcheting up with the awareness of our current situation. Every shifting shadow seemed to contain malicious eyes, ready to report us and doom our operation. We're in, Nareni's voice said triumphantly. I turned back to see the door slowly swinging inward, revealing a dark interior. Good job, Nareni, Carcian affirmed, slipping past while outlined by mist. I was taken aback by the inside of the building. I expected to find the people here, maybe locked up in a cage or watched over by a dozen mages. Instead, I was faced with long rows of crates stretching high into the gloom. We were on our own, now. Wade's rat hadn't explored the inside of the building. Torin, scout the east side of the building. Nareni, you're with me. We're looking for offices of some sort, Carcian said, his bandana covering his face. Meet back here with anything you find. After Nareni followed her leader into the darkness, I looked around. I sensed several mana signatures amidst the stacks of wooden boxes, but most were congregated in Carson's section. I bent my knees, tensing and building up force into my legs. Then I jumped, suppressing the sound of my boots cracking against the stone. I was a dark blur as my body shot toward the ceiling, a barely visible white glow pulling me toward it as I leveraged my telekinesis spellform. I twisted, landing feet first on the ceiling. My emblem locked the soles of my feet to the roof, allowing me a bird's eye view of the entire warehouse. I smirked. I'd picked up a few tricks since I was under Carson's wing. From my high position, I was able to see the sea of crates beneath me. I frowned slightly, wondering why they were here and what the Doctrination was storing. I shook that thought away, enhancing my vision and turning my head. I surveyed the room, trying to find sources of lighter doors that could lead to an office. There, I thought, noticing a place on the east side that opened into an alcove. I darted across the ceiling, utterly silent and dark as a shadow. I noticed a guard in front of the office door, making me frown. How to get rid of him? I lit up with an idea a second later. I shuffled within my dimension ring, withdrawing a rock. I latched onto it with my emblem, making it hover upside down. Then the stone darted down, popping against the ground a few times away from the guard. The vicar's head turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing, but his grip only tightened on a spear in his hands. He didn't move. I clicked my tongue, the sound of which was thankfully masked by my magic. I brought the stone up again, then let it fall once more. The guard finally shifted, seeming a bit nervous, before moving to investigate. When he was several yards away, I dropped, silent as death. I tested the door lock, seeing it wouldn't budge, but thankfully it was not a mana-enforced lock, but a simple pin system. I closed my eyes, focusing on my telekinesis spellform. Then I used it to crush the inside of the locking mechanism, allowing the door to swing open slightly. I smirked. My powers weren't precise enough to pick a lock, but brute force almost always worked. I let the door shut behind me with a non-existent click as I hurried in, scanning the place. My attention focused on a map stretching across the opposite walls. I quickly recognized it as a map of East Fiatra, the subdivisions and landmarks standing out to me. Lines were drawn in bright ink across the paper, stretching from the warehouse I was currently at to different points across the district. Reds and greens crisscrossed in specific manners, ending at God. I breathed, my eyes widening. I didn't recognize the routes, but I knew the endpoints. I'd seen them before the ill-fated assault on the Jones Blythe caches. Wade's network had outlined the common drop-off locations that the Jones used to give out their drug. This is all for delivering Blythe. Quote. Contractor. Lady Dawn blared in my head. Defend yourself. The warning came almost too late. I whirled on instinct, thrusting my hand outward. A pulsing barrier of pushing telekinesis met a twisting stream of mucky green fluid, but I hadn't had time to apply my telekinetic shroud. I felt the opposing magic eating into my own mana, slowly but surely dissolving it. But the lack of a telekinetic shroud might have saved my life. Instead of allowing the acidic spell to reach me, the pushback launched me into a wall, making it crack. I coughed, my mind racing. Oath and promise drew themselves from their sheaths, settling themselves into my waiting hands. I finally felt the pressure settling into my bones, pressing me down to my knees. I watched the remnants of the bright green acidic spell bubbling on the stone floor, the mana greedily ripping apart the earth. Hello again, little mage, a voice like slime dripping down the back of my neck said from above. It was the kind of voice I'd expect from the depths of a bog. Some sort of creature from within rearing its head to speak. I was wondering when I'd see you again. Chapter 71, The Vicar of Plague. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. A monster, Lady Dawn said with restrained anger. Mardith, I thought, gritting my teeth as my neck creaked under the force of his killing intent. The vicar didn't look different from when I last saw him. Yellow-green Blythe stains spotted his gray skin. One eye was a milky white, yet it seemed to stare through me despite its supposed blindness. His lips curled at the edges, malicious enjoyment seeping from seeing me kneel. His horns came to sharpened points that could gore a man. He hovered in the air, his shredded vicar's robe shifting casually. I started to push myself to my feet, gripping oath and promise tighter. The blades shimmered as I funneled mana into them. The pressure redoubled, slamming me down into the ground hard enough to crack it. My telekinetic shroud, which I'd finally raised, creaked from the sheer attention of the mage before me. My panic heightened as I was forced onto my face, the most powerful mage I'd ever met hovering not 10 feet away. My arms burned from straining against the pressure, the air freezing in my lungs. I couldn't breathe. You already pushed past my intent once before, little mage. Show me you've changed. My teeth creaked from how hard I clenched them. Get away from this Lesherin, Lady Dawn said, her anger tempered somewhat by apprehension. You are no match for him. I felt the will drifting closer to my mind. It lashed its tendrils out, wringing my own thoughts into its embrace. The phoenix within denied the power of the Vreetra-blooded mage bearing down on me. I fell into my first phase, the glowing red chains superimposing themselves over my clothing. The familiar warmth pushed back against the pressure around me, allowing me to slowly draw myself to my feet. Mardith watched me with a crinkled eye, smirking slightly as I righted myself under his constant pressure. The air returned to my lungs as my own power rose in a swell. I think you'll find I've changed plenty, I said breathily. I felt the warmth under my eyes where I knew runes glowed like hot coals. Mardith's red life force flared solemnly, yet there was a strange flickering blackness at its core that seemed to drink in the light. Mardith cocked his head. Is that all, little mage? I was expecting more. He held his arms behind his back. Do you know why I left you alive last time we met? I shifted, my eyes darting to oath and promise. No, it wasn't because of those toothpicks you hold. The doctrination preaches a truth, one that even a lesser such as yourself must understand. I couldn't run. Nureni and Karsian were still in the warehouse somewhere. If I left, they'd be easy pickings for this monster. I felt Lady Dawn's reservations and her advice that I leave, but I pushed it aside. What are you doing with those Blythe roots? I hissed, shifting my stance to be more aggressive. And what did you do with all the people you took from the streets? You want to know? The Vreetra-blooded vicar asked, splaying his gangly arms wide. Fight me, little mage. Take the answers from my broken body. His voice made me shudder internally, but I didn't let it show. I couldn't be bullied like before. I pointed the hand-holding promise at the vicar, raising a single finger from the hilt. I'll kill you, Mardith. The vicar laughed. Oh, do try. I want to see what you can do. I slammed fire and sound mana together, forcibly amping the heat. A thin beam of red plasma shot from my extended fingertip, moving too quickly to follow with normal senses. A slim wall of bright green acid coalesced in front of my attack, forming nearly too fast for me to see. My beam of plasma sizzled on contact, and I could feel the mana within being broken down. I grit my teeth, a dozen orbs of solid plasma hovering in the air around me. They cast a dim red light around me, a promise of searing destruction. Then I sent them on, each one darting around like a fly. They came from a dozen different directions, streaks of white and red converging on a single point. Mardith smirked, waving his hand dismissively. A torrent of horrid green rushed from him, splashing against the floor and swallowing my plasma spells like a sea swallows a ship. The spell tracked toward me, bubbling with decay. Unwilling to let myself be consumed, I pushed against the floor. I attached myself to the ceiling, lashing out with a plume of fire as another spray of acid tracked after me. The acid ate through my attack almost faster than I could conjure it, but the brief delay allowed me to move out of the way. The acid splashed against the ceiling, eating through the stone quickly. I watched in abject horror as I easily guessed what would have happened to me if I'd been hit. I turned back to Mardith, narrowing my eyes. He is playing with you, contractor. Once he wishes you dead, you will dissolve just as that stone, Lady Dawn said with increased urgency. I snarled. I don't care. Nureni and Karsian are still in this place. I just need to give them time to escape, then I can as well. I concentrated on my template spells, an idea forming in my head. If this man wasn't going to take me seriously, I'd use that for all I could. A dozen different spells winked into the air around me. Fireballs, plasma, and solid variations of both circled around my position on the ceiling, growing larger as I fed more mana into them. I started to feel the heat as they swelled, even though I knew none could hurt me. You won't be able to play with me any longer, I said, the power of the will reinforcing my words. I'll make you tell me what I need to know. Mardith smiled a leering grin. Play with you? Oh, little mage, you don't know anything. Quote. My spells surged toward the floating vicar. He hadn't moved a single inch during this entire confrontation, and I was counting on him continuing to underestimate me. As before, a tide of green acid soaked from the vicar's robes, attacking the mana of my spell and trying to make it decay. My spells, fortified with far more power than I had inputted before, resisted longer. A couple of the plasma spells nearly cinched the man's horns or bit at his robes, their searing heat inexorable even under the Vreetra's decay arts. But the overwhelming heat and firepower I was throwing at him was constantly destroyed. Each attack was systematically broken down, the hunger of the basilisk mana unrelenting. The room was cast in shades of red, orange, and green as swells of our power clashed. The walls shook at the onslaught, the rumbling making the entire structure shudder on its foundations. My brow was sweating from the stream of spells I was throwing at the vicar. Oath and promise hovered behind me as I focused on a special spell in my palm, my attention split between my foe and my task. I caught Mardith's wry smirk through the flashes of red. He was unscathed by the power I was hurling at him. His life force was as steady as ever, the pulse of his heart unfazed. Those specks of blackness at the center of it seemed to yawn wider. He's not trying at all, I thought. Whenever a person's heartbeat picked up, their life force surged to match it. He's completely calm, not even exerting himself. A quick glance at my own chest showed my heart fire flaring wildly, the tongue of red flame licking at my veins and fighting to escape my chest. Is that all? He asked, somehow able to be heard over the spellfire. The purest doctrine which the High Sovereign himself taught was that of struggle. He paused, pretending to think as he tapped a wicked finger against his chin. Do you know how Agrona of Ritra grew so strong? Quote. I let the man prattle on, focusing on my own mana. A beat later, I threw the spell I'd been crafting. A large sphere of solid sound mana rocketed toward the mage, moving through the searing heat unaffected. Its insides whirled with an oily sheen, an extreme condensation of power compacted with singular intent. Mardith lashed at the sphere with a tendril of green acid. As expected, it punched straight through the solid plating of my spell, seeking to decay anything inside. The mana inside began to wither away like a rose deprived of water, shriveling and falling inward on itself. It was a strange sensation to experience, my connection to my own mana cut off in an almost slow, tenuous draw. But this was what I planned for. I smiled, then clapped my hands together. The awesome sphere of power exploded, but the outcome wasn't directionless. The wave of sound was funneled by my mana through the connecting tendril, smashing mana particle after mana particle together in a cascading wave. Mardith's spell shuddered upward, carrying the force of a truck. Then the shockwave hit him. For the first time, the vicar's body was affected. He visibly convulsed as the spell thundered across his insides. His milky eye was blown wide as he coughed, a single drop of blood dripping from his dark gray lips. He tilted slightly midair, his concentration disrupted. The premise of the spell wasn't far off from my normal sound shroud, which caused internal damage to an enemy by delivering a blow to the body. Instead, I directed a shockwave through a different medium than my fist. But I couldn't let up now. I rocketed from the ceiling, reaching for promise. I moved as fast as I could through the air, pulling on the back of Mardith's head with telekinesis and pushing against the ceiling at the same time. I blurred through the air, my dagger flashing with red plasma and a promise of death. I swung at Mardith's throat, feeling a swell of hope. My own eyes could barely track my speed, and my body ached from the G-force, but I had a chance. The vicar was disoriented by my earlier spell, and I was moving so fast. Red steel flashed, blood sprayed. Mardith held the blade of my dagger in a heavy grip, the steel inches away from his stringy throat. The edge had cut all the way to his bones, and red blood tinted with flecks of life force streamed down the weapon. Not bad, little mage, he said, licking a stray drop of blood from his lips, seemingly recovered from my attack. But you misunderstand something. I watched in horror as the vicar's hand squeezed further, blood spurting from his digits. Green acid began to seep from the wounds, coating my weapon and eating at the material. I felt more than heard the red-layered metal creak and groan under his grip. The sovereigns are strong for a reason. Do you know why? I tried in vain to pull my dagger away from that monster's hand, but to no avail. His fingers sank into the edge like a hand through butter. The vicar's palm latched onto my face in a blur, making me yelp. I clawed at his hand as my telekinetic shroud creaked. I pulled on oath from far away, hoping it would give me a way out. My other weapon surged toward me, but the vicar batted it away with a tendril of acid, sending it out of my control. They felt pain, little mage, pain at their betrayal, pain from their exile, and pain from being forced to rule over his lessers, pain from being pitted against the mighty dragons of the Indrith clan. Mardith threw me at the wall with the force of a train. My vision blurred as I slammed through the stone barrier, and then shot through several wooden crates. Wood splintered around me as I choked, my telekinetic shroud shattering on impact. My vision flashed as I fell in and out of consciousness with each crash. Dust and debris rose around me as I came to a stop, the broken walls and splintered wood around me telling the story all on their own. It took me a long second to grasp my situation. My body was embedded in a thick wooden crate, a torn-shaped hole holding me like a stern grip. For some reason, I was coated in a green substance. The smell of it was pungent, invading my nostrils and fighting for space in my brain. I rolled forward, dropping from the splintered crate behind me with a groan. I looked through the mess of shattered wood and toppled crate towers in front of me. It took me another moment to recognize the substance coating my body. The green fluid that had splashed onto me from being thrown through the crates. Blythe. Move, Torin. Lady Dawn called into my mind, spurring me into action. The adrenaline returned to my veins as a beam of green acid darker than the blythe around me shot like a bullet toward my prone form. I used a telekinetic push against the ground, throwing myself into the air. I barely avoided the bullet as it ate through the crates near me, hissing and popping. My adrenaline returned in full force, ideas and worries and plans thundering through my mind as I took in my situation. Mardith had thrown me into the main section of the warehouse, but that could also be to my advantage. I was terrifyingly mobile with my telekinesis, and there were a dozen more places I could. A tentacle of green sludge smacked me out of the sky. I slammed back into the stone floor, causing it to shake slightly. My telekinetic barrier, already covered in cracks from being thrown around, simply melted from the blow. Stray particles of the green spell still sizzled through my mana barrier, biting into my flesh and making me grunt. I threw up a hasty wall of plasma and telekinetic force as the tentacle slammed back down. The plasma actually managed to burn away some of the spell above me, but it was eating away at the mana I shoved into it. My arms burned as my mind raced, searching for a way out. Come on, I thought desperately as my mana left my veins and entered the only thing keeping me alive. I was running out of reserves at a startling pace. The tendril slammed back down, crushing me into the floor again. The earth around my back cracked, my bones creaking from the pressure. There's gotta be a way out. I need to run. The tendril came down like a whip, cracking against my bare defense. Drops of green acid ate through my spell, dripping onto my telekinetic shroud and eating through that too. But I don't have an Indrift to fight, a voice as putrid as the acidic tentacle above me stated. Another tendril appeared out of nowhere, snaking from the side as I focused on the impending doom above me. It cinched around my ankle, devouring the mana around my foot with hunger. I screamed as the decaying spell ate into my flesh, melting past my best defense with ease. The tendril yanked me across the floor, hefting me up. For a moment I was weightless, my eyes darting around as I tried to catch a glimpse of my enemy. I saw a flash of grinning teeth, malevolent eyes, and a roaring heartfire, before my body was cracked into the floor. The ground shuddered, a crater 10 feet across opening under my body. My telekinetic shroud shattered in its entirety, my grip on the will weakening as pain threatened to consume me. The runes on my arm flashed as the basilisk within reared, its attention drawn by both the light of the phoenix and the pain that lanced across my everything. Move yourself, Torin Dane, my bond urged, her words distant as the breath was driven from my lungs. He is coming. I couldn't bring myself to move, the pain so pervasive it dulled my mind. The will flickered in my mind, my consciousness grasping for purchase. It has been so long since I felt pain, a voice said from above me. Pain of body, pain of mind, pain of emotion. My eyes focused on Mardith, who loomed over me like the basilisk that he derived his bloodline from. A crooked smile was on his face as he knelt, a swirling vortex of acid around us. I noted absently that his wounds were healed somehow, his hand mended as if I'd never cut it. Pain is what drives a star greatest heights. The sadistic mage reached out toward me with a long, disjointed gray finger. The nail on it was black, twisted, and sharp, and my breathing picked up as I tried in vain to move myself. Don't let him touch you. Don't let him touch you. Get out. But my body wouldn't move. My limbs failed to respond, the burning from exhaustion and acid making them worthless. My red chain flickered on my arm. The basilisk within shifted, almost awake. Mardith drew his finger across my face in an almost tender gesture, wiping a drop of blood from my cheek. He drew that finger over his tongue, shuddering with a perverse sense of something. His good eye closed, but a twitch in his face made me unable to tell if it was from agony or pleasure. You're going to feel pain, little mage. Pain as you dealt me. I'm going to forge you into the Kezes to my Agrona. He drew his finger down over my face, drawing a thin cut that leaked to crimson blood. Will you break, or be like the sovereigns? This man is insane, I realized with wide eyes. I struggled anew, but my movements only grew weaker. My core was near empty, the salvo I had thrown earlier a drain on my reserves and my last desperate defense wearing me down further. My telekinetic shroud refused to reform. The vicar leaned forward, grabbing me by the hair and yanking me toward him. His breath was putrid as it scraped against my face, his eyes alight with almost manic glee. I moaned pitifully as I was wrenched from the crater my body had made, my arms limply trying to grasp at Martith's hand. You're special, little mage. Only the witch who gave you those swords sees it. But I do. I'll make you see it, too. He leaned even closer, his putrid lips right against my ears. But if you try and stop me again before we're ready, I'll hurt you. Pain can only do so much before it breaks a thing rather than builds it stronger. All the people I've taken, their lives are in your hands. I barely had time to process Martith's words before the vicar slammed my head into the stone beneath me, and everything went black. Chapter 72, Beaten. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreeter's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. I came to slowly, a horrible headache pounding against my skull. Besides that, my body ached in a dozen different places, sharp and dull all over. It took me a moment to figure out what had happened. I was cold, deathly cold, the chill ate at my flesh, sinking through my skin and biting my bones. The stars mocked me from on high, their warmth light years away. I was outside in the winter cold, clad in my thin dark clothes. The mana that usually coursed through my body to reinforce me against the weather wasn't there to protect me. I instinctually tried to draw mana from my core, the act second nature after so long. Instead, I felt the familiar pain of a close brush with backlash coursing from my nexus of power. The mana flowed, but it carried pain with it. I groaned in agony, trying to remember why I was beaten and broken under the sky. I told you you couldn't fight him on your own, a voice said from nearby. I recognized it, and as soon as I recognized that voice, the reason for my pain crashed back through my head. The Doctrination's abduction of people, the infiltration, finding the map of Blythe roots. Martith. I had used my full power, then been swatted around like a fly. I was beaten once, twice, a dozen times into the stone. I was shown my weakness in full force. And the Blythe. I snarled, moving my limbs. They ached with every shift as I hauled myself to my feet. My knees buckled as I stood, making me stumble into a nearby wall. Instead of despair, I felt a growing fury rising in my chest. You shouldn't move, the voice said. You took quite a beating. Martith dumped your body out here a while back. I turned lethargically toward the speaker. I recognized him immediately from his drooping mossy hair. I felt my anger redouble, my lips pulling into a snarl. I told you not, I said, taking a breath through the sharp pain in my ribs. God, I hated feeling so weak. To follow me. I wasn't following you, he said, his eyes glinting slightly. Your body was dumped right in my path. How many fucking times are you going to use that excuse? I hissed, trying to force my legs to support my weight. I brutally flooded them with the trace amounts of mana left in my core, the warmth of my power clashing with the pain coursing through my everything. The mage furrowed his brows, slightly taken aback by my anger. I couldn't sense his team anywhere nearby, but I was broken right now. Who knew what I was missing? As many times as I need to, he said slowly. You nearly got yourself killed. Well, I didn't. I hope your employer is happy about that. Without her trap weapons, she needs a lackey to follow in my footsteps. The mage arched a brow, undeterred. Try not to get yourself killed, Torrin Dane. My employer wants you alive. Those words brought Martith's last words to the fore of my mind. Will you break, or be like the sovereigns? He'd asked. He left me alive in some twisted attempt to build me up. Just like this Renea Shorn. Tell Renea Shorn that if she wants anything from me, she can start by actually doing something good. I hissed, taking a shaky step toward the mossy-haired mage. There are over 100 people being held by that psychotic vicar. You want me to be safe? Actually do something with your power. I shoved past the man, our shoulders colliding. I knew I was the only one to feel pain from that. My legs shook with every step. Lady Dawn, I asked mentally, what happened after I was unconscious? My bond appeared in front of me as I continued to pitifully hobble forward. She had a pinched expression on her normally stoic face. You need to rest, contractor, she said softly, as if she was speaking to a child. Tell me, I yelled, my patience wearing thin. I sensed the attention of Renea Shorn's mage behind me, but I didn't care. I wasn't weak anymore. The Torrin who broke under the boot of the Jones was gone. He didn't exist anymore. Lady Dawn's face morphed slightly, my inability to mask my emotions over our bond telling her exactly how I felt. I felt my knees shake, my weakness pervading every part of my body and mind. No, I thought, trying to fight back a choked breath. Don't look deeper. Stay away from my shame. The Lesherin dropped your body a few streets away from the warehouse, Lady Dawn said after a quiet moment. You have been unconscious for nearly an hour. I do not know what became of your compatriots. I looked past my bond. My anger burned like a heart fire in my chest. I took such solace in feeling like my actions had a purpose. And yet what was the point of that infiltration? I hadn't accomplished any of my goals. Instead of finding out where the people were held, I had been tossed around like a ragdoll. And that warehouse was full of Blythe. I had felt certain this place was done with that. But if Martith was planning to send it back out into the slums, what did that mean for the hope the rats had so carefully fostered? I remembered Martith's last words to me. But if you try and stop me again before we're ready, I'll hurt you. All the people I've taken, their lives are in your hands. I screamed hoarsely into the night air. I turned as best I could, slamming my fist into the brick wall. The wall should have crumbled before my power. Any other time, the bricks would yield before my strength. But my knuckles cracked, spraying blood. The wall stood imperiously, defying me just like Martith had. I was so weak. A cloaked figure dropped from a rooftop nearby, landing with a sharp clack of boots on stone. I turned in my hobble, noticing the rat's mask over Narani's face. You're alive? Narani said with a note of hopeful surprise. I felt the power that was being thrown around. I thought you were dead. Quote. I noticed something clutched in her arms. Oath was unblemished as always, the red patterned steel seeming dull to me. Promise, however. My dagger had divots in its blade for each of the spindly fingers of the vicar. They were deep, sinking nearly halfway through the steel. The edge was nearly ruined, only sparse points still bearing a cutting edge. The tip was still wicked sharp, but it felt like a moot point. I tried to latch onto the weapons with my emblem, an act that was past instinctual at this point. My rune felt warm for a moment, then the heat vanished like a candle in the wind. I snarled, hobbling toward the young rat. I'm fine, I said stillily, yanking the weapons from her arms. She released them in a rush, seeming skittish. That vicar nearly killed me, I said, feeling an almost physical pain from the admission. I sheathed both my weapons, then paused. Renea Shorn's spy was close, watching our conversation with keen eyes. Nareni turned on him, a construct of ice manifesting in her hand. Hello, stranger, she said with forced cheer. I'm afraid we're having a personal talk. Between teammates. Peeking isn't allowed, though you can RSVP for the next meeting at your mother's house. We were all there last night, after all. The spy shook his head, his reed-like hair covering his face. He brushed off Narani's blatant provocation. I'll give Lady Shorn your message, Torrin Dane, he said, turning to look at the slums. It has occurred to me that I know far less than I thought of the world. The spy bounded away, clearly reinforcing his body with mana. Several other shadows joined from various alleyways as he left, the rest of his team regrouping. I had been able to sense them before. Who was that? Nareni asked, looking at me with open concern. She gave me a more scrutinizing look. Vreetra's horns, we need to get you to a healer. You look like you were run over by an iron hyrax. Renee Shorn's spy, I said, looking toward the west. An idea fueled by the anger in my stomach was forming, drawing my attention. And I'll be fine, Nareni. Don't worry about me. But your wounds. Is Carcian alive? I interrupted with a snap, unintentionally exerting my will over the ambient mana. Nareni jumped. Oh, yeah, he's fine. We found where the people are being held under the warehouse. We even spotted Wade's family. We'll rescue them soon. I felt a phantom nail running down my cheek, putrid breath eroding my senses. But if you try and stop me again before we're ready, I'll hurt you. All the people I've taken, their lives are in your hands. Don't do it, I said lowly, turning while using a nearby wall for support. He'll kill them all. Nareni shifted uncomfortably, looking at my battered and bloody body. Who did you fight, Torin? We didn't see, but the entire place shook. It nearly collapsed the ceiling. The amount of mana being tossed around, the pressure in the air. I closed my eyes, taking a steadying breath, but whenever my eyes closed, all I saw was a milky pupil and its devious twin. Mardith, I said, the Vicar of Plague. Nareni took a step back, shock emanating from her. You're alive, she said, saying it as if it was a question. The anger in my gut, which had begun to settle, finally reared up again. I was left alive, I snapped. I was toyed with, Nareni, and he told me that if I tried to save the people he captured, he'd hurt them all. But that entire warehouse was filled with Blythe. I hissed, walking away. I used the wall for support, a single hand keeping me steady. And I found a map of distribution routes. It was all for nothing, Nareni. Nothing. Mardith was going to redistribute that horror drug to the populace again after we'd gone to such lengths to eradicate it at its roots. All the progress this place had made in the aftermath? Nareni nearly tripped at my mention of Blythe. I knew she had a past with the drug. She must have thought the entire district was done with that hellish substance, too. How naive we were. What? She asked, her voice seeming distant. I turned, drawing the wounded metal of promise. I'm going to get stronger, Nareni, I said, clutching the dagger tight and holding it in front of me. I'm too weak to help you now, but I promise to make a difference. I won't let that be taken from us. Nareni raised an arm, clearly disquieted by my words. But I didn't let her worry stop me. But I will grow, and when I have enough power, I am going to nail that vicar to the effigies of his false gods. He will bleed for his sins. Then you can save those people. I saw another figure in the deep dark of the alley. Carson's eyes were shadowed, but I felt a kinship there. We had both been broken by this system before. I swear this, I said lowly, drawing the ragged edge of promise over my oath-chained palm. It tore a jagged cut, but the pain was overshadowed by my resolve. By my fury, on my blood. I felt a slight pull of something in my chest, resonating over and around and through my heart. The red chains on my arm glowed slightly as blood dripped down my arm. Mardith wanted to make me strong, to forge me into his personal Kezes Indrith. I'd show him the might of the sun. You should not do this so soon, Lady Dawn said, gliding beside me. She kept her eyes forward, but I could feel her attention over our bond. My emotions had cooled into more steady spite as time passed. I limped my way through the streets, leaving East Fiatra and the rats behind. I had a goal in my stilted trek. And my bond knew it. You were wounded and compromised, contractor. To rush into battle so soon would be unwise. I felt my mana regenerating at a rapid pace from the feather in my core. Considering how long it was taking me to limp to the Ascenders Association, my nexus of power would be nearly full by the time I was there. My body was inconsequential. My magic would ease the burden. I was toyed with, Lady Dawn, I said, using her title. Beaten around like a sandbag. If I don't take risks, I'll stagnate. Become fodder for this godforsaken system. I nearly tripped on a large piece of rubble, stumbling and bracing myself against the wall. I cursed aloud. I feel hate for this vicar as well, my bond said after a tense moment. His blood is a perversion of Asuran and lesser union, a corruption of everything beautiful about children. I turned slightly, my eyes widening as I felt her anger. This was the fury she contained every time the doctrination had approached me. This was the root of that spite. I may not hate this man the same way you do, Torin Dane. But I know the fire that burns in your chest. I know both sides of your anger and shame. I grit my teeth, thumping my back against a wall. I slid down it, my exhaustion seeming to redouble. I was captive for many, many years, my bond. I was held in chains that kept me from all that I knew and those I loved. And those chains only clasped my wrists once I became reckless. Lady Dawn's burning eyes peered into my soul from above. Do not repeat my mistakes. Give yourself time. I closed my eyes shut. I don't have time, I said. It's all going to happen soon, and I'm not strong enough to even fight that vicar. My bond watched me, her brows furrowed in a way I recognized as concern. Her outline of purple and orange light pushed against the night around us. Then give yourself a single day. Recover. You cannot throw yourself into another battle so soon. I thought you were against dictating my choices for me, I said bitterly. I am not, Torin Dane. I am giving you advice, as you requested. I am telling you the truth. I felt an irrational anger at the Phoenix, but I banished it with a force of will. I wanted to lash out at everything nearby, to show them all that I wasn't a weakling to be trodden on. My actions made a difference. But my bond had been nothing but supportive, a solid rock in the heart of a storm. I could not lash out at her. I held my face in my hands, knowing Lady Dawn to be right. I needed to rest. Chapter 73, Twin Soul. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Asuran clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @Afra_. Torin Dane. My anger followed me like a pursuing hound. I tore my way through the relic tombs, my blades reaping vengeance on any ether beast in my way. I felt half a beast myself. I held oath in my hand, flourishing it against the large crocodilian that tried to gore me with its claws. Instead, my saber drew a thin line of blood through its thick, leathery hide. The monster whirled, undeterred by my attack. It stood on two legs, towering over me with a jaw that could eat my torso in a single bite. It snapped at me with that massive maw, but I pulled myself backward. Instead of a pound of flesh, the creature's jaws closed around a grenade of sound and flame. It burst within its mouth, making the beast rear backward with a roar. Promise streaked in from the side, the telekinetically controlled dagger ripping a jagged tear over the monster's eyes. It thrashed its arms about wildly, spurts of blood leaking from horrific cuts across its face. Promise didn't cut cleanly anymore, not after what Mardith did. The dagger ripped and tore where it cut, digging out chunks of flesh from whatever it touched. Another crocodilian beast charged me, running on all fours like an ape. It kicked up swampy water in its wake, the marshlands around us murkily camouflaging everything in its path. The ether beast's thick, meaty tail flicked behind it. I threw a condensed fire shot at the creature, the fiery pockmarks making it tumble. Promise whirred toward the beast, drawing a jagged gash across its scaled gullet. I then turned back to my original prey. With a snarl, I yanked on its leg with my emblem. The creature, flailing about due to its lack of eyes, tumbled face first into the soft, marshy ground beneath my feet. I glided by, driving oath into its throat and withdrawing with a deft flourish. It choked to death on its own blood. I kicked the beast's corpse towards a long, serpentine form that was moving through the nearby water. Empowered by my telekinetic shroud, the 7-foot-tall scaled monstrosity soared toward the small ripples in the water. The snake-like ether beast, unprepared for several hundred pounds of corpse crashing into it, writhed about, splashing water and hissing. I heard that hiss, I saw its fangs, and I thought of Mardith. I reached both of my hands out, sending waves of mana into my telekinetic spell form. I sent my mind outward, commanding the energy in the air to latch on and hold. A flare of white attempted to close in on the massive serpentine beast. An outline of purple rose to meet it, fighting off my attempts at direct control. It was extremely difficult to outright control creatures with mana or ether in their bodies. Their own innate defenses fought back, making it far more efficient to use pushes and pulls, which didn't draw that reaction. But as the serpentine form coiled, its innate ether defenses fighting against my attempts, I felt my anger only grow. Snakes lurked in every corner of this world, whether they be people or basilisks. I crashed my hands together, sweat beading on my forehead. With a yowl, my telekinetic emblem finally ripped away the monster's etheric shroud, collapsing inward like an imploding star. I had control of the 30-foot-long ether beast at last. I snarled, raising my hands with a little strain. The ether inside the beast was trying to fight back, reclaim its control and banish my spell. But I wouldn't let it. The beast floated through the air, then smashed through a stocky tree. I whipped the creature around, my rage guiding me as much as my reason. The creature's scaled hide cracked against another lurking bipedal crocodile, splintered through a tree, and then crashed against the water once more. I felt the pushback from within weaken with every blow, the serpent's bones breaking with every strike. I could end it immediately. Considering I had control of the beast, I only needed to clench my fist, and a ton of force would concentrate around the monster's head, pulping it at my command. But I wanted to hurt it. I used the monster's body as a noose, wrapping it around a hulking, bear-like ether beast's throat. The bear-like beast snarled, clawing deep, bloody gouges into the thick meaty hide of the snake. On its own, those attacks would have sent the serpentine beast swimming away, its entrails trailing behind it. But I tightened my grip, forcing it to stretch like a garrote. The bear-like beast's eyes widened as the air was pressed from its lungs. Its struggles weakened, the sharp, glinting claws far from enough to free itself. It was covered in the serpent's blood, a gruesome fate for any monster. I hovered the mangled body of the serpent in front of me. It was still breathing weakly, strangled hisses and whines echoing from its mouth. Its scales were torn and battered from where I'd used it as a club against the monsters approaching me. I looked into its eyes, remembering the pity I felt for the scander so long ago after shattering its leg. I could feel none in my soul right now. Do not become them, contractor, Lady Dawn whispered across my thoughts. I turned to the side. My bond was sitting on a low branch of a burly tree, watching the scene with an almost sad expression. You hate them, too, I said with a snarl, feeling defiant. They'd happily do the same to me, to all I care for in this world. Why should I be merciful toward those retro-blooded monsters? Quote. My bond seemed to center herself, taking a breath. I hate what they represent, Tauren, a heartless union between Asura and man, one of apathetic science and heartless desire for power, instead of love and life, instead of something wonderful and new. That is why I hate the doctrination. I felt my appetite for carnage wane slightly. The beast I held in my telekinetic clutches no longer struggled against my control. Its ether no longer pushed to free it. I drove oath through its skull in one quick motion, putting the serpentine monster out of its misery. Then I threw the corpse into the water with a heavy splash. But why? I said, turning on my bond. Why shouldn't I just say goodbye to my principles? This world seems happy to keep telling me I'll fail if I don't. The only people who succeed in Alakri are those who sell their souls. It was ironic, wasn't it? I'd already sold my soul to the Asura in front of me. What right did she have to chastise me when she acted just the same? My bond seemed unaffected by my anger, which only pushed the flames higher. But I let her think of a response. My brother, she began, was disgusted by the Indrith clan's butchery of the Jinn. Late at night, he would ail over the question of what he should do. Expose their crimes? That would never work. Look what happened to Agrona. Lead a revolt against the dragons? For all Mordane's strength, Kezis's mastery of ether put him beyond all of our fighting forces. Simply let the massacre slide? The phoenix shook her head. So my brother found a different path. He left, just as Agrona did, and he sought out the remnants of the Jinn, providing them sanctuary and protection for centuries. If not for that act of idealism, of principle, I would have never met my husband, my Andravor. My shoulders slumped, much of my anger draining out of me. Every day, I felt more and more of myself from my previous world become diluted and distant. The peace and future I experienced on Earth was becoming harder and harder to remember. How long until nothing of me remained, and Alakria took its place? I'm tired, Dawn, I said morosely, looking toward the sky. It would be so easy to just. I waved my hand in the air dismissively. Let it all go, fight with everything I have. I had only been in this world for around 4 months. How much longer would I remain? I'd already killed men, drawn blood in a way that would have been inconceivable in my previous life. My bond didn't say anything in response. I felt a reassuring stream of emotion and understanding over our bond. It was a balm on my aching psyche, the warmth making me almost melt. I spent that next night with much less anger and a lot more sorrow. I stepped through the shimmering portal, bracing myself for the next zone. Would it be of extreme, muggy heat like the marshland from before? Or splintering cold, like the stretches of Antarctica? I felt my eye twitch as I stepped into the familiar scene of the American town zone. The road stretched onto infinity. The two familiar portals stood side by side at the end of rows of suburban homes. And yet this time, the houses weren't broken memories. The first time I'd been in this zone, they'd started off as almost cartoonish renditions of modern architecture, the proportions and colors wrong and disorderly. The uncanny valley had swallowed this zone whole, but the next time I was here, the place had smoothed over somewhat, like a builder was learning the ins and outs of his craft at an accelerated pace. And now, each house wouldn't be out of place on the outskirts of a city. The small lawns in front were neatly trimmed, a faint smell of freshly cut grass wafting on non-existent wind. I felt the constant watch of something, just as before. I was being scrutinized, peeled back, inspected. The last time I had been here, I simply left. I didn't see the point of investigating for too long. But now I felt protective of my emotions in a new way. Whatever this presence was, it was taking knowledge of my previous world from my mind, using it to craft this little zone. I looked around, feeling the presence, but unable to pinpoint it. The hairs on my arms stood on end, an instinctive reaction to being watched. Show yourself, I cried, turning about and flaring my intent. I pressed into the expanse, trying to lash out in vain. Stop just watching me, stop taking from my mind, stop being a coward, quote. Only the silence of the zone met my taunts. I felt no change in the observation, no change in the emotions of whoever was looking down at me. I walked down the asphalt street, looking every which way. I drew oath, snapping it to the side. The single-edged blade cut a light divot into the street as I walked, not even sparks signaling the slightest resistance. I grew tired of the silence, tired of the non-answers, tired of being powerless. I drew on my will. It reacted as expected, meshing with my mind. I felt my knowledge expand, a chunk of understanding so intuitive I couldn't understand why I didn't see it earlier. But my senses also expanded, my own heartfire flaring in my chest. I looked around, my eyes narrowed. It didn't take me long to see a discrepancy. I couldn't see ether like Arthur could with real heart, at least not all forces of it. Life force was an expression of ether, the fire that tied the soul to the vessel blaring in my eyes. And I might have missed it if I wasn't looking so intently. A single, barely quivering ember of heartfire pressed against the ascension portal. I could see nobody around it, just the burning indication of life. I stalked forward, drawing oath behind me like a scythe. I stared down at the fire. It was so weak, the last embers of a roaring bonfire. I could almost feel what it used to be. I pointed my sword at the fire floating in the air. Reveal yourself, I said lowly. Nothing happened, no reaction from the fire. I pushed my saber forward slightly, not knowing what to expect. The moment my blade touched solid flesh, a body suddenly appeared in front of me as if resolving out of nothingness. My saber had drawn a light cut over its chest. No, I realized, taking a step back as I observed the person in front of me. A he. An old man sat in the fetal position by the ascension portal, grasping his knees and muttering quietly. His hair was thinning and white, a strange pearlescent sheen to his skin. The wrinkles I saw must have had wrinkles themselves, age radiating from the being like an ancient oak. And scrawled across his sagging skin were deep violet spell forms. They covered every inch of the body I could see. A djinn, I said with a shocked whisper. The purplish skin and rune-covered body could only be one thing. Lady Dawn appeared by my side in a flash, her eyes wide and burning. My bond knelt in front of the man, who shook slightly. He didn't seem to even realize I'd cut him slightly, muttering with distant, unseeing eyes. A djinn still lives in these tombs, my bond said with restrained emotion. I looked at the djinn as he huddled. The spark of life over his heart was almost extinguished. He's dying, I realized. He's been dying for a long time. He continued to mutter, unaware of either my bond or I knelt lower, sheathing my blade. I felt like a single brush of a feather would make this man collapse into dust. I was just able to make out a repeated mantra, muttered under his breath. They can't see me, can't find me, they can't see me, can't find me, they can't see me, can't find me. I swallowed. He's gone mad, I said stiffly, a mantra that must have been repeated for an eternity. Did you know of this, contractor? My bond said, turning to me sharply. Are there others like him here, trapped in these dungeons? You know more about this place than any other. Tell me. I shuddered, tearing my eyes away from the mad djinn with an effort of will. I didn't think any lived. There were only relics that mimicked the djinn. Remnants, they called themselves. Remnant, the djinn said suddenly, his eyes still glazed. Remnants of everything. Everything crumbled. Entropy comes, takes all. His eyes snapped to Lady Dawn. You're a remnant, lost soul, twin life taker. I tensed. Nobody had ever seen Lady Dawn besides myself. She was invisible to everybody but me. Yet this djinn could see her? You hear me? My bond said, reaching a hesitant hand to the crumpled djinn. Yet he had gone back to his muttering, ignoring her shaky gesture. But my attention was slowly drawn back to the atmosphere. The pervasive feeling of being watched didn't come from the shivering, mad djinn at my feet. It came from everywhere. Are there more djinn yet living in these tombs? I tried, kneeling down in front of the djinn. He didn't respond, content to continue muttering to himself. I frowned, feeling pity for the man. He had no doubt once been among the pinnacle of mages in this world, but his mind had been shattered. By the Indrith clan? By spending millennia isolated in these tombs? Or by some sort of experiment? I didn't know. What is your name? I asked more firmly, laying a hand on the djinn's shoulder. That got a reaction I did not expect. The djinn reacted to my touch as if it were fire, scuttling back along the concrete while half hissing. Tears grew at the edge of his unfocused eyes. They took it, took everything. My face, my home, my name, just like she took everything from you to bring you here. But we made a better way, a way to test. His eyes sharpened for the briefest of instants, a hint of the man he must have been shining through. We make a test for you, twin soul, to grant you insight. I didn't want to go, but they all did. I couldn't, didn't, wouldn't, couldn't. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Lady Dawn recoil, pulling her hand back as if stung. My mind burned with questions, trying and failing to assemble the pieces. Was this just the mad ramblings of a decrepit djinn, or was there a grain of truth to them? But I felt the presence around me change at his last words. It seemed to withdraw for the briefest of moments, the constant weight like the pressure from being underwater, the liquid compressing your chest pulling back for a moment. Who are we, and what do you mean, twin soul? I asked. It was at his mention of a test that the pressure shifted. If I could only find out what he was referring to. But the djinn just curled up into a ball, stray tears streaking down his face. His mantra changed as he drew inwards. Took my face, took my home, took my name, took my face, took my home, took my name, took my face, took my home, took my name. Lady Dawn gathered herself and knelt by the man's body, running phantom fingers over his face. She peered into his eyes, but they gave no recognition. I tried several more times to get information from him. I asked questions, gently prodded at his body, and even tried to push mana around in an attempt to garner some sort of reaction. I let the first phase of my phoenix will fade as I eventually gave up, picking up the muttering man. He was almost weightless in my arms, the age and thinness of his gaunt limbs making him less than 70 pounds. I wondered how a person could live like this. My mind cycled through question after question as I numbly walked toward the houses. My feet seemed to move by themselves as I walked through one of the lawns, using my telekinesis emblem to pull open a door. My bond trailed behind me from several yards, a morose air to her. The djinn called me twin soul. He said everything had been taken from me, and he also said that someone was preparing a test for me. For insight. I had chosen the house closest to the exit portal. I had somewhat expected it, but the inside of the building had shifted just as much as the outside. Instead of the original blank, white room, I was met with something out of a commercial. Pristine furniture graced the living room, with a flat-screen TV facing away from the window. A ways past the couch, I could see the beginning of a fully furnished dining room, complete with a marble counter, oven, and microwave. I let all of this wash past me with a growing sense of detachment. I wasn't moving my body. I was piloting it from afar, distant from sensation and emotion. I wasn't in these tombs. I wasn't in a different world. I was on Earth, having a strange dream. I gently set the old djinn's body onto the couch, then went searching throughout the house. I managed to find a blanket from a bedroom that looked straight out of an IKEA warehouse, then gently draped it over the weeping ancient mage. I felt a headache pounding against my skull as questions hammered against the bone, trying to escape with every thump. I looked down at the old djinn for a long moment, feeling anxiety and dread pooling in my stomach. Of all the questions that churned in my brain, one rose above all others. I couldn't pretend to ignore it any longer. I'd gotten too many hints, suspected for too long, and now that I had gazed into the abyss gazed back. Lady Dawn, I said, still staring at the quietly crying djinn. How am I in this world? Chapter 74, The Truth of Reincarnation. Published by web novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @Afra_. Torin Dane. My bond did not respond. A silence as quiet as death settled over the room, a strange mirror of everything I knew from my previous life. I had felt the decaying mana of the Vreetra clan biting into my flesh, breaking down my mana and body into base components, then nothing at all. But the stillness that spread from our bond was more potent than the most powerful spell. I turned slowly, taking my eyes away from the ancient mage with a broken mind. I felt our tether go dark, Lady Dawn receding into herself as she had before the attack on the Jones. Her simmering eyes were dim as coals, giving her face a hollow look. She didn't meet my eyes. She kept her gaze trained on the decrepit djinn. How am I here? I asked again, the headache in my skull demanding an answer. What did this djinn mean? He called me twin soul. He said, she took everything from me to bring me here. I swallowed, staring at the phoenix's face. It traced the graceful contours of her immaculate expression, the hardness from our first meeting returning in force. What did he mean? The Asura didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward one of the plush seats, sinking down into the leather as if it would swallow her whole. Her phantasmal body made no indentation, no pressure indicating that the chair was occupied. Do you want to ask this now? The phoenix said. Her jaw was tight. You're angry, struggling to find direction after Mardith. Are you? Don't patronize me, I said, cutting her words off. I've had guesses for a long time, but I could ignore those. They were just that, guesses, a leaf on the wind. The ghostly breeze that always rustled Lady Dawn's feathered hair stilled, her locks falling across her face and covering her eyes. I'd always known, on some deep, instinctual level, that the answer to my question would hurt me. It would open a wound I wouldn't know how to close. It was why I avoided the answer for so long, but I couldn't pretend anymore. You will not like the answer you seek, Lady Dawn said softly. I heard her words aloud only. Our link was an empty void, nothing transmitting over. It will hurt you. It will bring you only rage and pain. I swallowed. I have a right to know. Lady Dawn shifted in her seat uncomfortably. For the first time in this life, I felt distinctly above the Asura. She had done something, and she knew it. Reincarnation. Reincarnation is difficult to understand. You need anchors, points to tie a soul to their new body. In essence, you fool a dead soul into believing it should still live. Repeating events create a symmetry, so the spirit can fit into a metaphysical gap in the puzzle, the Asura said. Her words were measured, yet I could feel the stone in them. And between worlds, there are sometimes ties. Bleed over. The ideas and beliefs of one meld into another, and sometimes something more. I thought of the word Asura. Indra and Vritra were the names of Hindu gods in my previous life. We had words for mana and ether despite having no true concept of either. The languages between entire worlds were nearly identical. And sometimes, there are more significant parallels, the phoenix continued. Reflections in the edicts. Long have the phoenixes delved into the mysteries of the soul, trying to divine their truths. And yet sometimes, there is a cosmic mirror. The words came to me, bubbling up unbidden. Some part of me understood this, knew it intrinsically, as a child knows to cry when facing the world for the first time. Parallel souls, I said, drawing on a truth distilled in my blood. Alternate selves, soulmates. I paused, struggling to speak. Twin soul. Norgan's body had been identical to my brother's from my previous life. I could spot no difference between Torin or my past self, either. Except for an age difference, it was as if I had simply woken up in my own body. My blood went cold. When I cast myself out, severing my spirit from my body, my soul sought a symmetry. My spell was weaker than expected, so it pulled on something already present. It gravitated to an existing possibility, my bond said. Her words were detached, each syllable carefully selected. I took a single step back. In one world, a burgeoning mage lost his brother, Lady Dawn said, her tone nearly dead. A younger sibling was broken under the boots of undue might, yet in another, both endured. The brothers lived together, pushing toward common goals. It was unaligned, the scales were unbalanced, and for my spell to pull from the weighted side, adjustments needed to be made. Adjustments, I hissed, all the pieces sliding together. My memory of my death in my previous world had always been fragmented. It came in blurry pieces, a flash of a headlight here. The vague sense of imminent fear, a resounding emptiness, a void that defied even feeling. But the details leading up were foggy and distant. What had I been doing the night before? How had I gotten into the car? Where was I even driving to? Your spell killed me, I said with a breath. Somehow, it pushed me toward that car, or took control of me, or something. Quote. The phoenix looked up at me with sad eyes. No, contractor, you survived your crash. The details of my memory after casting my soul to fate are blanketed, covered by an expansive mist. But you may have lived on after the collision, were it not for the actions of my spell. It intervened when your body was at its weakest, when your tethers of heartfire were frayed and tearing, the ether that tied your soul to your vessel coming undone. I turned around, staring anywhere but the phoenix behind me. My eyes searched desperately for something to focus on, anything I could use to distract myself from the cacophonous pounding headache that threatened to tear itself out of my skull. I had dreams in my previous world, things I wanted to be. I wanted to grow up, fall in love with a woman who understood me. I would have a career in computers, working in the logistical areas I understood so well. Maybe I would one day have a family, passing my knowledge and experience on to my own children so they may do better than me. A legacy left behind, something meaningful. But I hadn't just lost those dreams. The djinn was right, they'd been taken from me. But it was Lady Dawn who had torn them from my life. Our bond ran soul deep, the welling extent of my spirit intertwined with hers. It was unbreakable and inexplicable, cutting deeper than an ocean trench. I knew we could never truly separate. I understood our connection somewhere, deep in my bones, just as I understood that my soul had been a parallel to Torin's. I felt my knees tremble as I grasped the wall for support. I felt adrift and confused. What should I do? Where did I go from here? Lady Dawn had been my pillar of support since arriving in this world. Whenever I was lost or confused, she was there with a word of stern advice and attempted comfort. When I anguished in the Clearwood forest, she pushed me to train. When I nearly succumbed to despair in the platform zone, it was she alone who pushed me onward. She told me of her love of the stars, and her advice saw me through hell. But did I live with my own murderer tied to my soul for the rest of my life? Contractor, I heard my bond my murderer say behind me. Stop, I said with a choked snap. Just please, leave me alone. Let me think, I yelled, the house trembling slightly as my mana turned outward. Dust drifted from the ceiling, settling onto the wood-slatted floor. My emotions raged, their touch a grim claw raking against my mind. My sense of the world became distant. I had just started to make sense of everything. The house around me a sharp, searing reminder of my previous life blurred to my senses. I didn't see my bond disappear, but the unseen world drew away from my eyes. I sank into the couch beside the maddened djinn, exhaustion drawing at my bones. I felt lost, as if my one anchor had drawn itself up, leaving me to bob and drown in a storm. I was treading water in a hurricane. Dawn's mental tether, usually alight with a steady warmth, was dark and dim, like a campfire that had been dead for a year. I grasped at my hair, tears growing at the edges of my eyes. My direction always seemed so clear, so purposeful, yet stronger. Cross over to the other continent. Kill Nico. There were a dozen intermediary steps, but I felt so much more unsure. Did I even still try to prevent the reincarnation of the legacy? It was what Lady Dawn tasked me to do, but the phoenix had slain me and drawn my soul to this world. Did I even still try to complete her task? What should I do? I asked the room. The pervading presence had returned, bearing down on my body from everywhere and nowhere at once. I had a guess as to what it was, now. A fringe guess. After all, the relictoons were said to have their own kind of sentience. And something was picking apart my mind. Did this sentient dungeon feel my anguish? Did it understand it? Could it tell me what I should do next, or was it enjoying another lesser falling to the hubris of the Asura? I got no reply. I woke in a heap. My headache had diminished, drifting back to an effervescent thrum. I turned to the side, blearily recalling the events of yesterday. The djinn was gone. In his place, however, was a single orange feather as large as my forearm. I recoiled, the mana radiating off of it dreadfully similar to the pulsing from my core. I stared at it for a long time. The events from before I collapsed in a heap replayed in my mind, making my gut clench and overwhelming me with an urge to simply lie back down on the couch. If I went to sleep, it would all eventually go away, wouldn't it? I wouldn't have to worry about the legacy, or about my previous life, or about East Fiatra. I knew that my Asuran bond could not have left this feather. She was silent, quiet after her admission of guilt. The phoenix feather sat there, the pristine plumes radiating a soft red afterglow. The other conclusion was that it had been left by the maddened djinn. But where had he gotten it? What was the purpose of leaving it here? I thought of my bond's words again. Adjustments needed to be made. I felt emotion streaming from my mind again, but I couldn't begin to decipher what emotion it was. Was I angry? Was I feeling betrayed? Was that sorrow wrapped up in it all? Or was I growing indifferent to everything in front of me? I didn't know, and that only made everything burn brighter. I was so used to knowing what I felt. I grasped the feather in my hand. The maddened djinn had left it behind, and I hoped it was a gift. I felt a swirl of mana, its density and expression outside my understanding. I felt a temptation to drain the mana out of the feather, draw it into my core and let the thing disintegrate. I didn't want to look at anything bird-like for another millennium. Instead, I drew the feather into my dimension ring, the enormous item vanishing in a whirl of mana. I stood up slowly, forcing my emotions into a little box. I imagined digging a deep, deep hole, throwing the box in, and burying it once more. I sighed, my mind going carefully blank. I stood up, moving toward the refrigerator of the house. My mouth was as dry as the desert zone I had traversed before, and hunger clawed at my stomach. I needed to eat. It was cold inside the fridge. Tiny little electric displays told me the internal temperature, a comfortable 40 degrees. I wondered then how these worked. Did the relictoons truly recreate electric components, down to capacitors and transistors? Or was the ether simulating the effect? Peering behind the fridge for a moment, I saw a power outlet with a thick cable plugged in. I blinked. While interesting, it really didn't confirm anything, and my curiosity didn't extend to sticking a fork into the outlet to test if there was actually electricity running through it. I sighed, my shoulders slumping as I returned my attention to the fridge. Inside were a variety of snacks and drinks. I had grown used to the relictumes throwing familiar sights at me as I traversed them. I still hadn't quite expected to see a can of vanilla Coke. I grabbed the cool aluminum can, pulled it out, and checked over the ingredients. Yup, the relictume said this had caffeine. I popped the tab hesitantly, the sugary aroma of cola wafting into my nose. I felt that buried box of emotions stir in my mental backyard, but I closed my eyes and focused, shoving it deeper into the dirt. I took a sip of the drink. The sparkling taste of carbonation popping against my tongue felt so alien after months apart, yet so familiar at once. The caramel-colored concoction poured down my throat as I greedily drank, savoring the vanilla and nostalgia. It tasted of summer days after school, of cramming for exams on little sleep, of late-night talks with my brother, conversing on philosophy and the psychology of the human person. When I finished, my breathing was stilted. I threw away the can, grabbing the others in rapid haste. I pulled as many as I could into my dimension ring. When I realized I wouldn't have space for all my rations and the cans of sparkling soda, I hesitantly returned some to the shelf. This entire place had modern amenities. The TV turned on, displaying options for inputs and satellite, though there was no connection to be had. The water ran and the oven functioned, and I had preheated my daily tube of protein paste in the microwave. I left the house in a daze. I sighed as I turned around, looking at the suburban home. It was a living testament to my nostalgia, radiating warmth and hope for a past I would never have again. My tether with my bond was deathly silent. That was good. I didn't want to hear her right now. I didn't think I could look at her right now. Too many conflicting emotions arose at the thought of my soul partner. So I shoved them away. I looked up at the two portals at the end of the zone. One was an exit portal. It led to relative safety, the cold streets of East Fiatra. I wouldn't be hunted there as I would further on in the relictumes. Mardith may be waiting for me, but he was the devil I knew. I turned to the other shimmering purple portal. It led further into the relictumes, towards trials and tribulations. I'd never gone beyond this point. I'd left after a few zones, content with my progress, but I looked at the brimming sheen of violet. I felt my emotions rise again. I couldn't keep pushing them away, not without something to drive me forward, to keep me occupied, allowing that little box buried in the dirt to stay buried in the dirt. My hands gripped the hilts of oath and promise. I knew my choice before I even took it. I stepped forward, sliding through the violet portal. Chapter 75, The City of Fear. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. The relictumes were, by nature, nigh impossible to understand. The twisting connections of spatial pocket dimensions transcended what was considered common sense, providing challenge and danger to all who entered. The Jinn had condensed all of their world-bending knowledge, all of their understanding of the secrets of the universe, into each of these zones. Each dungeon floor was designed to bestow some sort of insight of ether to the ascender. It was a last-ditch attempt at preservation, keeping knowledge away from the oppressors. Few had made progress in gaining that insight. Instead, people only saw the surface-level rewards of gold and glory, skimming over the bountiful possibilities these tombs presented. If one could understand the way ether intertwined with the world, they could do anything. Rewrite space, see forward in time, create new life. And as I gazed up at the towering structures of steel and glass around me, I found my already exhausted mind struggling to find a reason why. How could this place bestow any sort of insight? How could it lead to knowing ether? Because all I could see in the looming skyscrapers, casting a deep shadow under an overcast sky, was a heart-wrenching reminder of my previous life. The zone I had stepped into looked like an earthen city. Tall, corporate buildings kissed the sky, crisscrossed by miles of asphalt and concrete. Power lines trailed along the empty, forgotten sidewalks, where traffic lights changed color for long-gone cars. In my previous life, men would peer from the top of those towers, looking down figuratively and literally on the pedestrians below. People would mill in droves, walking to their jobs or classes or events or clubs. But there was not a soul in sight. I was in a city of ghosts. I felt something building inside my chest like a dam about to burst, the pressure increasing exponentially. It coursed from my lungs and into my throat, and then I couldn't contain it anymore. I laughed, deeply and sonorously. It echoed out into the dead street, a traffic light turning red. There were no cars to stop. My laugh was uproarious, pressing against my sides until it hurt. The breezeless air accepted my maddened cackle like a debtor, drawing it from my lungs with a command. I had dealt with the absurd for so long. I felt tears gather at the edge of my eyes. My chest ached from my laughter. The relictumes had thrown so much at me. The constant reminders of my previous life were always there at the edge of my sight, mocking me with their similarity. The zone I had been in before was clinically close to a common 21st century suburb, but it was small. There were 10 houses at max, and then the illusion vanished. But this was a city. It was the pinnacle of old world urbanization. I almost didn't notice when the atmosphere shifted, a strange force weighing in the air, running thin fingers across my spine. My laughter finally died as a hand cracked through the concrete near my feet with the sound of splitting rock. The fingers were gnarled and twisted. Gray, sloughing skin barely clung onto a skeletal forearm. A dozen more hands thrust through the asphalt around me, filling the air with the sound of crumbling stone. The things started to haul themselves out, allowing me to get a glimpse. They looked like mangled corpses, each and every one of them. Some were trailing their innards on the ground behind them. Others lacked skin everywhere on their bodies or only had one arm. Each body was unique, covered in armor and holding strange weapons in their thin hands. Many looked months into decomposing, but they stood and walked all the same. But the most haunting thing about the corpses arraying themselves before me were their eyes. They glowed a deep, calling violet. Those pupils seemed to flare in time with the weight in the air, all attention focusing on me. I barely had time to react as twin blades of wind sighed toward me. I flipped sideways, allowing each blade to narrowly pass by, but a sphere of sturdy stone nearly hit me. Instead, I used a telekinetic push to fling myself toward a lamp pole nearby. I balanced precariously on the pole, just in time to notice several of the zombies point their hands toward me lethargically. My eyes widened in surprise as fireballs and shards of metal blurred in my direction. I threw up a wall of pushing force, deflecting many of the errant metal shards. When the fireball reached me, however, I caught it in one hand, feeling the heat sear at my telekinetic barrier. I threw the fireball back down like the world's most lethal baseball, aiming for one of the closer zombies. A wall of ice arose to block the attack, causing a slight puff of steam. I glanced to the side, seeing another corpse, this one looking barely female, with long, decaying hair and without an arm. That one had acted to protect the other. It snarled a guttural, grating sound, like that of nails being drawn over a chalkboard, yet somehow even worse. Blades of cutting wind soared toward me once more, shearing through the metal pole I stood on. It toppled forward, taking me with it, yet I let myself fall toward the cluster of living corpses, instead conjuring a handful of fire shot around my head. Some of the zombies moved exceptionally quickly, some lingering trace of mana empowering their bodies. I focused on them as the metal pole fell. I let my fire shot fly with a burst of telekinesis, simultaneously drawing oath and promise. I sent out a plume of fire as a wave of frost, wind, and earth cascaded toward me, conjured by half a dozen ragged zombies. My fire was quickly overwhelmed by the many spells, but it allowed me to use my telekinetic pushes to vault over the approaching tide of mana. I surveyed the damage my spells caused in that split instant, feeling a wave of disappointment. I noticed a few smoking holes in the rotting bodies where my attacks had struck, but no blood seeped from their wounds. One of my fire shot spells had punched a hole straight through a corpse's chest, a gaping void where the lungs should be. Yet it pulled itself forward, undeterred. I landed solidly, deflecting an errant blow from a corpse swinging an axe. The hit had a surprising amount of power behind it, but the blow was sloppy. Before I could follow up, another volley of attacks carved divots in the earth as the multi-elemental barrage soared toward me from every side. I deftly spun my saber, the cutting edge suffused with mana that enhanced its sharpness. It sheared straight through the axe-wielding zombie's neck, but I had to immediately throw a telekinetic push against the ground to avoid being overwhelmed. The spells clashed in a whirlwind of force right where I had been a moment before, the shockwave ripping through the air. The attacks made my leap out of the way twist slightly into a tumble, making me need to reorient as I tumbled. That made me unable to react when a stream of fire impacted me midair, blowing me off to the side. I crashed into the concrete with a thud, cracking the stone. My telekinetic shroud shuddered, but held firm. I twisted deftly to get my feet under me, lashing out with an indiscriminate wave of fire to clear the area. The corpses around me were scorched, pushed back with snarls and clicking teeth. They tumbled over each other as the force rippled outward, bodies falling over in a pile of limbs. That was when I noticed the make of the armor. Many of the corpses had armor with a slit down the spine, exposing tattered flesh. But some still had glowing runes along their spines. These were people, I thought with horror, realization dawning. These aren't just creations of the relic tombs. They've raised corpses, somehow. I was unprepared for the second wave of hands thrusting through the stone. One of them erupted right below my feet, the skeletal hands immediately latching onto my ankles. I brought both down along the wrists, severing them with ease. But the bodies kept rising. Where before there had only been a couple of dozen, now I couldn't count the pairs of hands fast enough. I'm going to be overwhelmed if I stay here, I thought, turning away from the slowly approaching horde and looking toward one of the tall buildings. They'll just keep coming. I threw out half a dozen telekinetic pushes as projectiles swarmed toward me, flares of white meeting smashing through rock, wind, and flame. I tilted my head, letting an arrow of metal shear past my cheek. I heard it strike the concrete behind me. Torin, a familiar voice called out with a hint of desperation. Over here, come on, quick. Any other mage would have had difficulty hearing it, but my sense of hearing was beyond comparable mages. I turned slightly toward the voice as more corpses piled closer, wondering if this was another trick of the zone. A burst of wind impacted the skull of one of the emerging zombies, obliterating it out of nowhere. Yet I recognized the spell that had just been used. Promise soared out of my hand, drawing a jagged line across an approaching zombie's neck. Oath, shivering with searing fire mana, decapitated another zombie. A burst of fire met another, though this one had a barrier of earth conjured to protect it. I turned about, trying to spot the source of the familiar voice. Torin, it called. Another punch of wind erupted near me, blowing off a zombie's arm. It didn't even seem to notice, lethargically pulling itself toward me. I had to dodge to the side to avoid an erupting plume of fire. Then I threw a sound grenade at an oncoming bolt of lightning. The sound grenade detonated like a gong, the ripples of mana disrupting the electric spell and making it fall short of my position. That was the biggest mistake I made. When that deep, sonorous rumble sounded, even more hands broke through the concrete, the corpses around me screeching in renewed fervor. They hunt by sound, the voice said. I finally managed to pinpoint it, calling from above. I turned my head as I sidestepped a shard of metal, allowing a fireball to splash against my telekinetic shroud. A zombie leapt at me, hefting a giant mace. I used a push of telekinesis to send it to the side, but I could swear they were getting faster. Darren Orden watched from the window of a nearby skyscraper, a panicked look on his usually jaunty face. He watched as a dozen more zombies pulled themselves from the street. Get over here, he yelled. I noticed some of the zombies turning slightly toward him, but each of my attacks made far more sound than he did. Every now and then, Darren thrust a fist forward, a punch of wind blowing apart the zombies that got too close. But I was quickly losing ground, free patches of concrete being washed away. I slammed a ton of telekinetic force underneath me, adding an explosive piston stamp at the same time. I rocketed through the air, soaring toward the building Darren was perched on top of. I felt my heart thrumming in my chest as I tried to escape, the wind tearing at my clothes. Yet as I twisted slightly, preparing for my feet to meet the building's wall, I saw the ground below. My eyes widened. The streets were a sea of seething purple eyes, all watching me in unison. The zombies glared at me with undisguised hate, mana whirling around each and every one of them. And then the volley started. Spells of every mana affinity shot in bolts and blasts and balls, trying to knock me out of the sky. Their aim was shabby, many of the projectiles going wide, but a fist-sized chunk of stone clipped my shoulder, sending a network of cracks along my barrier. I twisted slightly, easily adjusting for the strike. A dozen fireballs appeared in the air around me, flying off and seeking any spells that were getting too close. A baseball-sized chunk of stone nearly reached me, but a flash of telekinesis split it into a dozen shards before it could hit. Flecks of stone ricocheted harmlessly off my telekinetic barrier. I landed feet first against the building, just below Darren. He was peering out of a window, his fists clenched as he looked at the sea of enemies below. They were preparing another volley. I had no doubt it would tear this brick to smithereens. I spied a few of the newer zombies beginning to move through the crowd, a seeming purpose in their strides. The zombies that popped up more recently were less decayed than the others, their limbs and bodies intact. Instead of stumbling along, their movements were more intent, their purple eyes a deeper violet. Elites? Get in here, Darren said hastily, lowering a hand down to me, and use that spell of yours to kill our sound. That's how they hunt. I took his proffered arm with a grunt, allowing myself to be hauled into the building. It looked like a typical office setup, with cubicles as far as the eye could see. Darren immediately started running, not checking to see if I was behind him. His blonde hair was already matted with sweat. I pushed outward with a sound spell, muffling both my own noise and Darren's. Where are we going? I asked, vaulting over a computer desk. Darren shot me a piercing, panicked glare, raising a hand to his lips. Sound won't get a foot past us, I said reassuringly. I've erected a barrier around us as we run. I spared a quick glance behind me as I heard glass shattering. One of the more intact corpses had thrown itself through one of the window panes, and several more were following. Its beady eyes were locked on me, a short sword in its hand. You better have, Darren said after a moment, darting around a corner. I followed, using a pull of telekinesis to whip myself around the edge. Those necrotic bastards hunt primarily by sound. We need to get away from them first, then lay quiet. A tendril of water lurched toward me from behind, but Promise came in from the side, shearing straight through the aquatic tentacle. The zombies were unable to match our speed, but more kept coming. You better have a plan to get us out of this building, I said hoarsely. Trust me. Darren led me to the far end of the office building. We rushed past empty cubicles, the lighting overhead powered by unseen electricity. Papers were strewn across tables as if they had simply been left in the middle of a task. I couldn't stop to investigate, however, as I was forced to decapitate a zombie that got too close. Should I distract them with a sound grenade? I asked. It seemed like Darren and I were making progress as we bounded up a flight of stairs. That will just make more of them appear, even if it gets some of these undead off our backs, Darren replied with labored breath. No, we just need to get to the roof. We burst out of a metal door, the lock shearing as two strengthened mages slammed against the bar. It barely slowed us down as we burst back out into the open air, an overcast sky greeting us. Darren immediately turned around, throwing the metal pin in front of the roof access door. He lodged it shut, trying to make a barrier against whatever came up after us. We were about 5 stories up. Nearby, a skyscraper stretched 300 feet into the air, casting us in its dim shadow. What now? I said, feeling slightly breathless. We gained a lead on the undead by a decent margin, but I had no illusions they wouldn't catch up if we loitered. Darren narrowed his eyes at the nearby skyscraper. We're going to get into that tower of steel and glass, he said. The rest of my team is there, but you'll need to jump to get to it. The skyscraper? I said, feeling a bit confused. I can make that jump, sure. But what about you? Skyscraper? Darren replied, side-eyeing me. That's a good name for the building. I'll have to remember it. The leader of the unblooded party flashed me a grin that was a painful attempt at his usual jaunty smile. And you'll have to throw me across. My thoughts were interrupted as the door shook, a deep dent appearing in the metal. All right, I said, stepping backward and preparing to run. Jump right after me, okay? You're going to feel some resistance from my emblem. Let it through. Darren nodded, just as the door exploded in spellfire. I jumped, using a burst of telekinesis and piston stamp to launch myself high into the air, arcing toward the concrete walls of the skyscraper. A barren street passed underneath me, devoid of sound or life. I reached a hand toward the building, lashing out at it with a telekinetic pull. I lurched forward quicker. Darren couldn't jump nearly as far as me. I quickly sped past him in the air as I continued to climb, my magic far more suited to mobility. But I didn't let that stop me. My other hand snapped behind me as Darren reached the apex of his arc, his short clothes flapping in the breeze. My emblem activated, my own spell trying to take hold of the man. It shuddered against Darren's natural mana defenses. The striker began to fall. Come on, I thought, gritting my teeth and sending more mana into the spell. Drop your goddamn defenses, Darren. My emblem snapped into place just as Darren nearly left my range. I hauled with my mind, feeling the strain on my magic as I simultaneously pulled myself to the skyscraper and tugged on a man behind me. Darren whooped, which was thankfully still muffled by my sound bubble. His eyes were blown wide with adrenaline, a mix of excitement and terror on his face. We struck the skyscraper. Darren immediately scrabbled for a handhold, slipping for a moment before he managed to tag the ledge of a window. I simply clung on by using telekinetic pulls against my foot and hands, clinging like an absurd cross between a ninja and Spider-Man. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears, my blood pulsing in my veins. I turned back to the building we'd leapt from, meeting the baleful purple eyes of the undead. They had stopped, watching us from afar. Didn't think we'd make it, Darren said with a slight chuckle. By the sovereigns, that was a rush. What's stopping them from following us further? I asked breathily, hanging on desperately. The attention of the undead was still fixed on us with laser focus. They won't follow us if we're far enough away, Darren said, pulling himself up to a better position on the skyscraper. His face took on a solemn cast. Is your team okay? He said suddenly, looking down at me. I only saw you when I went to check. Did those corpses get them? I swallowed, thinking briefly about my bond. Is my team okay? I'm on a solo ascent, I said absently, maintaining eye contact with the eerie undead down below. There was some sort of familiar tone drifting through the air, but I couldn't put my finger on why it felt so intimately recognizable to my subconscious. I wasn't with anybody. I felt Darren's eyes piercing my back. We should get to my team, he said slowly, a note of something undecipherable in his voice. Come on, it's not good to be out in the open for too long. The ascender casually smashed one of the glass panes, vaulting in. After a last glance at the undead behind me, I followed after him. Chapter 76, The Lay of the Land. Published by web novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. I followed after Darren slowly, my thoughts a jumble. The fact that this zone imitated a city was a constant point in my mind, throbbing like a wound. I had no illusions about the fact that my presence must have caused this zone to somehow change. This was my fault somehow. My team is a few floors up, Darren said, his breathing finally evening out. We've been here longer than I'd care to admit, so we can get you sorted. I ground my teeth. How long have you been here? I asked as we entered a stairwell. Darren was quiet for a moment. Nearly 3 weeks in our time, he said with a slight, defeated air. The undead are an effective barrier to getting anywhere in this zone. It's nearly impossible to explore without causing an entire graveyard to pull themselves out of the stone. That news was worse than I expected. The unblooded party was among the best ascenders, considering they'd been stuck in a single convergence zone for weeks spoke to the difficulty of this place. But that can change, now, Darren said, opening the door to another floor. You've got some sort of rune that lets you dampen sound. That will change everything. We'll finally be able to get out of here. The floor in front of us opened up like a penthouse apartment. The ceiling was tall, a balcony with a glass railing looking down over a wide living area. Couches surrounded a coffee table, and I could see an elaborate kitchen set up off to the side. I recognized Jared lounging on one of the couches. His beard had gotten even longer since I'd last seen him, clearly lacking any sort of maintenance. He was snoring slightly, his hammer resting on the ground beside the couch. His shield was leaning haphazardly against the back. Alandra was sitting across from him, her auburn hair a mess. She had bags under her eyes, and the slump of her shoulders had a defeated air to them. Her freckles didn't stick out to me as they did in the desert zone, and her white and red battle robes were marked with cuts and burns. But there was another woman across from them, looking at some sort of map. Her hair was a darker blonde than Darren's, but her pale blue eyes were the first to catch on our entrance. Darren, she said, standing up, a frown on her face. You made it back? Darren smiled slightly, some of his usual jauntiness shining through as he met the stranger's eyes. I'm afraid so. I can't let Jared keep napping all the time, after all. Alandra perked up next, her tired eyes widening when they landed on me. Torin, she asked, wiping at her eyes as if she wasn't believing them. She looked at Darren once more. Was he the one that you found? Darren nodded, clapping me on the back. We heard the sounds of your battle from up here, Torin, he said. It's happened quite a few times in the past weeks. I've tried to get to the ascenders that pop into the tombs, but it's rare that I've actually reached them in time. And even rarer that someone gets out alive, he said somberly. Torin, the dark blonde woman asked, standing from her chair and setting down the map she was looking at. As in Torin Dane, the mage you took on a prelim a while back? Darren ran a hand through his hair. I almost forgot to introduce you to Dima. This is Torin of name Blood Dane. Torin, this is Dima, our caster. She wasn't able to join us last time, unfortunately. I nodded to the caster. Pleasure to meet you, I said, though I wish it would have been under better circumstances. Dima snorted. I heard you had an eventful prelim, though, she said. Shame I couldn't join, but I've got family back home I need to spend time with. I'd rather spend time with family of my own than fight scorpions, I said with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. I didn't like being reminded of my slipping memory. How long until I forgot my brother's face, too? Until the voices of my family became indistinct and grainy, worn down against the winds of time? If there's anything Darren and I agree on, it's that we hate insects. Dima's eyes traced over Darren. Is that so? She said, cocking her head slightly. Darren rolled his eyes. We have a mutual distaste for things with more than 4 legs. They're fundamentally wrong, I affirmed, shuddering slightly as I remembered the scorpion at the end of the desert zone. Alandra settled back into the couch, closing her eyes. But I'm sorry you're here, Torin, she said with a sigh. We're stuck here, have been for a while. I frowned. Can't you locate the portal with your spell? I asked, remembering her strange fire compass. I did when we first got here, she said with a quiet sigh, not opening her eyes. But you can't go near the ground at all. That's why we're all up here, close to the clouds. Any sound that makes it to those strange roads makes those horrid undead burst from the ground. Alandra seemed to wilt. I felt disjointed seeing the cocky conjurer so disheartened. Surely there are other people in this convergence zone you can work with, I hedged. There's no way everyone who entered here besides you has died. Dima responded in place of Alandra. There are a few other groups holed up in the other steel towers. But they're extremely distrustful. We're all almost out of limited food and water, making barely any progress in getting to that portal. Darren saw the place from afar. It is an island with a tall steel tower, and around that island is an entire lake. Quote. Darren's face took on a determined look. That's going to change now, he said with confidence. He looked at me from the side of his eye. Torrent here can nullify sounds around him. Perfect for getting past these undead. Alandra perked up, blinking and looking at me. Dima didn't look so convinced. That's real nice, Darren, she said. But we won't be able to do anything if we don't get more supplies. I haven't eaten in 2 days, and my water won't last through tomorrow. And I know you haven't touched a bite of food for almost a week. She looked at him imperiously, as if that tidbit of information cemented her argument. I swallowed, taking another look at Darren. On second inspection, maybe his cheeks looked a little too hollow. His form a bit too gaunt. I'll be fine, Dima, the leader of the unblooded party said dismissively. We'll get out of here soon enough, you'll see. And if there's another zone after this one, she snapped. What then? Will you just let yourself starve? Quote. That's not going to happen, Darren said stiltedly, the tension rising in the room. Alandra covered her face with her hands, leaning over in a defeated posture. We'll be fine, okay? Just like every time. This isn't like every time, Dima snapped, moving closer. This zone is like nothing we've ever seen before. Nothing anyone has seen before in the Relic Tombs. It's an alien city, she said, throwing her hands up. This is an entire city. It's like the ghost of a civilization. The Relic Tombs have always been strange, but I've had to kill things that shouldn't be able to move. How can you expect the next zone to go back to the norm? I stepped back slightly, feeling a wave of guilt. Dima hadn't directed the words at me, but I couldn't pretend anymore. This exact situation had been what I feared so deeply on my prelim, getting the group caught in a trap they couldn't escape. How many people had Darren seen swallow the moment they stepped into the zone? How many people died because of my effect on the Relic Tombs? I looked across the apartment as Darren and Dima continued to have their back and forth, my mind disassociating. Alandra ignored it with a tired gaze on the floor, defeated utterly. Jared simply slept through his problems. My mind began to tumble about, lost in waves of regret. If I hadn't come into the Relic Tombs, these people wouldn't be trapped. They wouldn't be facing such hell. So where will you get us more food? Dima challenged, her arms crossed. Just take it from the other groups around here? Dima's words sparked something in my subconscious. I remembered how the town zone before this one had been stocked full of food in the refrigerators. I didn't know much about this place yet, but I'd seen something on the ground when I had been fleeing the zombies. If the odds were good. Darren had a pained look on his face, but I spoke up before the argument could continue any longer. I've got a few weeks of food to spare, I said, cutting through the spat. But there might be a better solution available to us. Darren turned to me, a thankful flash in his eyes. Dima tilted her head, looking at me with surprise. What do you mean, Torren? The striker asked, taking my offered way out thankfully. I licked my lips. I had to be careful about this. In how much I showed I understood of this place. When I was fighting the undead, I said slowly. I saw a building. It was a store, I think. One that probably has food inside. And with my ability to quiet our footsteps, we can get down there. Restock on all the supplies we need. That made both Darren and Dima pause. You're sure? The blonde striker asked slowly. His piercing green eyes looked me over quizzically. If you're right about that, it's worth a shot. Dima didn't look so convinced, but she relented anyway. If you can get some food from this horrid zone, we can work on more long-term plans. Darren's hand rested on my shoulders as he gave Dima a strained smile. I'll go with him, he said. Make sure he doesn't get himself into too much trouble. Darren turned me around forcefully, marching us both away from the penthouse. It was only because of my enhanced hearing that I picked up Dima's words. You can't keep sacrificing yourself forever, Darren, she whispered, a strange longing in her eyes. Darren made for the stairwell, but a tug from me drew the confused striker in a different direction. I was feeling numb, each movement more like an echo of what I truly wanted. I stopped in front of a pair of elevators. The striker looked at me like I was a loon. I ignored him as I pressed the button to go down. Predictably, it lit up as I made the selection. So, Darren said, looking at the elevator doors. What's this do? Shouldn't we be taking the stairs? Have you ever seen a mechanical lift? I said, trying for an apt comparison. Darren nodded. Yeah, they're used for the construction of some of the bigger buildings. He paused. Wait, are you implying that this is a lift? The striker said, a bit incredulous. And it will take us all the way to the bottom? We were about 20 stories high in the air. I understood Darren's confusion if all he had seen were winch mechanisms. It makes sense, yeah? I said, gesturing to the buttons. One for up, one for down. If this place was a city, people can't afford to walk all those stairs every day just to get to their jobs. Darren didn't look convinced, but the elevator opening with a ding spared me any more explanation. I entered without hesitation, immediately looking at the buttons arrayed before me. I pressed the one labeled as the first floor as the striker slowly entered the small box, a frown on his face. I had to hold him back from lashing out with his gauntlets as the doors shut us in. Easy there, I said tiredly. It's going to take us down now. Sure enough, the elevator box began to lower. Darren looked positively unnerved by the experience, which made me chuckle slightly. Over the speaker above us, a song began to play. Well, you can tell by the way I use my walk. I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. Music loud and women warm, I've been kicked around. Since I was born. I ground my teeth. The beat was familiar to me. I never knew these lyrics by heart. Did that mean the Relic Tombs had drawn them from my actual previous world? Or had I actually known them all along? Things seem tense with your team, I said, trying to escape the constant reminders of my previous life. Maybe the words to the song were just made up, only following the tune. Darren sighed. We've been cooped up in that little apartment for weeks without hope of escape, he said with a sigh. Whenever I notice a disturbance down below, I try and go out to see if there's somebody I can save. You're the first success. It's wearing us all down, burning away our hopes. The music continued to hack at my ear, chipping my patience away note by note. And now it's all right, it's okay. And you may look the other way. We can try to understand. The New York Times effect on man. What about that island where the exit portal is? I asked, trying to ignore the song. The elevator continued down and down, the little number at the top of the display ticking lower. 15, 14, 13, 12. It can't all be hopeless. It's on an island at the center of a lake, Darren said, running a hand through his hair. The tallest skyscraper I've ever seen in this zone. It nearly pierces the clouds, and there are undead around it. If we want to actually make it through, it would take one hell of a plan. And, Darren licked his lips. Whether you're a brother or whether you're a mother. You're staying alive, staying alive. Feel the city break in and everybody shaken. And, I prodded, clenching my fists. I forcefully breathed in and out, trying to center myself. This space was so close. 9, 8, 7, 6. There's something in that lake. I could sense it. Some sort of horrid monster, nesting there like a king. I couldn't get closer to the water's edge. I feared it would see me, Darren said, not noticing my rising anger. And we're staying alive, staying alive. Ah, ha, 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 staying alive, staying alive. Ah, ha, 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 staying alive. My mind went blank for a moment. All the pent-up stress, my failure to keep these people out of harm's way, the truth of my reincarnation, and that horrid fucking tune scraping at my eardrums. It burst out of me like a storm. I whirled, slamming my mana-enhanced fist into the wall of the elevator. The speaker, which had been spewing, staying alive, as if there was no tomorrow, crumpled around my fist. The song cut out abruptly, sparing my mind any more reminders of Earth. The elevator doors opened on the bottom floor. I'm going to get you out of this zone, I promised Darren, who was looking at me warily. I'm going to get everyone out of this zone. Chapter 77, Convenience. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torren Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. I peered over the edge of the rooftop, looking at the milling undead below. Their skin was sloughing off, all in various states of decay. Instead of bright, shining violet, their eyes were dull pinpricks of purple. They wandered about lethargically, dragging themselves without purpose. Most had cuts along their spines where half-decayed red runes stood out, making my head swim with questions. So they just stay in the streets even after losing aggro? I asked Darren, who was crouched by my side. He nodded, his eyes trained on the next building. Once they pop up, they don't go away until you cut off their heads or pierce their hearts. They're unrelenting, horrid bastards, but most are easy to fool. I frowned. Most? I asked. The ones that chased us up the stairs back when I found you, Darren said. Those ones pop up if the mages they're fighting don't die fast enough. They're smarter, faster, and more deadly. You can avoid these grunts just fine by muffling your steps, but those ones will follow you even if you don't make a sound. And they'll compel the others to follow. I remember the zombies that had tracked us so far, only letting off once Darren and I leapt to the walls of the skyscraper. Their skin hadn't been nearly as decayed as the other corpses, with most of them largely intact. What did that mean? Did these zombies lose their abilities as they decomposed? Or was it something else? So we stick to the rooftops, I said, at least until the store I saw. I looked back at the striker. How do you feel about being hauled through the air? Darren's sharp emerald eyes flashed with something giddy. Like you did to get me to the skyscraper's walls? I'd be up for that any day. Quote. And so we found ourselves hopping from building to building. I pulled Darren along, the man whooping in the air beside me. It was a noticeable drain on my mana reserves to hold a grown man in the air, made even more difficult by the fact that he had to keep watch on his own mana constantly. If he let his focus slip for even an instant, his natural defenses would lash out at my control, ramping the difficulty up exponentially. The striker seemed to be enjoying the ride far more than I was. I looked down at a street, a few corpses meandering here and there along the decimated pavement. I held my arm behind me, suctioning my hand to the bricks. The soles of my feet lashed themselves to the wall, keeping me from falling. I hung there like a certain web-slinging superhero, watching for any of the elite zombies that might see through my sound dampening. I was close to the store I'd spotted coming in. The signs of my previous battle were all around me. Scorched earth, cuts in the building where the wind had ground against stone, and shards of metal still lodged in the street. I spotted the metal pole I perched on, cut cleanly through near the base. And then I finally spotted my quarry. A bright sign illuminated a dark storefront, a splash of color amidst the ever-present gray. Trader Joe's. I looked down the street, keeping my eyes peeled for the elite undead who were smart enough to attack me on sight rather than sound. See anything? I asked Darren. The sound barrier I maintained around us made it safe to talk, and it was always good to have a second pair of eyes. Can you float me around that corner? He asked, pointing toward the edge of the building I was hanging off of. We gotta check our corners. I obliged, willing the mana carrying him to shift him further. The control aspect of my telekinetic spell form didn't have the same issues with power exertion over distance. The force I could exert with my pushes and pulls decreased linearly the further they got from my body. With absolute control, however, it was more complicated. The further the mana was from me, the harder it was to maintain. Not in an easy to discern way like the other aspect, though. It was a shame I couldn't make myself fly with my telekinesis. Everything I controlled moved relative to my own body, so I couldn't make myself simply hover. Darren peeked his head around the corner, swiveling his head. We're good, he said, allowing me to draw him back. He followed my gaze to the Trader Joe's sign. Is that where we're going? It doesn't look special. Yeah, I replied. I let us drop to the battered concrete, feeling an invisible weight leave my core as I released Darren from my shimmering white telekinesis. Our feet touched down silently. I darted toward the sliding doors of the Whole Food store. I waited for a second in front of them for a moment. So, what are we waiting? The doors opened as the sensor detected my presence. 4. Darren finished awkwardly. I stepped in, my head darting left and right for the undead. The inside of the store was just as it might have been on Earth. A grocery aisle, one for dry goods, and more. I was immediately struck by the smell. The odor of rotting vegetables assaulted my nose the moment I stepped inside, nearly making me gag. It wasn't as bad as the Fiacran sewers, however. The source of the stench was quickly apparent. Every single bit of produce left out was rotting, their deep brown juices soaking their stands. What the hell? Darren said, more taken aback by the smell than I was. Is all the food here rotten? Quote. No, I said, stepping into the store once I realized there were no undead waiting. Just the produce. It's been left out for a long while, after all, I said. It made sense. Darren said he'd been here for 3 weeks. All the perishable goods in this place hadn't been rotated in nearly a month at least. Darren followed after me in a bit of awe as I navigated to the dry goods section. I wondered how an entire civilization could feed themselves, packed in like sardines, he said, his eyes tracing over everything. But if there are a whole bunch of places like this, it makes sense. I grunted, not really listening. I knelt down in front of a bag of rice, turning it over. It was a good 20 pounds, labeled Mahatma. I'm going to grab all the rice I can, I said, not looking back at Darren. He still seemed to be in a bit of a daze. You should probably get whatever you think your team needs. The piercing green eyes of the striker landed back on me as I inspected the bag. Why are you focused on rice? He asked, sounding a bit confused. I sighed, then hefted the bag up to show him the back. See this here? I said, running my finger under the calorie count per serving. That's the amount of calories each cup of rice has. On average, rice has far more calories than any other grain of the same weight. Nearly 3 times for most. Darren cocked his head, smirking slightly. I'm afraid you've lost me here, Torin. You can read this font? And what are calories? Yes, I can, I said, sounding more venomous than I would have liked. Calories are basically the energy you get from food. Just trust me. Darren raised his hands, slightly taken aback by the snap in my tone. All right, I'll see if there's anything here they need. He sauntered off to inspect what this place had to offer, leaving me to silently stew. This would normally be the time I'd ask Dawn for her advice, or she would tell me what steps I could take next. These brief moments of silence after a conversation ended were when my bond and I spoke. Yet the silence between us yawned ever deeper, swallowing any chance of conversation. I looked up at the fluorescent lights above me as I stashed the bag of rice into my dimension ring. I left the majority of my supplies back with the unblooded party, which allowed me to fill up on goods here. I grabbed gallons of water, rice, some flour, and other necessities. As I moved, I realized that I was probably showing too much familiarity with these systems. The Alacrian alphabet wasn't too far off from that of Earth, but there were still distinct differences. It wasn't just different fonts. It was they were once one script but diverged a millennium ago. I had the advantage of growing up reading and writing both Alacrian and Earthen alphabets, so I wasn't hampered by having to read these labels. I had to remind myself that Darren was. He wouldn't be able to know what an elevator was, or even what calories were. Yet I acted familiar with all of these concepts. Part of me wanted to act the fool, pretending to have simply guessed these things or use clever inferences to explain them away. Maybe I encountered something similar in another zone. Perhaps there was a prototype of a lift being used in Fiatra. But another part of me was tired of pretending. I was more Earthen than Alacrian in my viewpoints and experience, and constantly having to suppress a fundamental part of myself left me drained. How long could one be in their hometown and pretend they were clueless to its workings when each and every street was memorized in the back of their minds? My dimension ring was full relatively shortly. I'd probably grab a month's worth of food, even accounting for the entire unblooded party. It wouldn't be good food, but I wagered the mages would rather eat plain rice than nothing at all. I found Darren staring contemplatively at the self-checkout aisle. The screens displayed options for him to pay in big, bold letters. He seemed amused by that. Got everything you need? I asked, trudging to his side. He looked at me from the side of his eye. Yup, I grabbed mostly canned food since the rest of the product here seemed spoiled. Good call, I said. Are you ready too? My words were cut off by the sound of a fireball detonating outside, the heat blowing through the windows. The glass rattled as mana flared, sending a shockwave through the ground. Darren and I were moving before I even registered what had happened. My first guess was that we had somehow been spotted, but the lack of undead around us quickly dispelled that hypothesis. Did somebody else just pop into this zone? I asked, keeping my eyes forward. Sounds like it, Darren said, smashing through the sliding doors. He didn't even wait for them to automatically open, the glass bouncing off our protective shrouds. Come on, we've got a chance to get them out with your help. I obliged, following the sounds of battle. The explosions and crashes, clear sounds of a fight, echoed from a block or so away. How long do we have until the stronger undead start spawning? I asked, trying to calculate the merits of rushing ahead of Darren. I was faster than he was, after all. A minute or so, he said. He must have seen the indecision in my eyes. Go on ahead, I'll catch up, you're faster than me. I nodded, then slammed a push into the ground with a well-timed piston stamp. I silently lurched forward, speeding up as I moved toward the fight. I could see the undead before I even noticed their target. They milled about weakly, chucking spells toward a central position in an almost lazy manner. But their numbers made up for their sloth. Those spells quickly multiplied. I saw something flash in the air, a quick glare of white before it retracted. Whatever it was killing zombies quickly. The weapon scythed through their skulls like wheat until it was stopped by a conjured shield. The weapon darted back toward its owner too fast for me to inspect it. I still couldn't get a good look at who was fighting from the swarm blocking my sight, but I thought I had a good idea of where they were. I focused on casting a sound spell. You need to move to the south, I said, casting my voice over the crowd. You'll be overwhelmed if you stay too long. More of these undead are going to spawn. I can help get you out, but I'm too far away right now. I didn't get a reply, but I didn't expect one. I held my breath, hoping my message had been received. And then the direction of attacks changed. They abruptly shifted toward my direction, the person inside attempting to carve their way through. Perfect, I thought, drawing oath. I focused fire mana into the edge, concentrating it to a fine point. Then I looked up, gauging my foes. The undead hadn't noticed me yet, as was to be expected. I hadn't made a sound near them. But that was about to change. I planted my foot back, holding my saber near my hip. Then I unfurled like a tornado, twisting my hip and lashing my arm out. My sword let out a horizontal cutting edge of fire, severing a dozen heads in a row before the zombies even realized what was happening. The corpses dropped as I exhaled. And then they turned to me. I was forced to use a telekinetic push to redirect a fireball, then use a slew of fire shot to knock a lurching zombie to the side. I parried the haphazard strike of a rusted sword, sliding my red patterned saber along the edge and piercing the undead wielder straight through the eye. Promise rocketed from its sheath, deflecting another blow that would have caved in my back. The little dagger twisted around, impaling itself into another skull. Violet eyes went dark as my blades reaped bloody vengeance, but I knew my playtime was over when I turned aside an unexpectedly strong mace blow. The wielder wasn't nearly as decomposed as the nearby grunts, and their eyes shone with explicit malice. All right then, I said through gritted teeth. I threw a testing telekinetic punch, simultaneously using promise to ward off any normal undead that got too close. My telekinetic shroud resisted a dozen weaker spells as they splashed against it, the cost of dodging too wasteful. The elite put its mace in the way of my blow but was unprepared to resist the force. Its arm twisted in a very unhealthy direction with a sickening crack. The momentum sent it stumbling slightly, but before I could finish it off, I was forced to deflect a whirling ball of orange fire, immediately followed by the rapid lunge of another elite undead. The first creature wasn't even fazed by the destruction of its weapon arm, trying to claw at me with metal-coated fingers. I swung my hand to the side, the mana flowing through my veins and my telekinetic shroud enhancing the blow. The elite's metal claws shattered from my knuckles, sending it to the ground. It snarled hideously, its rotting gums peeled back. I caught the second elite's skull with my palm, its arms too short to reach the body. I snarled, pumping fire mana through my hand. A gout of flame burst from my palm, searing straight through the elite's head and burning several lurching undead on the other side. I let go of the body, letting the headless corpse tumble. I stabbed oath down into the body of my first opponent, relishing the blade piercing its heart. Those burning purple eyes glared at me for a long instant, before the light vanished from it. I distantly noticed punches of wind impacting the skulls around me, mowing them down fast. Darren had arrived. I spared a glance toward the north. That white flash was carving through the zombies like wheat, stalled for a few moments by elites that appeared to take their attention. But they were close now, only a bit more of a push and we would meet up. I exhaled, then pushed outward with an unfocused nimbus of fire. The spell pushed away from me like the epicenter of an explosion, washing over the nearby undead. This wasn't one of my template spells. Its effects were noticeably weaker than my fireballs and fire shot, but these zombies barely had any defenses to speak of, besides the randomly conjured shield. Corpses in a radius of several meters around me went up like dry tinder, snarling and screeching as they burned away. Promise zipped about of its own accord, running itself through the chests and skulls of any undead that remained standing, ending them for good. The corpses littered the streets, a small circle devoid of enemies around me. For a moment, I dared to think Darren might be wrong. I could kill these things in droves, felling them like a woodcutter does a tree. I barely expended any mana doing so. Maybe I could stand my ground here, wiping them all out instead of having to run. That thought was wiped from my mind very, very quickly. A dozen more hands punched through the already decimated concrete, where before all the hands had been rotting, these were just a sickly gray. All elites, I thought, calling promise back to my hands. It took a good few strikes to take down the elites, and they tended to try and work together. They didn't fall like chaff. It was at that moment that a white flash severed the heads of a few standing undead. I turned, ready to greet the mage I would try and save. And halted, my jaw growing slack. The white flash had been a long, white dagger, a ring on the pommel tied to some strange wire. But that wasn't what made me feel a measure of shock. The mage held his bone dagger in one hand, a length of that strange wire trailing from the hilt to a loop he held taut in his other fist. His teal-green cloak seemed to float on his shoulders, and his windswept white hair was pulled away from his face. Severin Denor's sea-green eyes looked back at me, not mirroring my surprise in the slightest. Chapter 78, Chance Meetings. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. I wasn't given time to process my surprise. Darren slid next to me on cushions of wind, gliding to a stop as if he were skating. We gotta get out, now, he called, punching the skull of an elite before it could fully escape its concrete tomb. I shook my mind free of questions for the moment, stabbing a zombie through the skull with oath's point. It came back free of blood, but there was a coating of some sort of rot over the red-layered metal I had to burn away with a flourish of fire mana. Follow us, I said to Severin. We need to get far enough away that they won't follow, and do so without making a sound. Keep close to me, my sound barrier only extends so far. Severin nodded, but the elites had already burst from the ground. I was forced to lash out at one with a dozen quick, telekinetic punches. It crumpled, but not before another 4 tried to pile on me from every side. I lashed out with oath, turning one of their weapons aside. A cutting arc of wind impacted my telekinetic shroud but broke without cutting deeply. A conjured fireball intercepted the next scythe of wind, exploding midair. Meanwhile, I thrust my saber through a thin gap in the snarling undead's chain armor, skewering its heart. I withdrew my blade with a flourish. When I swung the saber next, a wave of fire billowed out, consuming one of my attackers whole. As promise drew its ragged edge across the eyes of my assailants, I spared a glance at my companions. Darren was using measured steps, throwing his fists out in a blur. Every time he did so, fists of wind appeared at odd angles, hitting the undead from unexpected areas. Almost every single swing of his fists downed one of the zombies, their inability to keep up with the strange directions of his attacks working to his advantage. Severin, however, was a blur. Every now and then, he appeared to take a step forward, before a strange buzzing sound burst outward, and he'd appear several yards away, skidding to a stop. He didn't use his dagger how I would have expected. Instead of holding it in his hands and using it to parry any incoming attacks, he threw the weapon with pinpoint precision. Then he pulled on the thin wire tied to the loop at the back, causing the weapon to jerk in specific movements as it turned midair. He ducked and whirled, swinging the wire around him and using the dagger like a wide, cutting scythe. He used it like some amped-up rope dart. Sometimes the elites tried to latch onto his wire, stopping him from using it. Whenever they did so, his hand blurred similar to how his entire body had before and the wire sheared right through whatever was trying to hold it with the sound of a whip cracking. A handful of fire shot punched holes in an approaching zombie's chain armor, searing holes in its heart. It dropped, allowing me an easy line of sight to another elite. That one tried to deflect promise, but the blade darted out of its way and then buried itself in its hateful violet eye. Our run to the nearby building slowed as we were assaulted by legions of spawning undead, each kill letting 2 more spawn. I was beginning to feel worried when we finally reached the edge of a taller brick building. Darren, I yelled, I'm going to grab you with my spell form. Let it through. I couldn't check to see if the striker had heard me. As promise returned to its sheath, the effort of controlling it along with Darren too much, I pushed out with my emblem. The mana shuddered for a moment as my mind clashed with the unblooded leader's innate defenses, but he thankfully let them slip for a brief moment. I thrust my hand up, willing the striker to follow. He lurched into the air with a whoop, arcing up toward the rooftops. I turned to Severin, whose wire had just finished wrapping around a corpse's throat. He flicked his arm, making it blur. The wire went taut with a buzz, severing the head and making the dagger return to his hand with a thunk. I need you to drop your mana defenses for a moment, I yelled, directing the message over to the Denor air with a pulse of sound mana. A large boulder of earth nearly squashed me, but a dozen quick, roaring strikes with telekinesis as it neared shattered it with the sound of cracking thunder. I caught one of the basketball-sized chunks of stone as it crashed down, weaving around the falling debris. My hand sunk into the rock with a crunch as I clenched my hand. Then I threw the stone with a burst of telekinesis. It exploded into an uncountable number of deadly shards, peppering the undead in front of me like a dozen shotgun shells layered on top of one another. I blinked, taken aback by the effectiveness of that attack. That gives me a really good idea, I thought. No, I won't do that, Severin said in response. I was about to protest, but the Denor air simply threw his dagger toward the building Darren was perched on. It flew true, lodging into the wall. The thin, metallic-looking wire went taut as Severin pulled. I saw his body turn a strange, lightish hue, then he yanked his arm downward. Instead of dislodging the dagger as I would have expected, Severin shot up toward the sky, trailing his line. He moved abnormally fast, reaching 50 feet in record time. The light tinge around his body faded, and the Denor ascender's momentum bled off with unnatural speed. The hue was replaced with a darker one. The striker halted almost immediately in his ascent, dropping to the rooftops like a stone. Okay, then, I thought, a little peeved. We can play it your way. I used a powerful burst of telekinesis and fire below my feet, the explosion launching me straight up. I sent out a gout of fire as I rose, burning away a few projectiles that made it too close. I lashed out at the rooftop with a telekinetic pull, making me lurch to the side. I landed with a skid, breathing roughly. I immediately restarted my sound barrier, letting it cover us all. We need to run, I said, pointing toward the skyscraper the unblooded were camping in. If we get there, we'll be in the clear. Think you can watch our backs? Darren said to Severin, keeping his eyes forward. You won't be ambushed from behind, Severin affirmed. His dagger was clutched in a white-knuckled grip, his wire held tautly between his hands. He better damn well hope so. I crashed through a 10th floor window, glass shattering into tiny slivers around me. I rolled, then came to my feet in one smooth, instinctual motion. I was followed shortly by the lurching form of Darren, outlined in white with his hair matted to his forehead. He had a few cuts along his arms, the result of our pitched battle. Once I set him down on the ground, he slumped against a nearby wall. Severin was the last to arrive. He shot straight in like an arrow, a faint whitish tinge to his body. Then the hue shifted and he cracked against the floor, his momentum evaporating. He looked unharmed. I wiped a layer of sweat from my brow. That was horrid, I said. You've been doing this, how often? I asked Darren. They usually never get that strong, Darren said, heaving for breath. Most ascenders died or were overwhelmed before I could get to them. He looked at Severin. Nice to meet you, by the way, Darren said with a laugh. You've met him before, I said dismissively, already trudging to the elevator. I pressed the up button, watching the little display at the top of the door slowly change. He was at the Shimmerkins Horde after my prelim. Darren squinted at Severin. Now that you mention it. Severin huffed, brushing off his clothes and sheathing his dagger. That bar is one of the only places in the entire second layer that they'll charge you a fair price for a drink. Darren leaned against the metal frame of the elevator. You can say that again, he said, his breathing steadying out a bit. My team goes there after most of our ascents. They don't charge us for our alignment. I frowned, peering back at Severin. It was strange that I'd see another familiar face here, but it wasn't like a mage could be tracked through the relic tombs. This was just another person I condemned to this hellish zone. Why do you care about the price of beer? I asked, raising a brow. You could afford the most expensive wines in the relic tombs several times over. Severin crossed his arms. I have enough of people trying to rip me off. It's rare to ever find a place that is fair. Quote. I snorted with a bit of disdain, thinking of Mardith and his horrid crusade against the people of East Fiatra. I had considered trying to call in the aid of the Denors to pressure the vicar to release his hold on the people. The stipulation Severin had given for the backing of his family, however, was allowing him to go on an ascent with me. I'd considered that before I'd seen the drastic effects of my presence, only thinking there would be a few cans of coffee popping up here and there or a random poster of an earthen band. Now, however, I couldn't go along with that in good conscience. Besides, I thought sourly, offering to go on an ascent is kind of a moot point when he's already here. Darren raised his hand. I think I'm missing some context here, he said, then pointed at Severin. Who are you, exactly? Torin seems to know. Severin of High Blood Denor, the white-haired mage said smoothly, seeming to give the admittance no weight. I chortled as Darren's eyes widened. He had made a good living for himself as an ascender, but meeting the heir to High Blood Denor was like a successful businessman meeting the top brass of a multi-billion-dollar company. To his credit, he fixed his features quickly. The name's Darren Warden, the Wind Striker said, nodding to Severin. I hope we can get along. The elevator door opened, letting all of us into the box. I was the first to go, Darren a reluctant second, and Severin a hesitant third. So, what have you found out about this zone? Severin asked as I clicked the button for floor 20. Darren's jovial air faltered. Those undead down there hunt by sound, he said solemnly, and their difficulty ramps up the longer you fight them. That's why my team is hunkered at the top of this skyscraper. Skyscraper? Severin asked. He shifted uneasily as the elevator began to ascend, looking at the numbers changing uncertainly. Torin came up with the name, Darren said. We were running out of food up there. We've been trapped in this zone for a few weeks, but our new ascender figured out that there are stores down on the ground that have food supplies. That was why we were able to reach you so fast. We had just finished stocking up. Severin gave me a look that seemed to cut into my mind. You figured that out? He said, raising a brow. How long have you been in this zone? I narrowed my eyes, sensing an undertone to Severin's words that made me distinctly uncomfortable. His green eyes darted to the panel of numbers denoting the floors, then back to me. Less than a day, I said honestly, though I hope we'll be out soon. The undead hunt by sound and I can eliminate any noise we make, I added, trying to shift the topic. Severin tapped his foot against the floor of the elevator. His teal fur-lined cloak couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. Here's hoping. The elevator opened into the hallway. Darren went first, moving toward the penthouse with a spring in his step. He opened the door, sweeping into the living room. I followed after at a more sedate pace, noting that Jared was awake now. He was polishing his shield with a rag. Nearby, Alandra was asleep on the couch. I brought gifts, everyone, he said happily, flipping up his dimension ring and swiping it out of the air. Food and drink. That caused Jared to perk up, a grin spreading across his face. About time, you ugly lug, he said, rising to his feet. I've been starving here. He noticed me belatedly. Hello, kid. Alandra told me you popped in earlier. Shame I was resting my eyelids then, or I might have said hello. I smiled slightly. Of all the unblooded party, Jared's mood seemed the least affected by their grim circumstances. He clapped me on the back good-naturedly. Dima meandered over at a slow pace, looking at Darren critically. I take it you succeeded in getting that food? She asked, sparing me a glance. Darren's shoulders tensed nearly imperceptibly. That we did. Just like you said, we can focus on getting a long-term escape plan in place. There was something deeper here that I didn't understand. Feeling uncomfortable, I shuffled to the side, making a detour to the kitchen. I unloaded the excess bags of rice, letting them pile up high in a corner. Severin was being introduced to the rest of the unblooded party as I sifted through the cupboards. I eventually found what I was looking for, a large metal pot. I hefted it down, looking for the sink. I was undisturbed as I gradually filled up the pot to the correct spot and then let it sit on top of one of the burners. I turned on the burner, drifting into thought as my hands completed familiar motions. This was routine in my previous life. Every week, I did meal prep before heading off to the gym. That was why I knew details about the caloric difference between rice and wheat. That brought my mind back to why I was in this world in the first place. My hands clenched unconsciously as I measured out the rice. I had to forcefully relax them. Would I ever stop being reminded of my previous life? I wondered, feeling a unique sort of agony. It was the slow, succulent poison of nostalgia, embittered by the knowledge that I would never see anything of my previous life again. I exhaled a shuddering breath, waiting patiently for the water to boil. I was interrupted by Severin, who opened up the fridge with interest. He raised a brow at what he found inside. VVA Nilla, he said slowly, sounding out the words of the label, Coca-Cola. He was holding one of the cans, giving it an inscrutable look. Considering it was written in cursive in a font and lettering entirely different from the norm, it was surprising he was able to read it at all. I absentmindedly latched onto the can in Severin's hands with my telekinetic emblem, floating it over to me. I pulled at the tab, popping it open with a familiar hiss, before letting the aluminum can hover back over. Severin received the can with an unsure look on his stubbled face. I didn't look at him, too immersed in waiting for the water to boil. That's good cola, I said absently. Give it a sip, you'll probably like it. Severin quirked a brow, but obliged. He gave the cold drink a sip, reeling back slightly in surprise. What is this? It's so bubbly. I chuckled. Carbonation will do that to you. That might be an acquired taste. Severin looked down at the art on the can. It's sweeter than anything I've tasted, he said with a bit of wonder. I hovered another can out of the fridge, letting it settle in my hands. The tab popped on its own, releasing a hiss as pressure escaped. I gave the caramel-colored drink a long, greedy pull. I savored the bubbles as they popped against my tongue, burning slightly as they went down my throat. The sugary scent tickled my nose. I sighed, feeling slightly blissful as I gave the can another gulp. It is sweet, isn't it? I said somberly. Severin gave the drink another few sips, a strange look on his face. I asked the others what they thought created such a unique zone, he said after a minute. They've got a lot of ideas. Darren and Dima think there's a relic here somewhere. Jared thinks the place finally broke. Alandra was asleep, he added sheepishly. What do you think? The water finally started to boil. I carefully smoothed over my features as I poured the rice into the pot, stirring the grains in before lowering the heat to a simmer. Was this question truly just that, an innocent query? Or did the Denor heir suspect something deeper? I turned to face him fully. I don't know, I lied. I'd be inclined to side with Darren and Dima on this one, though. Relics are usually found in zones with ruins around them, after all. This place isn't exactly a ruin, but it is civilization. Severin tapped a finger against his can, giving me a sharp look. Perhaps, he said slowly, though there are other reasons the relic tombs change, lesser-known ways. I averted my eyes, feeling a wave of guilt. I pretended to stir the rice, waiting for the water to evaporate. And what might those be? I suspect somebody brought a relic into this zone, he said lowly. Or something that affects ether. I turned to look at the Denor heir. If it is as you say, then our chances of escape may be even slimmer, I said, thinking of Arthur's jaunt in the mirror room. So many ascenders had been trapped in those mirrors simply for carrying an item that reacted to ether. Though that doesn't explain why we would join them if we do not also carry similar ether-affecting items. Severin's eyes sharpened into points. It's rare I meet somebody who knows what ether is, he said slowly. And even more so that they've pieced together what happens when an ascender carries an ether-affecting item into the tombs. I felt my hackles rise at the implicit questions in Severin's tone. I should have shaken that vanilla cola before letting him open it. I read everything I could before entering the relic tombs, I said, hoping my discomfort didn't bleed into my tone. I especially looked into how zones could be altered, presenting greater or lesser challenges to ascenders who traverse them. I immediately sensed I had somehow misstepped in my words, though I wasn't sure how. Severin smiled slightly, his eyes narrowing. He sipped on his cola once more, taking a more liberal amount than before. You did you? He said. It seems we'll get along, Torin Dane. I've been researching the relic tombs for a long time myself, hoping to find out their secrets. He nodded to me. Thanks for the drink. I think I like it. As the Denor heir walked away, I found myself desperately wishing for Lady Dawn's advice. She would have been able to guide me through that conversation, letting me keep my cards close to my chest. Chapter 79. Planning to cooperate. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between Asuran clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. The next morning, the entire unblooded party plus the additions of myself and Severin were looking down at the map Dima had drawn. Alandra pointed at a certain spot on the map. I've been able to pinpoint the teams to these locations, she said, blinking slightly. The auburn-haired sentry looked as tired as she did yesterday, but the shadows in her eyes didn't seem as dark. Her cheeks were hollow, but I had hope that would change soon. We'd all eaten our fill yesterday, but the unblooded party wasn't back to peak shape. But they were getting there. I'm not good at drawing, so Dima had to help me with this, Alandra said, rambling slightly, still clearly tired. Jared snickered, earning himself a piercing glare. Shut up, Jared, the sentry said. I didn't say anything. You were thinking too loud. Jared opened his mouth to retort, but closed it after a moment, smirking slightly. I raised a brow. Had he goaded her on purpose? Anyway, she said, stressing the word. A bit of the fire had returned to her eyes, which flared whenever they passed over Jared. I was able to narrow down the larger monoclusters of mages to these buildings. They're not too far from each other, and both are skyscrapers, to use Torin's wording. She paused. It'd be pretty easy to reach them, especially with Torin's abilities. But what to do when we get there? Alandra asked, looking up with a furrowed brow. Darren spoke up next. Well, we want to get everyone out of this zone alive, so that's where we start. We've got Torin now, he said, giving me a nod, so we have a good chance of moving past most of the undead guarding our way. That's a good carrot. Severin interjected next. I haven't been in this zone long, but I've been an ascender long enough to know that groups hate cooperating any more than is necessary. It takes away glory for oneself. Sharing the credit, the white-haired ascender said, his arms crossed. I frowned. This is a life or death situation, though, I said, looking at the Denor heir. I don't know how long these teams have been here, but they're sure to be running out of supplies. If we point out to them that I can help them. You expect too much, Severin interrupted, shaking his head. Ascenders are a stubborn lot. If it's a pass on glory or even a relic, they won't follow easily, even if it's to save their own skins. My train of thought shifted to the beginning after the end once more. I remembered Arthur's first convergence zone, where he interacted with Syrah properly for the first time. The way all the teams kept their distance when not in battle with Corallians, separating into pods of 2s and 3s. They'd only unified because of the absurdity that was Arthur. Would we be able to pull off anything similar? Darren cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to the green-eyed striker. Unfortunately, Torin, High Lord Denor is probably right. We'll need more than basic altruism to convince these people to work with us. We have the carrot, food and an escape route. We need a stick. I'm not High Lord yet, Orden, Severin countered smoothly. It's just Lord for now. Lord Denor, then, Darren said, seeming unfazed by the soft rebuke. But our point still stands. Perhaps we could play them off each other? Dima offered, his scrutinizing pale blue eyes looking at the map. Offer alliances to each of the other teams, using food and safe passage as guarantees? They'd be reluctant to turn us down if we made a point that the offer would only be valid for one team. If they didn't take it, the others might, leaving them utterly alone in the zone. We don't want to alienate them, Darren chided before I could speak. And we want to get everyone out, not just one team. You needn't follow through on the one-team threat, Dima said nonchalantly, looking Darren in the eyes. You need only ratchet up their anxiety, make them desperate, and when people are desperate, they're more likely to take the easiest path. They're also more likely to make rash decisions, Darren said, his jaunty smile straining. And if that ploy were to be discovered, there would be no chance of trust and cooperation. It's too risky in my opinion. Dima moved back from the table, seemingly content. Her critical eyes focused on Darren, who did his best to shift his attention back to the topic at hand. We can make preliminary plans here. We need to focus on getting these people to a meeting table first. Any ideas? The discussion continued on at a more sedate pace as plans were suggested, tweaked, shot down, and ironed out. I pitched in where I could, giving the group a better grasp of my sound distortion rune. I didn't really have limits on my ability to quell sounds, but if I was going to treat it as a rune, I quickly laid out rules. As far as the unblooded party knew, my sound distortion rune actually created an invisible sphere that nullified any sounds inside of it. I could expand the size of this sphere or make multiple of them, which allowed me extreme versatility. Darren was a natural leader. It shone through in how he gave everybody a chance to speak, letting them say their piece and voice their thoughts. If he disagreed with their proposed idea, he'd point out the benefits of their plans first before offering his criticisms. Every now and then, one of us would chime in with more to say, adding our own ideas to the pot. In the end, it was decided that the unblooded would split into two small groups, each approaching one of the teams to convince them to have a larger meeting between all three, where we'd make a more concerted effort to bring them all together. Severin had made this point earlier. If we wanted to portray ourselves as altruistic, we needed to let each team have their say. When the meeting was adjourned, the others shuffled off to do their own things, which mostly involved sitting around or reading books from their dimension rings or playing board games. Apparently, Alandra had gone through a specific novel 3 times already during her stay. That had to be excruciating. Dima and Darren exchanged a tense look as she walked off, leaving me alone with the leader of the unblooded party. I watched the blonde caster leave, feeling uncomfortable by proxy from her strained interactions with Darren. What's the issue she's got with you? I asked Darren. She's been challenging you every step of the way, I said, remembering the first interaction I saw her have with the striker leading up to this meeting. Darren sighed, his usual smile failing him. We have special history. That isn't quite resolved. It's been quite a few years since then, but there aren't many other people I trust on an ascent, and her criticisms do keep me sharp. A scorned lover, then? I'm not gonna lie, I said, patting his shoulder consolingly. I am glad I am not in your position right now. Darren snorted. We were together on and off for a long time, but the last time, something was wrong. She cut it off abruptly. We only reconnected a few months back. I'm going to be honest, Torin. I don't know what I did wrong, he said, a bit of sadness in his tone. I looked at Darren, truly looked at him. You're a good man, Darren, I said wonderingly. It had been so long since I'd met somebody so purely altruistic in either of my lives. It seemed impossible to me that he should exist, considering the hell that Alacria threw at everyone who lived within. But if you're not sure about the reason, I'm not sure I can help you. I paused, but it's not always a single person at fault. You've probably done this already, but talking is usually the best way to resolve these things. Confront her about it. Darren watched where Dima had left. If only it were that easy. If only, I replied. Later that day, I was making sure oath and promises sheets were secured tightly to my belt. I adjusted my light leather armor, making sure it fit snugly. Do you have everything ready, Torin? Severin asked from the side, his teal cloak settled easily on his shoulders. I spared the Denor heir a glance. He was dressed in dark clothing, which contrasted with his light hair. His bone dagger was strapped to his hip, the strange spool of metallic thread he kept tied to the end disappearing into his clothes. The buttons on his coat were polished gold, which reflected the fluorescent light from above. Maybe Nareni has worn off on me, I thought, looking away from his expensive buttons. Just about, I said with a sigh. You? As ready as I'll ever be, he said primly. I turned away from Severin, surveying the city sprawling out before me. If I focused mana into my eyes, I could pinpoint moving corpses on the ground below, milling aimlessly in the streets. They never went away, even after losing their aggro. I wondered slightly, if I was strong enough, could I simply keep this zone spawning undead until their bodies reached the highest of skyscrapers? Think you can keep up? I asked with a smirk, preparing my telekinesis. I was fast when I wanted to be. I think you should be the one to worry about falling behind me, Severin said with a hint of a challenge. I smirked, then rocketed off the outcropping in a burst of telekinetic fire. The wind whipped at my hair, my eyes watering as the pressure built. I was fast. So I was surprised when a figure blurred past me. I felt a slight shockwave of wind as the Denor heir blitzed in a straight line, aimed for the same rooftop. Severin suddenly came into focus as he slowed at an absurd speed, the light blur suddenly darkening. Right before his feet hit the ground, his body turned back to a lighter hue. He made barely a sound as his body settled. I grit my teeth, pulling myself down faster with a few telekinetic pulls. The stone roof cracked as I hit, my telekinetic shroud shuddering. My knees bent to absorb the impact, my bones creaking. Severin had a mild smirk on his face. What was that about keeping up? He said. I narrowed my eyes. You're on. We both zipped from the rooftop, trying to reach our destination first. As we moved, I speculated what kind of spell form Severin had. It seemed to be some kind of weight manipulation. He would make himself incredibly light, then jump. Before he could splat against a wall, he added weight back, slowing himself down, before making himself light again right before impact. It was an incredible balancing act. One misstep and he'd resemble a bug on a windshield. Yet he kept up with me more than well enough. My telekinesis allowed me to be more maneuverable, allowing me to adjust my direction and pitch mid-leap. Severin could only make straight line jumps. The sky was perpetually cast with clouds, blocking any sort of sun or star. Yet this slight bit of competition stoked a hint of fire in my chest. Severin and I were the group designated to go to one of the teams. Darren would be working with Jared to meet with the others, trying to convince them to meet up in a central location. Darren Orden had his own reputation as the leader of the unblooded party. He wasn't liked in many high blood circles, but he was a name they could put to the plan. Severin accompanied me as the guarantee of high blood d'honneur, which unfortunately likely carried a lot more weight than Darren's word. Using the status of your blood was frowned upon in the relictombs, but not forbidden. As I landed a jump, I spared a glance at the small map drawing in my hands. Severin feathered to the concrete beside me, looking around us warily. My mood for competition had waned as we got closer to the detected hideout. The buildings had gotten progressively taller, meaning I had a distinct advantage over Severin. I could stick to walls like a certain blonde ninja fond of saying, believe it, and Severin had to constantly use his rope dagger like a grappling hook to keep up. He'd throw it at absurd speeds, the white bone lodging into brick. Then he would lighten his body, pull on a razor-thin wire, and drag himself toward the buildings. That might have spurred me forward normally, a spice to the normal parkour. There weren't many who could match my athleticism, even among the rats. But as the buildings changed, so too did the streets. Far below us, undead milled in droves. Their empty, purple flame sockets were splashes of color amidst seas of gray. I wouldn't be able to even set my feet down on the ground without drawing the attention of an elite. Several of the rooftops had zombies, which I dispatched quickly. I found myself wondering once again where these corpses came from. Were they conjured from the depths of my mind, like some twisted representation of my fear? Or were these Alacrine look-alike corpses truly raised from the dead, the end result for any doomed mage in this zone? Yet the numbers for such a thing didn't make sense. If all of these corpses were ascenders who had stepped into the city zone, Alacria would be in a full-blown crisis. There were easily thousands roaming about aimlessly, but the fact that they mimicked zombies felt intentional. I'd subtly asked Darren if anyone in the unblooded party had been wounded by the zombies, and if so, if there was anything strange about the wound. He'd been cut a couple of weeks ago by the stray slash of an elite, yet that had healed over with barely a scar. So they presumably didn't infect people like the pop culture icons of my previous life. This place isn't nearly as safe as I'd expected, I said under my breath. I'd taken to keeping myself and Severin covered in a sound muffling barrier. I'm wondering how anything could live for long around here. Severin looked nonplussed at the swarm of undead on the streets below, his dagger clutched in a loose reverse grip. I'm not surprised there is a team somewhere amidst this. We ascenders are resourceful, he said absently. It takes a lot to put us down, despite this strange zone and strange circumstances. I spared him a glance, lowering the map. How long have you been a solo ascender? I asked, feeling a strange sort of kinship with the man. Over half a decade, Severin replied nonchalantly. I've learned to take many things in stride. I blinked owlishly. That was a long time to survive as a solo ascender. Most only went for a year or two before switching to a team. Or never being heard from again. And how many ascents? I said slowly. Severin looked at me, a slight downturn at the edges of his lips. Not enough. I looked back at the map, thinking of the fate this world had in store for him. The only things that would be left of his body were his cloak and dagger, waiting for who knows how long for Arthur to pick them up. This world would claim him eventually, a side note in the history of greater things. Severin was a dead man walking. He just didn't rot like the corpses below. Why do you go on solo ascents? He asked suddenly, drawing my eyes back to him. It is a difficult path. The rewards are not always equal to the effort. I rolled Severin's question around in my mind. Of course, I went in solo to practice my unique abilities away from prying eyes. Furthermore, I had a very visible effect on the tombs. I was unnerved by how knowing Severin's eyes seemed to be. Did he suspect my effects on this zone? All my interactions with him seemed innocent enough, but taken together, could they mean he was onto the impact of my presence? Sierra stated would state that Severin had thought the relictombs were more than what the sovereigns told Alacria. And that was more than true, but how much did he actually know? But there was another reason I ascended alone. I traced the movements of a single elite undead over 100 feet below. From where we were, it couldn't hear or see us. While the other zombies stumbled and fell clumsily, the skin on their spines shriveling the red ink where spell forms might have been beyond recognition, the elites took steadier strides. Not perfect, but clearly deliberate. My brother and I planned to be a team in the tombs, I said, restraining my emotions. We were the last of our blood, you see, but we were named blood. We gained our power in the past through the relictombs. We'd get that prestige back, through glory and accolades. A simple, naive dream for simple, naive mages. The wind seemed to go still around us, but that wasn't what happened. My brother, he was taken from me, just as I was taken from my previous world, I thought absently. His flame was snuffed out. The Brothers Dane will never be a rising ascender's team, so I ascend alone. Severin's face was pinched with something complicated. Was that concern? Sympathy? But I didn't wait for his reply. My patience for the conversation had worn thin. We're almost near the building Alandra marked. I'm going. Before the d'honneur heir could protest, I jumped toward the nearest building, aiming for the place Alandra had marked. Chapter 80. The Survivors. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note. TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alacria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alacria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. I reached the top of the skyscraper with ease. I walked over the edge, setting foot on flat ground once again. A moment later, Severin d'honneur shot straight up behind me. He slowed midair, modulating his weight. He threw his dagger forward in one smooth motion, the glinting thin wire spiraling behind it. The blade sunk into the concrete near me, and Severin pulled. He lurched forward, skidding to a halt next to me. With a quick yank, his dagger dislodged from the stone and returned to his hand. There are mana signatures inside, Severin said quietly, even though he didn't need to. My sound barrier prevented any noise from leaving. I think we've found our target. I nodded in agreement. The zombies down below had mana signatures, but they were strange. There was an aura that pervaded everything around them which made it difficult to sense their mana. The mana they exuded seemed to blend with the energy of every other undead. I'd only made the connection as the packs of undead became consistent hordes, roving the streets far below. With such a constant cluster, the strange effect they had on the ambient mana was far more apparent. Lady Dawn would have noticed this strangeness far sooner, a treacherous part of myself noted. Want to let them know we're here? I asked, stretching out my back. Severin looked at the rooftop access door. It's only polite. We flared our mana in near perfect sync, the effect similar to a man blowing oxygen over a fire. For the briefest of moments, our mana signatures were beacons, casting light into the ocean of ambient energy. Severin and I waited tensely, side by side. It didn't take long for us to get a response. A mage pushed open the rooftop door, peering out with wild eyes. I could almost taste their apprehension, and I was sure they had a weapon ready behind that steel door. Hello, Severin said, taking a slight step forward and raising his hand in a peaceful manner. We come in peace, with an offer if you hear it, he said leisurely. The eyes behind the door sharpened, and I could definitely sense them preparing their mana as they pushed open the door further. I tensed, but considering I didn't sense killing intent from the man, I settled for resting my palm on the hilt of oath. The door cracked open further. A man hunched there, a wild look in his eyes. He held an axe tightly in one hand, while the other was frantically imitating a shush motion over his lips. When I had been tasked with meeting this other team, I'd expected another group in a similar situation as the unblooded party. A slowly starving team, gradually whittling away under the strain of entrapment. They'd be gaunt, but they wouldn't be at death's door. The man in the doorway shattered those expectations. Greasy brown hair clung to his face like reeds. His clothes were in rags, torn and burned in a dozen different places. What must have once been a sturdy cloak barely past his back, the shreds hanging like a drowned corpse. His eyes were sunken and haunted, and old bandages wrapped themselves around his arm. They were nearly black, the linens old and crusty. The part of me that had worked as a surgeon felt immediate concern. Considering the temperature of this zone and the rate it took blood to dry to such a dark color, those bandages hadn't been changed in over a day. If there was a severe wound underneath which the amount of staining in the bandage seemed to suggest he had a highly increased chance of infection and rot in the damaged area. Severin seemed entirely unsurprised by the haggard state of the mage. Don't worry, he said calmingly, my friend here has a sound barrier erected around us. The undead can't hear us. I collected myself swiftly. To demonstrate Severin's words, I brought my foot down hard on the concrete. The stone cracked, but no sound was allowed to exit. My spell held onto each vibration like a greedy miser keeps his coins. The man's insistent shushing halted. His hand slowly lowered, relief and another emotion I couldn't discern warring across his face. He worked his jaw, which was covered in a patchy beard. What do you want? He said, the hand holding his axe clenching tighter. Severin replied evenly, undeterred by the mage's increased tension. We want to get out of this zone, he said. To that end, we'd like to talk with you about working together. The mage narrowed his eyes suspiciously, shifting from side to side. Why should we listen to you? He said. His voice was gravelly from disuse, an almost painful rasp clawing its way from his throat. My name is Severin of High Blood Denor, the white-haired striker said, nodding his head in a brief show of respect. He shifted a hand into his jacket, then retrieved something and held it in front of him. The insignia of High Blood Denor radiated back in solid gold. On my the honor of my blood, he stated seriously. Know that we mean you no harm. The man's eyes widened slightly, no doubt taken aback by the name uttered. The Denors were powerful. Their house was essentially the Rothschilds of Alacria. Few families could match them in any dominion. But then the man shrunk backward. Severin's words seemed to have the opposite effect. Instead of taking reassurance in his status, as I'd expected, he shifted like prey in front of a predator. I wondered briefly what he had experienced here. Ascenders who made it to convergence zones were among the greatest. This man must have once been a powerful, confident fighter. What had turned him into a shifting, paranoid shell? You did, that dark part of myself acknowledged. He wouldn't be here if not for you. We have food, I blurted out. Severin looked at me uncertainly, while the axe-wielding mage, his eyes lit up with hunger. I recognized that look. And I prepared for it. I withdrew a single bag of rice. It was easily 20 pounds, but with my mana-enhanced strength, I didn't even feel the weight. Without further ado, I grabbed the bag with my telekinesis rune. The rice floated slowly toward the mage, keeping low to the ground so as not to startle him. I saw the conflict of hunger and anxiety in the man's stiff posture. When I let the bag drop in front of his door, he eyed it critically. That's all we have on us, I said. I wouldn't make the same mistake I did in East Fiatra all those months ago when I'd nearly been attacked by men looking for a lifetime fix of Blythe. I wouldn't let myself be a viable target. If you're willing to hear us out, we can get you more easily. But only if you listen. That seemed to be the last nail in the man's self-restraint. He lashed a hand out to the rice, snatching it up in a spindly claw. He looked from the bag to me and Severin, then back to the bag. Fine, he said. Just keep to yourself inside. You better keep your promise, Denor. The man turned around, sparing us one glance as he clutched the rice to his chest. Severin and I moved to follow after a beat. This is worse than I expected, Severin said quietly. I made sure only I was able to hear his words, the sound drifting to me alone. This man is a shell. If his entire team is in a similar state, they'll be a hindrance rather than a help. I felt my throat clench. I didn't want to think about that. I'm going to help them regardless of their ability to help us, I said, keeping my eyes forward. I owed them that much. Severin gave me a strange look, but I ignored it. When we went down a floor, we were greeted with a sight that made my spirits sink even further. This must have once been some sort of CEO's office. The taller ceiling and wide, panoramic view of the city below was the perfect display of power. Sleek wood furnishings might have given the room an air of refinement and poise. But instead, haphazardly conjured walls of earth covered the windows. The only light was the overhead bulb, casting grim shadows over the room. The furniture had been moved to the edges, providing room for bedrolls in the center. The walls felt like they might swallow me whole. I'd walked into a makeshift bunker. There were only 3 other people there besides the brown-haired mage we met first. One was a bronze-skinned woman with hair kept in a boyish cut, though it was clearly growing past the intended length. She was leaning against the couch with her eyes closed. The woman was missing a hand, the stump wrapped haphazardly and splotched with dark residue. She perked up upon seeing us enter, her thin eyes narrowing. She snatched the shield with her other hand, gripping it tightly. But I could see the futility of the action. It was a shield designed to be held with 2 hands. The other 2 young boys were nearly identical, even in their dishevelment. Both had dark hair streaked with silver, wearing what must have once been high-quality armor. But their chainmail had been torn as if by a savage beast. Dark bandages peeked out underneath. They looked to be having a restless sleep, shifting and grunting. Their only apparent differences were in their weapon choices. One clutched a mace tight, even in the apparent nightmare. The other held a sword close. They both appeared to be asleep, but a kick to the shins from the one-handed shield startled them awake. The twins stirred immediately. Their eyes were a pale, icy blue. Are those things here again? One of the boys asked bitingly, holding his mace tight and looking around with unease. Is that why you woke us up? No, the shield said, her focus trained on Severin and me. Something new. We have visitors. That got their attention. The twin boys, while clearly gaunt and having missed a shower for weeks, didn't look quite as battered as the one-handed shield and shifty axeman. The one on the left narrowed his eyes at me with suspicion, while the other snarled. Why did you let strangers in? The one on the right snapped, pointing his sword at us. They'll try and take our food. They gave us food, the axe-wielding striker said wearily, hefting the rice in his hands. Once inside, much of his anxious fidgeting had sloughed away, leaving a tired man who looked twice as old as he truly was. Wouldn't make sense to take it. Severin raised a brow. The Frost twins, the Denor heir said. I've heard a lot about your. We should take the rest of the food they have, the mace-wielding twin said, interrupting Severin. It's only fair. We've been starving for weeks. Quote. The axe-wielder immediately recognized the foolishness of such words. They came here to talk about an offer of alliance, he snapped, waving the rice in his hands before pointing at Severin. With the assurance of High Blood Denor, it would be foolish to attack them. The Frost twins glared at Severin in sync, but he's from the Denors, the twin on the left said. Nobody will ever know, rules be damned. We should just take his. Shut the fuck up, the axe-wielder snarled, marching over to the twins. He shoved the rice into the shield's surprised hand. I have had enough of your sniveling. All these weeks I've put up with your shit, telling us we failed you as a team, mocking Janna for losing her hand, which she did to save you. But not this time. This isn't the Frost estate. This is the Relic Tombs. Either you take opportunities to survive, or you die. Quote. I frowned, feeling slightly uncomfortable watching this team spat. I realized another thing, then. The unblooded party had a unity that was rare. The mace-wielding twin puffed his chest out, jumping to his feet. You don't get to talk like that to us, unblooded, he said with a sneer. You were far more subservient when that woman was. The boy didn't even have the time to process what happened as the shaggy axe-wielder's fist struck him in the sternum. The boy mage gasped, crumpling. His brother cried out in alarm, but a hard glare from the axe-wielder silenced it to a whimper. The shield had set down the rice and was holding out her hand uncertainly, a conflicted expression on her face. I winced, remembering what it felt like to get struck in the monocore. My hand tightened on oath at my side. Go on, the shaggy axe-wielding mage said to the other twin, who was still on the floor. His face was twisted into something savage. You know what your brother was going to say with that little mental link of yours. Say it to my face. The boy's eyes were wide, looking to the shield for support. She looked at the stump of her hand instead. Say it, the axe-wielder said, huffing with rage. The boy curled into a ball, whimpering and refusing to stare the enraged striker in the eyes. The axe-wielder turned, ignoring him and looking at us. You shouldn't have had to see that, he said. The anger was still visible in the flush of his face, his jaw working as he tried to forcibly calm himself. My name is Aylin. Aylin Ferris. I'm the lead striker for the Twin Frost party. Or at least I will be until those rats tell their father about what I did. Torn of name Blood Dane, I said slowly, trying not to think of what punishment this man would get for punching what seemed to be high blood heirs. Even if his actions were very understandable, we came here to offer our assistance in helping you out of this zone. The rest of our party is making the same offer to the other mages we detected in this zone. I looked at the twins on the ground, feeling disgust at their entitlement curdle in my stomach. But I had made a promise. I can eliminate sounds in an area around me. It gives us a good chance of sneaking past the hordes into the island where the exit portal is. The shield perked up, finally taking her eyes away from her hand. You know where the exit portal is, she said with clear hope in her voice. We do, Severin affirmed, giving the woman a sympathetic nod. Our sentry was able to get its general location, and it was further confirmed by our striker. Our sentry, the shield said after a moment. The woman wilted, and that same anger flashed in Aylin's eyes. I could guess the rest easily enough. We plan to gather all the teams together to discuss a viable escape plan, I said, forging ahead in an attempt to change the topic from death. I pulled out the map from my pocket, unfolding it so Aylin could see the points marked in red. We're planning to meet here. It's the midpoint between your locations. You said there would be food? Aylin hedged, looking at Severin. It seemed he trusted the words of Lord Denor more than I thought. We'll bring you several sacks of rice before the meeting, the white-haired ascender affirmed. And bandages, I added, my gaze lingering on the long soiled linens every mage here wore. You'll get bandages, too. The shield woman, whom Aylin had called Janna, lowered her head. She seemed almost ashamed. I looked at the twins. They were glaring at us silently, but the looks on their faces I recognized. I made a similar face whenever I concentrated too long when talking to Lady Dawn. You know what your brother was going to say with that little mental link of yours, Aylin had said. Those two were communicating telepathically. And I assume we won't have any problems? I asked, keeping my gaze steady on the high-blood brats. Their glares faltered when met my own. None, Aylin said through his teeth. My job was to help the twins learn, not let them kill themselves. Good, Severin replied in my stead. This is supposed to be a team effort, not a two-man game. After a few more exchanges of information and assurances of places and times, Severin and I left the claustrophobic room and Twin Frost party behind. The breeze outside was cold, reminding me of the necessity of mana. That went both better and worse than I expected, I said, gazing toward the unblooded party's resident skyscraper. I couldn't see it from here, but I knew the direction. We can't trust the twins, Severin said, mirroring my own thoughts. The twins are named Beard and Numar. They're popular talents from High Blood Frost. I'd heard many good things about them. Now I'm wondering how much of that was paid off. I thought of the last time I had met an entitled blood heir. It hadn't ended well for them. A shard of my broken shackles had severed an artery in his leg, and I'd watched as his life force extinguished. Loris Joan had died a pointless death. It's we already, is it? I said, sparing Severin a wry smirk. We do make a good team, though, don't we? He asked, sounding genuine. There was truth to that. I had felt an intuitive flow between the Denor heir and myself in that negotiation, each of us maintaining a steady push and pull. However, I did get the sense that Severin's patience for the twins was even lesser than my own. Which was why I made the point about the twins' potential problems to Aylin, instead of letting Severin do it, I realized. I suppose you're right, I said, giving the man a smirk. Though you still can't keep up with me in the field. Severin smiled wryly. We didn't declare a winner for that, did we? I leapt off the roof in the next instant, feeling the wind against my cheeks. It wouldn't take long to get back to base. Chapter 81, Bandaging Wounds. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. Reports from Darren and Jared regarding their meeting were similarly depressing. The group they'd approached, nicknamed the Ainsgar Exiles, had gone from a team of 5 to 3 after being overwhelmed by undead. They'd taken refuge in an array of cubicles, walling themselves off from the outside zone. When Darren had mentioned that others on his team were going to speak with the Twin Frosts, he'd run into an unexpected complication. According to their leader, they'd been attacked by one of the Twin Frosts' members. It had taken significant promises and reassurances to even convince the exiles to come to the bargaining table. But in the end, they didn't have a choice. From what Darren had said, they seemed even worse off than the Twin Frosts. Sleep-deprived, starving, and wallowing in their own filth. If they wanted a way out, they didn't have a choice but to accept our offer. Do you think it was one of the twins who attacked them? I asked Severin, who was walking with me toward the rooftop entrance to the Twin Frost team's hideout. As promised, we returned later in the day to deliver a few bags of rice and bandages. Severin was quiet for a moment. Why do you think they were attacked at all? He asked in reply. Considering the story they told, of their mad escape from the hordes of undead, they could have easily misunderstood assisting fire. And the exiles were reluctant to talk about the attack at all, only making the claim. I looked at the steel rooftop access door. That was true. According to Darren, the exiles had been deeply rattled by the assault of the undead. When Darren tried to push them on why they thought they'd been attacked, they gave vague allusions to the hordes, and a flash in the dark. Fair enough, I said with a sigh. Though, Severin said, narrowing his eyes, if they do tell the truth, it would not surprise me if the twins were responsible. High blood upbringing tends to leave coddled, entitled brats instead of men. I looked at the Denor heir, surprised by the venom in his voice. When he noticed my interest, he quickly smoothed out the irritation on his features. It wouldn't surprise me either, I said quietly, turning back to the door. I thought of Loris Joan and his entitled attitude and willingness to subject me to his father's drugs. It was easy to connect the dots of attitude from father to son. I've had my fair share of experiences with people like them. Severin regarded me silently. After a moment, we both flared our mana signatures, mirroring what we had done earlier that day. Aylin opened the door a second later. I watched him visibly shudder as the sky greeted him, the strong-willed ascender retreating beneath the surface in the face of the world. When he spotted us, though, his eyes seemed to gain a bit of their former glow. He gave the outside another cursory inspection. You have food? He said quietly. Severin nodded. We do. Come on, then, he said, leaving the door open. We followed slowly. The office hadn't changed much in the few hours we'd been gone. The same atmosphere of doom pervaded everything. The only light was from the dim, overhead bulb. This time, however, the twins were pacing about on the far edge of the room. Their mirrored shortcuts made them easy to see, their silver-streaked black hair standing out in the dark room. When one noticed us, the other swiftly turned. They had thinly veiled contempt written on their faces. I didn't know which was Beard and which was Numar, and if I was lucky, I wouldn't have to learn. Finally, one of them said, moving forward. We'd waited for hours. Quote. Severin's face scrunched up for a moment. We came as promised, he said, ignoring the twin. We have rice, bandages, and some spare soap and clothes so you all can get into something clean. Now, we just. Only rice, one of the boys said, his face morphing. Is that all you'll give us? We need more than that. Aylin turned to glare at the twins, which served to make them coil like snakes rearing their heads. We'll be out soon enough if things go well, and you can eat anything you want. The boy's words stoked something inside of me. I thought of the people of East Fiatra, struggling to feed themselves every day. I remembered Greatshie's celebrations and meetings, fostering a burgeoning sense of community in the Hope Strip people. And then what had happened because of the doctrination? I had to force down my irritation. Instead, I used something else to distract myself. I looked at the bandage wounds of all present, feeling myself diagnosing them subconsciously. I can help you change bandages and dress your wounds properly, I offered, cutting through the rising tension. My eyes traced to the shield Jana's stump of a hand, a clearly hasty and poor job done treating the wound. I worked as a surgeon's assistant for several years. I've got practice with this kind of thing. Aelin hesitated for barely a moment. Yes, please, anything you can do. I nodded as Severin began to retrieve the food from his dimension ring, approaching the one-handed shield. She stood off to the side, watching the proceedings with an empty kind of expression on her sharp features. Hey, I greeted, pulling a roll of bandages from my dimension ring. Mind if I help you in redressing that? I said, gesturing to what remained of her left hand. Jana gave me a complicated look. I would appreciate that, she said quietly. Can't wrap bandages with only one hand, she added cynically. She was sitting in a stiff back chair, looking away. I felt my inviting smile fall. Got it. I knelt next to the chair, holding my hand out. Haltingly, the shield obliged my silent request. My suspicions were confirmed as I slowly removed her bandage. The black, crusty linens had been soaked through with blood and pus. The smell of festering infection hit my nose like a wave when it was finally uncovered, revealing a gruesome wound that was struggling to heal. The woman had clearly lost the appendage several weeks ago. She was lucky she was a mage. Her infection would be far more deadly if not for the mana that constantly circulated from her core. I looked at it with a scrutinizing gaze. I could see the peaking heads of the radius and ulna under the intense swelling, the bone exposed to open air. I felt a pang of pity as I pulled the bandages off, the woman wincing from the crackling noise the bandages made as they peeled away. How bad is it? Jana asked, looking anywhere but at the wound. It could be a lot worse, I said honestly. Whatever had severed her hand had done it in a relatively clean manner, and I noticed trace burns from a hasty cauterization. The ulnar and radial arteries had been burned shut, preventing too much blood loss. The infection, especially. You've got a strong constitution. I turned to Aelin, who was talking with Severin quietly. Do you have a faucet here for warm water? I asked. Aelin paused, then pointed toward one end of the office. Sure enough, there was a spigot there. Hold on, I said to Jana, speedwalking to the faucet. I withdrew a small, metal pot from my dimension room. We weren't sure if the Twin Frosts had a means of actually cooking the rice, so I brought this along just in case and filled it to the brim with water. I returned a second later. I'm going to bring this water to a boil and use it to soak these bandages, I said to Jana, who was characteristically stiff. Talk of her wound seemed to disquiet her, so I tried to keep it brief. But before I rebandage your hand, I'm going to need to clean it out. And that is going to hurt. Quote. The woman finally looked down at me. I remember the long days in Trells's employ. The man was a master healer, far better than I ever would be. But where I lacked in skill, I made up for it with compassion. Patients didn't need a robotic, stoic man looking over them as they came to terms with their wounds. They needed a companion, not a target of hate like Trells's seemed to think. I squeezed the woman's other hand sympathetically. I'm an ascender, she said with a raised chin. I'm no stranger to pain. I smiled softly. Okay, then. I let the pot of water hover beside me, held aloft by an application of my telekinesis. Underneath was a steady, licking flame, also conjured by me. As I waited for the water to come to a boil, I talked with Jana about this and that, preparing my tools. That seemed to ease her constant anxiety, something I was privately grateful for. After a few minutes, the water finally started to bubble. I let off my flame, allowing the water to cool slightly. I dipped a washcloth into the scalding water, my telekinetic shroud allowing me to ignore the heat. Afterward, I used a bare application of fire mana to pull the heat from the cloth until it was warm instead of scalding. I'm going to gently clean the area, I said, holding the woman's wrist and the cloth in another. If you need me to stop, let me know. Jana nodded. At her approval, I began to gently dab at the wound, scraping away dead and dying tissue and excess grime. As I worked, I talked, trying to give the woman something to focus on other than the pain. In a few minutes that must have felt like hours to the poor shield, I scoured away the dirt and crusted blood around the wound. She endured it remarkably well, her eyes kept forward with a firm clench to her jaw. Okay, I said when I was finished. I let the cloth be taken away by my telekinetic emblem, floating behind me. I'm going to wrap your hand now. Another nod. I reached into the pot by my side, retrieving the bandages. By now, the water had cooled down far more. I squeezed the linens out, then began to slowly wrap the woman's hand. This was a suboptimal solution. I didn't pack my usual repertoire of wound care supplies, like vinegar and other cleansing solutions, because of my considerable healing factor. I also hadn't planned on ever ascending with someone, so I didn't account for helping another person. But these bandages should have been soaked in a cleansing solution instead of just boiled water. Furthermore, I didn't have any alcohol to wash her wound. I could only hope that her mana would continue to fight off the infection as well as it had so far. I let out a breath as I finally tied off the bandage. Okay, Jana, it's done. She looked at her hand for a brief moment, then at me. Thank you, Lord Dane. I smiled slightly. Don't worry about it, I said, standing. You'll need to change those several times a day, letting the bandages soak in boiled water before wrapping them. When you remove them, it'll take some of the dead and dying flesh with it, so it's important you do it regularly. And Torin is fine. Lord Dane sounds too formal. After a few more words, I moved to Aelin next. He was frowning deeply at something Severin had just said. Hey, Aelin, I said. Do you need me to help with your forearm? I continued, referencing his wound. The mage shook his head. No need. I wrapped my own wounds for longer than I can remember. Seeing as my assistance wasn't required, I set down some of the bandages on a nearby table. Okay, the water I'm using was boiled a few minutes ago. Once I'm done with the twins, I'll bring it back to you. Aelin gave me a complicated look but didn't stop me from leaving. I then moved off toward the twins, who were standing in a corner. They watched me approach with narrowed eyes, their chins upturned. I could see the wrappings they had underneath their tattered armor. This was going to be far more painful for me than it would be for them. So, which one of you is Beard, and which is Numar? I asked, trying to break the ice. That's Beard of High Blood Frost to you, the one with a mace on his hip said. We aren't so in your debt that you can drop our titles. More painful for me indeed. I rolled my eyes. Look, do you need my help with your bandages or are you going to keep looking down on me? My utter disregard for his posturing seemed to throw Beard for a loop. From the pinched expression that soon crossed his face, I guessed he was talking mentally with his brother. My eyes flicked to who I now knew was Numar. You should have come to us first, he said. When high bloods are wounded on the battlefield, they're treated foremost, Numar added, trying to sound logical. This isn't a battlefield, I said calmly, restraining my irritation. And high bloods on battlefields are usually commanding officers, not arrogant brats, I thought to myself. It's the relic tombs. You need to learn to take responsibility for yourselves. Vritra's horns. So you're going to be just like old Aelin, then? Beard said, taking their side, instead of the high blood? I felt a sneer tug at the corner of my lips. I set the rest of the bandages down in front of them slowly. I treated the most wounded first, I said. I might not have sworn the Hippocratic oath, but I understood priorities. Feel free to dress your own wounds. With that mental link of yours, I'm sure it'll be far easier for you two to work together than it will be for me. Beard went red in the face, but managed to try and hide some of it. You can't just leave us to do this, he said, a hint of irritation in his tone. We've never been taught. Repetition is the mother of learning, I said, turning away. Life won't always hand you the answers. Figure it out yourself. I sauntered back to Aelin and Severin, the pot of water hovering behind me. I set it on the table next to him, ignoring the boy's palpable irritation. I told this to Jana, but make sure to have her change her bandages several times a day. Aelin nodded, tiredly. I could still feel the twins' eyes boring into my back. How did they get so far into the relic tombs being so entitled? I found myself asking suddenly. I can't imagine them being effective at all with those attitudes. Severin's eyes flashed. High blood heirs rarely face the reality of their station. Aelin's shoulder slumped. They aren't heirs, he said, looking at his forearm. My brows furrowed. Then why? They're High Lord Uriel Frost's bastards, Aelin said with a sigh, sparing a glance at the boys behind me. He spoke it as if it were a hoarded secret. They only got his attention after they manifested unique runes that connected their cores. It was unprecedented. Suddenly, they went from the bottom of the pack to the top of the ranks. Their egos didn't take it well, he acknowledged. I don't care if they're bastards, Severin said dismissively. Just don't let them fuck this up. Quote. They won't, Aelin promised, though I wasn't sure if he was being honest. I gave Janna one last encouraging smile before we left. Soon, we'd gather together and make a plan to get out of this horrid reflection of my previous life. I could only hope nothing went wrong. Chapter 82. Gathering of Refugees. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. I was helping the Twinfrost party navigate the city, gradually snaking our way to the meeting point. Our going was slow. None of the Twinfrost members were particularly mobile like Severin and I were, leaving us to help them along. Instead of bounding from rooftop to rooftop, we ended up smashing our way through windows and walking through empty office spaces to the other side, then repeating the action. I used a combination of my telekinesis to help the mages along, just as I had done with Darren. It had been an exhausting ordeal to convince the Frost twins to let me carry them from building to building. I jumped from one of the rooftops, pulling on a nearby ledge. Simultaneously, I latched onto Aelin with my telekinesis rune, then I pulled, drawing us both to the next building. I landed far more gracefully than the striker, who stumbled to his knees after me. He still looked far thinner than was healthy, but his hair wasn't nearly as reedy after a good bath. Already used to this routine, I turned around and jumped back to the previous building, repeating the process with Janna instead. I thought some color had returned to her cheeks since she began changing her bandages, but that might have just been wishful thinking. I had to repeat this 2 more times for the twins while Severin watched on with amusement. This exercise was what truly instilled in me the difficulty every other mage would have with this zone. I could free run through the entire concrete jungle as if it were second nature, using my telekinetic abilities and physical enhancement to keep out of sight and range of all the undead down below. In fact, the Clearwood Forest provided more parkour challenges for me in the form of jutting branches and scraping underbrush. But most ascenders didn't have the luxury of my versatile abilities. Furthermore, I had the distinct advantage of being a solo ascender. I didn't enter this zone worrying about the well-being of a team. I didn't need to fight to get them to safety, or handicap my own speed to assist them in their escape from the hordes. But things were different for regular ascension teams. Strikers and shields might be able to leap between the rooftops with superhuman strength, but it would be exceedingly difficult to always do so while carrying their sentries and casters. In any other zone, the Alacrine strike team layout was perfect for small unit tactics. But in a zone where the only way to survive was to run, the slower ones got eaten, which was what I surmised had happened to the Twinfrost sentry. Once the twins were reluctantly deposited in the next building, we began to slowly move toward the other side, following empty hallways and derelict passages. We had to be more careful here. More than once had I spotted a few undead roaming these skyscrapers, even so far up. They were rare, but even one could alert any others in earshot. So I kept my sound barrier up. I took the lead in exploring the buildings, as my enhanced sense of hearing allowed me to be a good lookout. I turned to the side as Severin sidled up, peeking around a corner as we checked for the undead. I asked Aelin about what he knew of the other team, he said quietly. He claimed that he only saw them once when they had just entered the zone, but didn't get the chance to interact before they were forced to escape. I followed the intent of Severin's words easily enough. You think he's telling the truth? I said, covertly glancing at the mage trailing behind me. Aelin seemed to wither under the sunlight, that paranoid, almost animalistic side of him coming to life. The moment we ducked under a rooftop, however, more of himself emerged, though it was tired and haunted. He didn't strike me as a liar. I thought he was being truthful, the white-haired striker said. Though that doesn't exclude one of the Twinfrost members keeping secrets. The implication was clear. Severin thought the Frost twins might have attacked the Ainsgar exiles. I thought of their willingness to try and take our food at first interaction, simply because they had starved. Yet, as strange as it may have seemed, I did not view that as a complete and utter condemnation of their character. I'd seen what hunger could do to people in East Fiatra. It turned civilized men into beasts, the lack of sustenance consuming all rational thought in the place of food. Could I judge a person thoroughly when I'd only seen them at their lowest? But did that mean the twins would assault somebody they didn't know had food or not? Theoretically, they hadn't been starving when the exiles had been supposedly attacked. My doubts festered. Beard and Numar, while infuriating and stuck up, struck me as posturers keeping up a thin facade of power rather than truly malevolent people. They were children playing at what the men in their lives displayed. We can't dismiss the possibility, I said after a long pause. But we'll have to figure it out soon. We're almost there. Severin appraised me with a raised brow. So it's we, now, he said, sarcasm lacing his voice. I rolled my eyes as I reached a window. It overlooked our destination perfectly. I'm going to throw you out this window now, I said nonchalantly. Wait, wah. I used a strong telekinetic push on Severin, the flash of white knocking him through the window and shattering glass. The utter look of betrayal on his face as he fell made me laugh out loud. Aelin, however, cried out in shock. Vreetra's horns, he cursed, running over to the window in a panic. He got a good view of the Denor heir easily readjusting midfall, using his dagger and wire as a grappling line to reel himself toward the rooftop of our destination. I could just make out the Denor heir sending a very rude gesture up toward me. I returned it, a smirk on my face. You're insane, Aelin said, looking at me with shock on his face. Maybe a little, I acknowledged. Who could remain sane after being reincarnated into a world he thought to be fiction? Sometimes I still wondered if I was in a strange fever dream, these past few months a figment of a maddened mind. But then I remembered Norgan, and my resolve redoubled. Ready to go down there? I asked, giving the man a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. He gulped. The meeting place was a lot less ostentatious than the high-rise penthouses and CEO offices I'd come to expect. The setup was on top of a high-rise pavilion, granting access to the open sky. It looked like it had once been a nice picnic setting. I could imagine myself eating a sandwich and drinking coffee here, watching the foot traffic down below. It would have been a wonderful start to the day. But we had to wait another half hour or so for Darren and the rest of the unblooded party to show up, the Ainsgar exiles in tow. I got a good look at the ragged team, 2 shields and a caster. The leader of the group, a large man I knew was named Haradal, looked at the gathered Twinfrosts with undisguised suspicion. The pavilion was large and open, providing plenty of space for everyone. At a glance, there were 13 of us in total, all arrayed in an approximation of a circle. So you're the one who orchestrated this? Aelin asked Darren, a hint of recognition on his face. Darren Orden of the unblooded party? Darren stepped forward. Not just me, he said. I've had the assistance of the rest of my team, along with Torin Dane and Lord Denor. The eyes of the Ainsgar exiles turned to Severin, his name holding far more weight than my own. I saw something familiar there, a desire for hope. They were people stuck at the bottom of an endless pit, finally seeing a pinprick of light at the top. I've heard of the spats you've had with high-blood Patamore, Aelin said. You made yourself infamous in noble circles. Darren scratched the back of his head, sighing slightly. People usually remember me for that nowadays, yes, he said. But that's beside the point. We all want out of this zone, and our chances increase exponentially if we work together to do it. That got the attention of everyone present. The majority of undead around here, Darren said, undeterred by the attention, operate by sound. Even the slightest noise could set a single one off, and then that would spread to the rest of them, igniting their bloodlust. This makes avoiding them nigh impossible. Or, it was nigh impossible. I took a step forward, as Darren and I had discussed before this meeting began. I brought my foot up, then brought my heel down on the concrete. The stone shattered, but no sound accompanied it. My name is Torn of name Blooddane, I said loudly, addressing the crowd. I have a rune that allows me to create invisible pockets of mana that nullify noise. Using this, I can help us make it to the dissension portal. That got a frown from Haradal. You say you know where the exit portal is, he said slowly, looking between me and Darren. But you haven't proven it yet. I stepped back, letting Alandra take the stage. Darren had expected these kinds of questions and had been ready to answer one and all. Alandra held a palm up, conjuring a mini-map of fluorescent fire. A dozen plus one dots blazed a brighter light, while one overpowering speck hovered in the far distance. Each of these dots represents a significant mana signature, she said. The large one at the end, that's the exit portal. Now that you all know where the portal is, you could all feasibly just leave this meeting now, Darren said, taking the lead once more. The blonde striker shook his head. But it's not that simple. He looked meaningfully at the gathered teams. The exiles lack a striker to make their assault plausible. In the same vein, the Twin Frost party doesn't have a caster to keep enemies at range. And barring all that, if any of us were to go to where the portal is, we'd be greeted with the next obstacle. Darren waited after that, savoring the interest of the mages around us. It felt similar to what Carcian did, but not nearly as contrived in his showmanship. The leader of the unblooded party knew how to hold the attention of a crowd. And someone's patience predictably broke. And what would that be? A voice asked. I turned, surprised to see Numar speaking up. Why should we help you? He added with narrowed eyes. Darren seemed unfazed by the rudeness of the boy's tone. The portal is located in the tallest skyscraper I have yet seen, standing easily twice as tall as any building near here. And it's at the center of a large lake, which likely has its own dangers lurking beneath. That statement made everyone shift uncomfortably. We can work together with the unblooded, Haradal said after a moment. But not with the Twin Frosts. They stabbed us in the back once already. I felt my heart sink as Haradal's words set in. The peaceful discussion we had managed shattered by his words. Aelin, predictably, looked more confused than angry at the accusation. What in the... On what right do you accuse High-Blood Frost? Beard spoke up, stepping forward with a sneer. Baseless accusations will not be tolerated, unblooded. Fuck, I thought, recognizing the damage such toxicity would have on our negotiations. Haradal bristled, the large man looming with palpable irritation. I stepped forward, but thankfully Darren was quicker. He moved in between the two mages, raising both hands and smiling his usual smirk. As the young Lord Frost said, the leader of the unblooded party said calmly, accusations need to be substantiated. What is your claim? Beard looked ready to bite Darren's head off. He opened his mouth to speak, but my sound magic cut off every word he tried to utter. He looked confused for a moment, before whirling on me. Everyone here has a right to speak their minds without being shouted over, I said, letting the glares of Numar and Beard wash over me. If you can't let each person talk in turn, then you revoke your right to speak. Once Haradal makes his claim, feel free to refute it. Beard stalked over to me, trying to look bigger as he puffed out his chest. Numar moved to his side, backing his twin up. I looked down on them apathetically. I had grown tall in the past few months, a little over 6 feet. With mana strengthening my growth, I look older than I truly was. But these teens looked their age and acted younger. It would take more than this to intimidate me. Are you going to move? I asked, my eyes hard. All the eyes of the meeting were trained on us. Darren looked at me uncertainly, Severin with approval. I could sense the embarrassment wafting off of Aelin behind me. The combined stares of everybody around finally seemed to break through whatever shell the brothers had. I saw it crack, leaking a flurry of emotions I just barely caught. Shame, anger, and desire. Desire for what, though? They shuffled back, unable to even make a sound. I looked to Haradal, my expression stony. Continue. He looked disconcerted by something in my eyes. Yes, well, we spotted the Twin Frosts when we first entered this zone. Only got a brief glimpse before we had to escape. But that's how I know. I recognize one of your group. Haradal paused, and it's telling that the one who attacked us isn't with you. Are you trying to hide her? Wait, what? Her? Not he? Did that mean that it wasn't the twins? I felt as if I'd been thrown for a loop. I turned to the Twin Frosts questioningly. What greeted me was an expression of purest rage on Aelin's face. It was the same anger that drove him to strike the twins not so long ago. You dare? He said, stalking forward. I tried to set a hand on his shoulder, but he smacked it away. Do you have any idea how flimsy that lie is? Haradal scoffed. Her attack cost us our sentry and shield. I'm willing to bet she's waiting around here, too, ready to finish the job when we leave. The others began to stir as the confrontation heated up. Mages looked about warily, their hands resting on their weapons. The tension was taut like a bowstring, ready to snap and send an arrow into any unsuspecting man who didn't move in time. Aelin threw a punch. It didn't connect. Severin had blurred to the man's side, holding Aelin back forcefully as he tried in vain to throw himself at Haradal. You don't get it, do you? He yelled hoarsely. She's dead. My wife was taken by the undead weeks ago. I didn't even get to see her body. And you're telling me she attacked you. I'll kill you for that. Throw you to the corpses below. The meeting erupted into a cacophony of noise as people began to shout, clamoring to be heard over one another. Utter absurdity. Shouldn't have come here. I told them this would happen. But my mind had drifted off at Aelin's words. Haradal didn't seem to be lying. His suspicion and anger felt too real to me. He could be just mistaken, having misidentified one of the undead attacking his team. The undead. I felt my heart grow cold. Aelin had said his wife was taken by the undead weeks ago. And the attack was supposedly more recent. As the meeting fell to chaos around me, people pushing and shoving, I felt another possibility begin to form in my mind. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to consider it, but right now. Enough, I said, enhancing my voice with sound magic. I slammed my intent into the ambient mana, letting the world itself carry the weight of my emotion. My killing intent wafted out from me like heat off a stone, causing mages nearby to choke from the sudden pressure. The stronger ones whirled on their heels, facing me with wild, uncomprehending eyes. Severin and Darren gave me scrutinizing, uncertain looks, not as affected by my intent. Still, the entire rooftop became deathly silent. My ability to spread my intent across the ambient mana had morphed into something unique since I had begun practicing with my violin. I had a measure of control of what emotion I wished to project across the world, but this was back to the blunt, brute force of bloodlust. Calm down, I said with a snarl. This might be worse than we thought. Give me a damn second. I turned, searching the crowd for Aelin. I needed to ask him a question. The thoughts in my mind burned, seeking answers like a fire needs oxygen. Aelin, I called out, turning my head from side to side. I couldn't see him. Where was he? Aelin, goddammit, where are you? I finally spotted him. He had somehow separated himself from the group entirely, moving to the edge of the rooftops. Shayla? My enhanced hearing picked up the man saying with a shaky voice. My eyes widened, fear burgeoning in my chest. Aelin was facing something that hadn't been there a moment ago. A tall, scruffy woman stood across from him, her armor battered and worn. She looked incredibly human. Her wounds didn't bleed. I began to course mana through my limbs, my worst fears becoming a reality. Aelin, get away from that thing. Aelin. The mages around me shifted out of their stupor, the urgency in my voice raising them to action. Aelin didn't seem to hear me, raising a hand to the pale woman's cheek. I thought I saw you, I thought. I slammed telekinesis into the ground, where before, the blurring dash always seemed instantaneous. Now I felt as if I was slow. I shot forward in blinding speed, but it might as well have been a crawl. The creature's eyes burned a deep violet. It looked down on the man in front of it, something resembling contempt flaring there as the man brushed his hand against its cheek. I watched in painfully slow motion as the creature raised its hand, seeming to caress Aelin's cheek in turn. It almost seemed tender, the brush of something long gone. Then it snapped his neck. Chapter 83, The Horde Rises. Published by web novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torn Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Sur and clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. My fire-coated fist connected with the jaw of the zombie. The head lurched to the side unnaturally far, its neck audibly snapping. The body was sent flying off the rooftop, arcing down to the street below. I barely spared it a glance before I spun, catching Aylin's body. His mouth was open in a wondering expression, his eyes peeled wide as if he still couldn't believe what had happened. He was dead, his neck twisted at an uneven angle. Bursts of shock and fear erupted behind me as everybody's mind caught up with what had just happened. Cries of terror and uncertainty erupted all at once, people clamoring behind me. Severin blurred next to me, peering over the edge toward where the zombie had disappeared. Amidst the outrage and fear, a hand gripped my shoulder. I turned slightly, still reeling at my failure to protect Aylin. I'd seen this coming, but I'd been too late. Janna looked down at the body with a haunted expression, her jaw trembling. Aylin, no, not like this. The distraught shield took the body from my hands, trying in vain to rouse him. I stepped back numbly, my thoughts a mess. I thought of that non-mage I'd failed to protect months ago in the Clearwood Forest expedition, his innards melted by an acid beam hornet. I hadn't known him, not truly. But I had a name to my failure now. It wasn't a stranger, condemned and hidden behind a helmet. Aylin wouldn't have died if I hadn't entered the relic tombs. It was this zone that claimed him, the one changed by my presence. That was the one, Haradal said behind me, his voice angry. She was the one who attacked us. Did she go rogue? She just killed her own teammate. Not quite, I thought, the picture I'd been forming settling. That was the sentry that the Twin Frosts had lost, Aylin's wife. Or what was left of her, what remained after the undead took her corpse. She could have easily passed for a human if it weren't for the eyes. We need to move, Severin said with urgency, stepping away from the ledge. The undead are breaking into the building down below. That was possibly the worst thing the Denor heir could have said. Where before there was fear, now there was panic. I saw it in the expressions of the Ainsgar exiles as they clambered to the edges of the building. The Frost twins' eyes widened, some unspoken communication passing between them. Even Alandra and Dima looked shaken by what they must have seen. But these people were ascenders. They spent their lives always facing death, ready to trust their backs to strangers when needed. The unblooded party was the first to flush the panic from their systems, trying to manage a defense for the inevitable wave. We need to run, Darren yelled above the clamor of mages preparing for battle. Jameson, we need your conjuring abilities, now. As Darren hastily mounted an escape plan, my eyes were drawn to Janna. She hadn't moved a single step, even when near everyone else peered over the edge and began battle preparations. Her single hand clutched Aylin's body, an empty look in her eyes. You need to destroy the body, I said to her quietly. She looked at me, horrified. What? That's how they get more, I whispered. They add the dead to their numbers. I stood up, ignoring the look of betrayal that flashed across Janna's face. I walked up next to Darren, drawing oath and promise as I did so. What's the plan? I asked, not quite looking at the blonde striker. He had just finished directing Jared and another mage I didn't recognize to the edge of the building, instructing them to do something. Darren spared me a glance. Jared can conjure metal shields in links. If he alters his spell enough, he can conjure a walkway for us to cross. But that would be too slow. Jameson can make ice walls. He'll be doing the same thing. We'll get people across the gap to the next building. I saw through his plan immediately, and after that, I asked, keeping my attention focused on the rooftop access door to the pavilion. If I focused, I could hear the undead below us, their constant footfalls pattering against the floors, more like a constant, never-ending rumble than individual steps. Their groans reverberated through the air, audible only to me. Darren gave me an approximation of his usual playful smirk. We'll outrun these bastards. We'll cross as many buildings as we need to. The man was lying. He didn't have another plan to let them escape. I've got the best mobility of all of you, I said. I'll guard your rear. Darren didn't have time to protest. Not alone, Severin Denor said, stepping up beside me. We never declared a winner for our race. You can't say you've got the best mobility yet. Yet, I said, feeling the edges of my lips turn up. The rest of the mages shuffled near Jared and Jameson, who were hard at work conjuring a bridge between the two buildings. In the few seconds since Darren and I had started speaking, the structure was already 20 feet across, quickly approaching the other side. The door thumped once, twice, then burst apart. The corpses were met with spellfire. Bursts of flame, punches of wind, shards of ice, and shards of earth tore into the creatures with abandon. I lamented the dangers of using sound magic, so I relied heavily on my telekinesis and fire magic, throwing fire shot and crippling telekinetic pushes every chance I got. Yet the undead kept coming. Our initial attack was forestalled by a few of the creatures throwing their own spells, malicious mana seeking to carve us apart. One of the shields from the Ainsgar exiles stepped forward, pressing his hand into the ground. Tendrils of water burst up from cracks in the concrete, the writing tentacles catching basketball-sized chunks of earth before sending them hurtling back. The tentacles worked in tandem, pushing away anything that got too close and blocking as much spellfire as they could. I stepped up next, brandishing oath and promise. My blades flashed an oily sheen, their edges severing skulls and piercing hearts. Focusing my magic through my hands, I was able to vibrate the cutting edge of both my saber and dagger. They passed through flesh and shield alike, shearing through anything in their path without resistance. With my telekinetic shroud shrugging off most stray spells and my own mobility keeping me from being locked down, I became a demon on the small pavilion roof. The rooftop shook constantly, forces it was not designed to withstand crashing against the concrete. Flipping to the side to intercept a few searing arcs of fire that were headed for the bridge makers, I felt a brief moment of hope. The undead only had one way to reach us, creating a perfect choke point. With the sustained efforts of the mages present, the corpses died their second death, their gray, rotting bodies littering the ground. The bridge to the next building was nearly completed, the combined efforts of Jared and Jameson yielding results. Only a few more seconds. But then I felt something shift in the air. That same strange, obscuring effect that made the zombies' mana signatures indistinct began to slither like putty, advancing like a flow of magma toward one undeniable source. I felt like I'd been struck by a thunderbolt, recognizing the subtle, wafting change. It echoed back to what I'd done with my violin, how I pressed my will into the world. Its intent, I thought, or the visible aftermath of intent mixing with the ambient mana. I hadn't been able to tell before because the effect was so sporadic. I recognized the black and white, while this was a formless slurry of gray. Now that some true will had been exerted over the effect, however. The source of the change stood in the back of the doorway, looking at me with burning violet eyes. The human-like thing had its neck twisted unnaturally, flesh peeling off its skull from a savage burn that coated half its dead face. The undead that had slain Aylin raised its arms, commanding the fields of intent to itself. I can't let it do whatever it's trying to do, I thought with a burst of fear. I crunched a corpse's skull under my feet, uncaring of the bone and brain matter that coated my leather boots. I tossed Promise up, catching it by its tip. I cocked my arm back, my supernatural reflexes allowing me to account for the throw. I threw my dagger, accelerating its advance with telekinesis. There was a boom as the sound barrier broke, a small shockwave blowing outward and knocking several corpses over. The dagger punched through several bodies on its way, entirely undeterred by the meat that dared obstruct its path. But the zombies had begun to change even before I had decided to throw my dagger. The strangely intelligent zombie had clearly expected me to target it. Several mana barriers erected themselves in the face of my blade, conjured by the mindless corpse puppets nearby. It was enough. Promise was pushed off course by the constant obstacles, the dagger embedding itself into the brick next to the rooftop door all the way to the hilt. Dread pooled in my stomach as I locked eyes with the malevolent almost human corpse. Violet pits stared out from beneath seared flesh, the exposed bone ruining the illusion of life. And the monster's change began in earnest. Instead of recklessly throwing themselves against our front line like wood into a wood chipper, the gnashing undead began to slow, measuring their approaches. They still stumbled over the bodies of their fallen brethren, their coordination and power minuscule. But they moved with purpose, with intelligence. A dozen spells at once broke through the rooftop, making me stumble as the concrete shattered. Thankfully, most of the mages were crowded near the very edge of the rooftop, putting them well out of range. But that wasn't my main concern. A hole 15 feet in diameter opened like a gaping wound in the rooftop, revealing a horde of snarling undead below. The strange smog of intent which caused the strange slurry effect on the ambient mana was gone from these, too. We just lost one of our greatest advantages, the narrow gap the undead were forced to approach us from. The zombie with the burned face. It had somehow taken command of these things. They acted with focus and strategy. Come on, Darren cried, his voice raw with effort. Across the bridge, everyone move, now. Jared and Jameson had completed their makeshift bridge to the next skyscraper. They stood by the side, ushering mages across hurriedly. The zombies had just begun to move, spewing out of the gaping rooftop hole like ants out of a hill. I was forced back, unable to kill more than appeared. Spells came at us in large volleys, forcing me to lift up a still snarling corpse as a shield. A metal spear punched straight through its heart before glancing off my telekinetic shroud. I was sent stumbling back, a network of crystalline cracks spreading their fingers across my barrier. Torin, get your ass over here, Darren called. He was busy guarding the bridge, sending a hurricane of punches and kicks in every direction imaginable. You need to get out of there. I sent a regretful look toward Promise, which was still embedded into the bricks. I didn't think I'd ever get it back. But the relentless tide of death forced me back. I slammed my telekinesis into the ground, dashing for the bridge. Severin met me there, his wire blurring alongside his arms. His dagger created small shockwaves wherever it tore apart zombies, scything through skulls like the crack of a whip. He had a supernatural ability to control the dagger, even despite the weapon being a dozen feet away. He'd tug and twist the thin metallic wire, causing the dagger attached at the end to lurch in a way that seemed to defy physics, performing twists and turns around unsuspecting corpses. He let the wire wrap around the bodies of a few of the monsters, pulling them into a misshaped bundle of limbs and rotting flesh. Then his arm blurred, snapping the wire like one would a whip. The wire cinched shut in a millisecond, cutting all the bodies in half. I slowly backed up the icy, metallic bridge, Darren making a fighting retreat behind us. Severin and I worked in concert, blurs of fire in the arc of my swept hilt saber killing anything that got too close. When we were halfway across the bridge, however, the next volley of spells came flying for us. While some of them were able to be intercepted with precise inputs of telekinesis, I spotted a large, flaming boulder careening toward the bridge. It was easily twice again as wide as the bridge itself. My breath hitched. If I let that hit, it would destroy the bridge. Get back, I said to Severin, tossing oath into the air beside me. The weapon floated serenely, caught by my telekinetic spell. I squared my stance, shifting my back foot behind me. Severin, feeling the buildup of mana around me, darted back. His teal cloak was a blur as he engaged his rune. I concentrated several spells into my leg, focusing fire, sound, and a restrained telekinetic pull around my shin. I jumped, roaring as my entire body rotated in midair. My leg snapped out, the mana wrapped around it barely contained. My roundhouse kick connected with the boulder at an angle, my mana rippling through the stone. The flame from my concentrated spell washed over the fire coating the rock, overwhelming it and emerging victorious. My sound-shrouded blow sent weakening tremors through the structure. And my spellform's pushes, combined with the force of my mana-empowered body and telekinetic shroud, obliterated the rock. It broke into a dozen pieces, spraying sideways with the gravelly sound of shattering stone. The telekinetic shroud around my lower leg shattered from the pushback, small lattice-like shards spraying off my shin. I dropped back to the bridge, already feeling my leg beginning to bruise. I spared a glance behind me. All the mages were across except for Severin and I. Darren watched me worriedly as the rest marched off in an orderly panic, their next destination unsure. Don't either of you kill yourselves. We'll be waiting back at the exile's base. I'll pay your next tabs at the Shimmerkin's horde if you make it out alive. The leader of the unblooded party called back to me before the urgent need for his leadership drew him away from our struggle. I just needed to buy some time. The horde continued their assault. This time I let oath act on its own. The saber's edge drawn to throats like iron is to a magnet. This freed up my hands for more ranged and wide-reaching attacks. Large fireballs and concentrated fire shot erupted from my hands with barely a pause. Together with Severin Denor, we reaped bloody vengeance on the undead that streamed up the hasty construct of ice and metal. I felt the structure groan under my feet as more and more beasts piled on. Every now and then, a zombie would get shoved the wrong way by its brethren, tumbling to the street below. But these monsters marched. Every now and then, an organized volley of spellfire hurtled toward the skyscraper behind us. I tried my best to intercept what I could, allowing our companions to make it deeper into the building and gain distance. The bridge shuddered, the combined weight of so many bodies beyond its capacity. I looked at Severin at my side, noting the sheen of sweat soaking through his white hair. His breathing was slightly heavy, the constant mental strain of tracking the entire battle wearing him down. I was in slightly better condition. While my muscles burned from their constant use and my mind threatened to be overwhelmed with keeping track of every obstacle at once, my mana was regenerating at a breakneck pace. I didn't make everything back that I spent, but I was running at around 3/4 full capacity. But we couldn't keep this up much longer. I needed to change the game somehow. I made my decision. I'm going to break the bridge, I said to Severin, who had just reeled his bone-white dagger back in, catching it with a heavy thunk. Get ready to use that mobility you're so proud of. I got barely a glance at Severin's face, but I knew it was enough. He gripped his weapon tightly. I built up mana across my palm, feeling the almost musical force ripple and distort across my hand. I had a moment to savor the sheer power I'd packed into the spell, draining my reserves a noticeable amount. I slammed my hand into the bridge beneath me. My spell traveled through the structure in cascading waves, the vibrations making ice and metal shudder against each other. For a moment, I worried that my spell hadn't been enough. I'd have to try again, wasting precious moments and valuable mana. Then I heard the crack. It was a single, faulting split that rent my ears, before the tons of weight forced upon the bridge predictably gave way. I watched easily 100 zombies fall in tandem with me, but I wasn't worried. I was a contender for the most mobile mage in this zone. I slammed a telekinetic push against a corpse that was clawing at me wildly, letting the force push me in the opposite direction. The undead's head exploded in a shower of fetid gore, but I was already far outside its range. My feet connected with the wall of the skyscraper, settling in a position half 100 feet over the ground. From my brief glance downward, I watched with sinking horror as undead streamed into the base of the tower, no doubt climbing their way upward to chase my companions. That check of the streets cost me dearly. I looked up, scanning the skies for Severin Denor. He would have been easily able to escape this with as much ease as I. Except that wasn't what had happened. Far above me, a gargantuan, misshapen thing loomed over the edge of the rooftop. A coagulation of limbs, heads, and rot meshed together to form a huge, hulking body. The titan of rot knit itself from the corpses around it, building itself taller and taller as flesh was willingly sacrificed. The fingers of the monstrosity screamed deathly wails, writhing and biting at the air. Its arms cried for release. Its legs wept. A terrible effigy of a skull sat atop misshapen shoulders, smooth bone defying the grotesque nature of the giant. Where everywhere else bespoke decay, the skull seemed to gleam pristinely. And in the flesh titan's growing grasp was Severin Denor. Chapter 84, The Price of Unfettered Power. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. As I stared at the Denor air in the Flesh Titan's misshapen grip, a dozen images flashed through my mind. I remembered the man who had died in the Clearwood Forest under my protection, whose name I would never know. I remembered my failure to protect Aelin, his neck twisted at an odd angle. Mardith's mocking smile as he told me the lives of the captured East Fiakrans were in my hands. And Kaelin Jones sinking her blade into my brother's chest, the slick steel moving without a hint of resistance. I didn't think twice. I grasped at the power slumbering in my core, drawing it to the surface as one draws water from a well. Familiar understanding rushed into the bare channels of my thoughts, my mind absorbing the knowledge like a greedy sponge. But I could immediately recognize a glaring difference. Where before there was a fullness in using the acquire phase of my will, the surety of a hand on the shoulder or the watching eye of a parent, now there was simply the primitive instincts of the will itself. I felt a tentative brush of Lady Dawn's mind across my own. There was a question there, a hope and fear for my well-being that could not be contained by our mental link. When I let the Phoenix will envelop my mind, my Asuran bond was unable to mask her emotions from me any longer and vice versa. We meshed together deeper than sense, and so as I felt her regret, her desire to help, and her fear for my safety. I knew those feelings to be true. They were real and deep, entrenched across our bond. I shut it out. No, I thought, not this. I can't think about this. I broadened our connection, pushing away the mind of my bond. I felt a brief, sharp pang of hurt from her before it went dark. But I had no time to contemplate my situation. I had embraced my will for one purpose and one purpose alone. I raised my left arm, noting the glowing chains that seemed to float above my skin. Then I exhaled. Fire mana amped by sound erupted from my palm. A beam of red plasma seared through the air, making a burning beeline for the rising Flesh Titan far above. My spell burned straight through the arm holding Severin Denor, warping the air around it with heat as it soared into the sky. The wretched arm began to fall as it was rent from the shoulder. I bent my knees, feeling the mana coursing through them, the cracks in my telekinetic shroud smoothed over, the increased mana flow simmering through my body filling in the gaps like putty. I leapt. One moment I was 100 feet below the building, looking up as the limb made of rotting corpses tumbled through the air. The next, I was right beside it. Severin didn't have time to react as my telekinetic emblem lashed out at him. I wrapped my control around him in that brief instance, pressing down with my will. It only took a second for my empowered spell to smash through his innate defenses. The white outline seemed to fall inwards on the man's body, but I was already feeling the strain of using my acquire phase. I made a brief eye contact with the Denor air. I wondered what he thought, seeing me like this. I thought I saw a hint of awe. There was shock, of course, and something else that wormed through my mind. I flung him at the skyscraper Darren and the other mages had gone into. Severin's body smashed through the glass, disappearing into the halls beyond my sight. I had used more force than intended to do that. My body felt twitchy, jumpy as if I had been dosed with a dozen cups of coffee. My movements were less precise than I was used to, like a beginner driver that lurches on the gas pedal when driving a car for the first time. I hoped the Denor air would be all right. Lady Dawn had acted as a stabilizing presence for my mind whenever I used the will, giving me a balance I didn't realize I needed until it was gone. I'd only had the will pulsing for a few seconds, and already I felt my consciousness struggling against the overwhelming tide of insight. A single mind was not meant to hold the weight of millennia of knowledge. I needed to do this fast. I pushed off the large, corpse-like hand that used to hold Severin Denor. It smashed into the ground from the pushback of my telekinesis, and I rocketed toward the opening in the skyscraper where the rest of the mages had disappeared. I planned on making a beeline for their location. But as I perched on the edge of the skyscraper, several things stopped me. When I neared the mass of undead, my enhanced senses were able to better discern the blanket of intent that strangled each of the stumbling corpses. It was like focused puppet strings, affecting the ambient mana in a way far beyond even my best. This was focused and precise, even beyond my musical ability to project emotion. I wasn't truly seeing the intent, merely the after effects of its passing upon the ambient mana as lightning is the aftermath of electricity. But as I traced the disturbances in mana to the source, I felt a strange determination settle in my gut. The Flesh Titan stood 20 feet tall, watching me with a gaze that burned purple. But what made me pause was the burning life force in the undead's chests all around me. There were singular, tiny embers. They looked like a candle flame on the verge of extinguishing. A slight breeze should snuff it out for good. Yet the flames weren't the deep, bloody red I was used to. They were slate gray, an empty, dead color. The embers of heartfire that stared back at me were the color of tombstones, and where I had grown accustomed to seeing life force flare and pulse in time with heartbeats, these didn't even flicker. It was like watching a still image. It was instinctively revolting in a way I couldn't explain. This was a perversion that scraped against my soul and understanding of life force. But the greatest source of this, anti-life force, was the towering amalgamation of flesh that glared at me balefully. Instead of an ember, this one held a bonfire in its chest. And from that bonfire, all the intent nearby streamed. That thing is what's making these undead more intelligent, I realized. It's affecting their minds somehow. Does that mean the creature that slew Aelin is inside it? If I could kill this flesh beast, then these creatures would go back to their bumbling, predictable selves. Darren, Severin, Janna, and the others would have an easier time escaping a reckless charge as opposed to an organized hunt. In the time I'd taken to run over all of these realities, the Flesh Titan's hand had begun to regenerate. In a macabre display, flesh puddled and oozed toward the severed hand, slowly creating a new gray appendage. I wasn't going to let that happen. Oath floated up to my side, allowing me to wrap my fingers around the swept hilt saber. Then I rocketed toward the flesh amalgam. Plasma burned along the edge of my blade, creating the perfect instrument of death. The monster recognized my assault. The tendrils of intent around it shifted, a silent command going out through its network of undead. They turned to me, raising their hands and focusing on spells. Too slow. As I blurred toward the Flesh Titan, balls of fire, sound, and plasma appeared around me spontaneously, smashing into anything nearby. Corpses were consumed in an inferno of spellfire, their own hastily conjured shields breaking before my attacks. When something wasn't fast enough to burn before my might, it was smashed out of the way by my telekinetic pushes. The Flesh Titan swung a meaty fist at me, but I saw it coming from a mile away. I pulled on the monster's barreling strike, sliding under the blow. Simultaneously, I brought up my plasma-edged saber against the arm. It sheared through the putrid flesh like a hot knife through butter, severing the arm completely. I slid between the monstrous thing's legs, spinning as I drew the edge across its leg. The foot offered no resistance. The creature buckled, falling with a groan onto the pavilion roof. The rooftop, already shattered in several places and structurally damaged, shuddered from the impact. But I wasn't about to let my advantage go. I marched up the beast's back, ignoring the squelching, rotten feeling of putrid flesh beneath my boots. I loomed over the static gray heartfire, a flame that simultaneously burned and did not covering what must have once been a heart. I raised my saber, preparing to drive it down into the amalgam's heart. Then I felt it, a deep, hungry darkness inside my body, something twisted and churned, unfurling in the presence of its anathema. My core burned. I stumbled to the side, gasping as the basilisk in my blood began to wake. A hand burst from the back of the flesh amalgam's wide back, gray skin seeping off the arm. I felt a buildup of mana from the thing, but I was too focused on the adverse reaction my blood was having with the will suffusing my mana. A blade of wind cracked against my jaw, sending my head reeling back. My telekinetic shroud hadn't even been damaged by the blow, but I was disoriented enough already. The red chains on my arms flickered to black, then back to red. The flesh monster hit me with something hard. It impacted my gut, splintering my telekinetic shroud. All the air left my lungs as I shot off the edge of the rooftop, careening toward the ground 100 feet below. It took me a moment to gather myself. The ground was approaching fast, and there was nothing I could do to quell the basilisk inside. I had to try and focus on keeping myself alive. I thrust my hands out, pressing against the ground with telekinesis as it approached. My halt slowed immensely, but my control was still erratic without Lady Dawn's measured hand to guide my own. The stone under my feet shuddered when I finally hit the earth. I looked inward, inspecting the state of my body. I could distinctly feel my blood surging, the Vreeter lineage in my veins rebelling against the renewing power of the phoenix. A few undead nearby tried to pile onto me, attempting to keep me pinned down by their weight. I snarled, pushing out with a nova of fire. The scrabbling, worn hands went up in flames as they neared, unable to contend with my fury. A thundering crash drew my attention to the flesh amalgam. The 2-story-tall monstrosity had leapt from the edge of the building, cracking the concrete below with the weight of its body. It had regrown both its arms and the leg I'd severed. The purple eyes in the smooth, pale skull watched me with undisguised malice. "You're a persistent bastard, aren't you?" I said with a slight wheeze. I felt the bruise forming across my abs where the monster had struck me. The crystalline shards of my shroud were forming at a snail's pace. The fleshy creature roared at me. A dozen mouths appeared on its body, screeching in tandem. The sound of a putrid crowd washed over me, rotten teeth and decaying lips all echoing at once. And then a dozen hands separated themselves from the body, rising up and pointing themselves at me. I had a brief moment to widen my eyes as spells erupted from the hands in a volley. I hastily pressed outward with telekinesis, creating a barrier of pushing force. Most of the attacks were diverted by my hasty defense, pushed off course by the flow. A few nearly reached me, but a few flew straight and narrow enough they clipped off my telekinetic shroud. Yet the attacks did not relent, continuing in an unending stream. I felt my feet grind into the stone as I was slowly pushed back. I grit my teeth, then hurled off to the side. The saber arced outward like a boomerang, guided by my precise telekinesis. I could vaguely sense the impact as the blade sunk into flesh creature's skull, a sickening thunk vibrating along my channels. The attack stalled for the briefest of moments, allowing me to breathe. I jumped, twisting midair as I arced over the stream of projectiles. I felt another pinprick reaction from the basilisk blood in my veins. I could almost imagine the beast was awake, groggily observing its surroundings. Lady Dawn had worked to suppress that, too. Without her, it slowly rose to consciousness. I needed to end this fast. I dodged under another wild attack from the giant titan. Instead of trying to cut its body, I wrapped my arms around the massive thing's elbow, planted my feet, engaged my spell form, and pulled. The momentum from the colossal beast already sent it slightly off balance. With my strength enhanced by a mostly assimilated body, the greater understanding of mana from my will, and my telekinetic shroud, I was able to do something I would have never thought possible. The monstrosity lifted off the ground, then shifted as it was thrown bodily over my shoulder. I felt the fangs of the basilisk glistening in my blood, ready to drip their poison into it themselves like a wretched promise. I keeled over, gasping for breath as darkness stretched across the edges of my vision. My red chain tattoo darkened to an inky black. Then something sharp punched through my telekinetic shroud, digging into my thigh and tearing itself through. I screamed, the agony making me fall forward as thoughts of the basilisk were forgotten. Looking up, I noticed what had attacked me. A single arm had reached through the flesh of the amalgam. In its hand was a familiar, red-patterned single-edged dagger. The creature inside had stolen my dagger from where it had been lodged in the stone. And now, Promise had left a jagged cut along my leg. But the monster had miscalculated. I focused on my spell form, wrenching my dagger from the monster's grasping hand. The blade flew up, poising itself in the air over the still prone form of the flesh beast. I heaved for breath, feeling a drop of sweat break against the cobbles. Then the blade streaked downward. The hands around the amalgam's body tried to conjure shields, but I made sure to blow them apart with bursts of flame and telekinesis before they could fully form. My dagger struck like a guided missile, digging into the body and sinking deep into the tombstone Grey Heart's fire. Immediately, the creature stilled. I watched with bated breath as the grey fire slowly broke off into smaller embers, disintegrating at last. The intent that laced the air, connected to uncountable undead, frayed at the edges. Before I could witness the final grey ember of anti-life force dissipate, my grasp on my phoenix will winked out, the power retreating back into my core. But as it went, I was struck with another sensation. My core seared as the will departed, tracing a path of fire across my body. I groaned from the pain, staggering backward. My mana faltered, my ability to control my own power shaking from the agony. I coughed, falling to the pavement as my limbs spasmed. Distantly, I knew I needed to move. The undead were all around me, reeling about aimlessly at the death of their hive mind's leader. If I didn't get myself to high ground, I'd be taken. Taken like Aylin's wife had been, and turned into one of these monstrosities myself. I blinked my eyes open, trying to fight against the burning at my nexus of power. My leg was bleeding copiously, staining my trousers a deep red. All around me, fires raged in the ravaged street from the aftereffects of this battle. A shadow loomed over my prone form. Above me, a haggard, burned, and broken body looked down. Its eyes flared with weak violet light, and half the face was burned to unrecognizable sludge. A handle jutted from the creature's chest like a dead prayer. The black leather of promise seemed to offer itself to me, the blade embedded in this monster's heart. Aylin's wife or what was left of her had slowly hobbled toward me. It seemed to be slowing down, but not fast enough to die before completing its mission. The thing grasped the dagger in its chest and ripped it out without a hint of pain. It slowly, creakily, raised the dagger over my pained form. I needed to move. This thing was on death's door. If I could only get a few feet away, it would keel over before it could finish its task. I simply needed to move. I screamed internally, demanding my legs obey me, but the searing pain from my core made that nigh impossible. They twitched weakly, unwilling to obey my commands. The red steel glinted. I thought I saw an inkling of emotion in that corpse's eyes. It never spoke, but I saw a measure of triumph there. Then something blurred into my field of view, drawing a line across the creature's neck. For a beat, nothing happened. Then I watched, transfixed, as the zombie's head was severed from its body. Severin Denor's dagger returned to his hand, a slight tug on that wire giving him supernatural control. He gave me a concerned look, rushing over and trying in vain to help me to my feet. But my body slumped, the overwhelming pain from my core making my nerves unresponsive. "See, can't," I said breathily, each word that of a drowning man. Need your help." Severin grunted. "I've got you, don't worry." Misunderstanding, he hauled me over his shoulder. I groaned as he held me fast, my blood streamed from my leg, dripping onto the ground below. The Denor air picked up Promise, then wrenched oath from the skull of the amalgam. He turned toward the skyscraper, ready to jump with me on his back. "No," I creaked out. "Core, going to shatter. Mana," I ground out between shaky breaths. I felt tears pool at the edges of my eyes, my ability to think dispersing before the utter agony. God, had I ever felt something so horrid? It was as if 101 needles laced with capsaicin constantly thrust in and out along my nerves, lighting them in smoldering fire. "What?" Severin said, stalling in his steps. "What about your core?" How could I make him understand? Using my phoenix will before my body was fully assimilated always pushed forward the timetable for my next assimilation session. But now, I didn't have Lady Dawn to help me. I brushed away the thought that I just might. Her regret and earnest desire to speak which I'd felt over our bond was undeniable. Assimilate, I ground out through clenched teeth. Mana needs to be held. The body will absorb it. Else I'll break, scatter to the wind. Severin looked at me as if I were mad. Yet I didn't have the time to explain anymore. Even though I had let my will recede, even though I had released it back into my core, I could still feel the basilisk in my blood. It was awake, and it was watching. Chapter 85, To Track. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. Severin set me down near the top of a nearby building. The searing pain in my core had only intensified the longer time went on, the sensation like the ramping increase of a blowtorch along my nerves. I fought off tears as I groaned, biting my tongue hard to avoid screaming. If I screamed now, I knew I'd attract all the undead in the area. It was a constant battle to restrain myself. I was feeling slightly delirious from the pain, each movement coming in choppy spurts. Compared to what I felt from my core, the cut across my thigh was closer to a bee sting. But I was still vaguely aware of my surroundings, even if my consciousness was iffy. The moment Severin sat me down, I reluctantly forced my attention inward. What I saw made my panic rise even higher. The runes scrawled across the outer layer of my core, which usually glow the color of simmering coals, were so bright it hurt to even look at them. It felt like my core was being branded by these glyphs, each taking their time to scar the surface. I sluggishly began to pull mana from my core. I still had a little over half my reserves available, and considering my core was solid yellow, I had a significant maximum capacity. The mana complied haltingly, slowly dispersing into my body as I'd done for months now. But it wasn't enough. That was in the nature of assimilation. You could not do it alone, no matter your skill. Just as a mage must learn to act in tandem with their will, they must learn to accept the assistance of others. Do what I tried to say, before groaning. Each inhale sent more ratcheting agony through my body. I tried to say, doing, but all that came out was a strangled moan. Severin seemed to understand what I was trying to say regardless. I felt his hands on my back, his mana streaming from his palms. He recoiled almost instantly once his mana came in contact with my own. Merciful Vritra, he cursed. My mana felt like it burned. What? The mage seemed to realize I was slipping. He put his hands on my back again, and then restarted the process. His own mana hovered around my own, acting as a stabilizing force. My mana wanted to disperse, vanish into the atmosphere and break down into smaller particles. It took all of my willpower to fight through the agony. It was as if I was trying to move a muscle that had been sent through a wood chipper. Every twitch and pull tugged on my consciousness deeper into the abyss. Every sharp rise and heat made my willpower falter, chipping away at it slowly like a chisel. But as the hours wore on and the familiar process continued, the pain began to decrease. In turn, I was able to increase my output of mana. I slowly, agonizingly, pulled myself away from the brink. One day, I might succumb to such pain, but it was not today. I recognized vaguely that my body was almost fully assimilated. Between the regular use of my will speeding up the necessary processes and the utter mastery of Lady Dawn's mana control, what had taken Arthur a couple of years was almost done in a matter of months. When I finally opened my eyes, I was soaked through with sweat. My breathing was ragged, and despite the constant regeneration of mana from the feather floating in my core, I was nearing backlash so soon after suppressing the rising of the phoenix will. I could still feel my Vritra blood. Like the will, it felt like its own semi-conscious thing pulsing in my mind. Yet this one was dark. It was a shadow as much as my will was light. It was hungry, but not for anything in particular. It just sought to break things down. Break anything down. I could not afford to use my acquire phase again anytime soon. If these two opposing forces met, I did not know which would triumph. But I would lose. Severin slumped to the floor, lying sprawled out over the cold concrete. He didn't look much better off than me. His teal eyes were blown wide, a glazed expression over them as he stared up at the ceiling. Thank you, I said between gulps of air. I would have died without your help. Don't worry about it, Severin said lamely. Save me from that Titan thing. Evening the score. Without the searing pain from my core, the aching cut in my leg was a lot more noticeable. I looked down at the wound, my face twisting in concern. It was not a clean wound. The zombie that had acted as the nexus of that Titan had drawn promise across my leg, and true to form, the deformed dagger did not leave a neat cut. It looked closer to the jagged tear of a beast's jaws, making random divots into the flesh in a chunky manner. I used what slivers of mana I had left in my core to prod at my dimension ring, withdrawing several items. A long, crescent needle, a spool of thread, and some of my spare bandages. I took a deep breath, steadying my breathing. In the past few weeks of ascending, I'd built a large tolerance for pain as I relied on my healing factor. But this was going to suck. I held the curved surgical needle over my wound, clenched my teeth, and then drove it through. I grunted in pain as I drew the spool of thread through. Not willing to let myself think, I drew the needle through another part of my ragged thigh. This wound needed suturing, regardless of my healing factor. Leaving such a gnarled wound exposed would only open me up to infection, worsening the damage and more. I needed to close it fast. I worked quickly, ignoring the exhaustion in my arms. I'd done this plenty of times with Trelza, but I had never expected to stitch myself closed. Never let your hands waver, the stern surgeon's voice echoed foggily in my head. Never. I drove the needle through my thigh one last time, pulling it up before beginning to tie it off. I looped the surgeon's knot slowly, before severing the excess thread. Severin was still splayed out on the floor. When I wearily looked to the side, I noticed he had probably been watching the entire time. Do you just not feel pain? He asked, his jaw slightly agape. I don't think I've seen anyone perform surgery on themselves. I started gently wrapping my leg in the bandage, noting how it had already begun to look a little red. Considering what I was going through just a few minutes ago, I'm surprised you even asked that. I looked down at my wound. Absently, I wondered when I'd last felt this weak, this drained of energy and power. Not since Mardith used me like a plaything. Thinking of the vicar caused a surge of anger in my chest, but it was diluted by my exhaustion. I was worried that if I simply lay down, I'd fall asleep and never wake up. Severin's mouth closed slowly. Then he smiled, an unfiltered thing on his untrimmed beard. His teeth were possibly whiter than his hair. You really are the reason the relictums have been acting so strange. That power in your core, it burned me to even touch. My mana still feels warm. I never thought my mana could feel warm. I felt my shoulders slump. I was so tired of playing pretend, tired of carrying the lives of all these people on my shoulders. And of course, I couldn't keep a measly secret either, could I? I couldn't even fight off this zone. You really think so? I said sourly, looking at the ceiling. What makes you think that? I said, not really expecting an answer. Severin pulled himself up, slouching forward. He put a hand inside his ruffled teal cloak, then pulled something out. It looked like a gold pocket watch, except when the ascender flicked it open, the inside looked closer to a compass. Complex runes were scrawled on every surface inside, each flickering faintly. But on the compass's surface was something I didn't expect. A bright, burning purple dot sputtered in and out in time with the runes. Severin oriented the compass away. When it shifted, the purple dot shifted in turn. It looked like it was tracking towards. That thing tracks me, I said, my blood running cold. The implications rushed through my head immediately, drowning out all other thoughts. If any of the sovereigns got their hands on it, I'd be unable to hide. I remembered Arthur's sheer panic at the discovery of Syrah. I thought I understood him then, just a little. You've been using that to follow me somehow. Not intentionally, Severin said, noticing my panic. He brought the flickering compass to his breast. To my surprise, a smaller pinprick of purple popped up. This thing I made, it's able to detect ether. It uses a combination of powdered jinn bone, some materials that are known to interact with ether, and... The ascender shook his head. That doesn't matter, but everybody has a little bit of ether inside of them. I don't know if you know what ether is, but... I know what ether is, I said, cutting across the man impatiently. Just tell me. Okay, he said haltingly. Well, this device is able to detect that, but I usually have to put it right up to a person's chest. Except not with you. You have an absurd amount of ether inside of you for some reason. And I wanted to know why. I slumped forward, rubbing my head in my hands. If I was so easy to track, how long before somebody else figured this out? That's why you wanted to go on an ascent with me, I whispered. To see what effects I had on the tombs. Another thing occurred to me. It seemed impossible, but Arthur had never run into something that could so reliably detect ether, either. You did track me here, didn't you? I said quietly. I don't know how. I thought it was a coincidence at first. Nobody's ever been able to do it, but... A look at Severin's face told me all I needed to know. That card I gave you, he said quietly after a moment. It emits a signature that I'm able to follow. Not of mana. I can trace you through the zones you've already been through, as long as I'm only one zone behind. It happened before I was even consciously aware of it. My mind lashed out, my telekinetic emblem snatching oath and promise from the ground. My weapons lurched into the air, blurring around me in a poise to strike. I lurched to my feet, stumbling as I put weight on my legs. My body trembled with each movement, unwilling to go through more abuse. My weapons pointed themselves at Severin Denor. He didn't move, staying slumped on the floor. His eyes were trained on my weapons, but he didn't even react. After a moment, I realized I could barely sense any mana from him either. He was just as exhausted as I was, if not more. What did you see? I snarled, thinking of the zone that mimicked an American town. This was exactly what I was so terrified of. Somebody realizing my secrets, and then handing me over to the sovereigns to be picked apart. Tell me. You had a unique effect on this place, Severin said, not moving. It wasn't so much that he was arrogant, just confident. Something I've never seen before. Something I don't understand. Don't you wish to explore it? Find a way to use it? I laughed a raspy, broken laugh. I'm the reason all these people are stuck in this zone, I hissed. I thought of what the Madden Jinn said. They were making a trial for me, they said. And the strange life force I saw, the constant usage of intent across the undead. I was more certain than ever this was because of me. Aelin is dead because of me. His wife died because of me. And who knows how many more. All this has done is prove why I refused to let you join me on an ascent in the first place. I didn't even know if the unblooded party and the rest were still alive. I'd gotten the sense that the death of the Flesh Titan, and by extension what used to be Aelin's wife, had negated that intelligence boost the undead had used to such a deadly degree. But I hadn't seen the aftermath. For all I knew, all of them had been changed like Aelin's wife. Severin's face took on a strange twist. There has to be more to these tombs, he said quietly. There's something our sovereign isn't telling us, and if we can figure that out, then... He took a deep breath. You care about these people, don't you? If you could find a way to make the lives of others better, wouldn't you? If the Vritra didn't need to be such cruel masters? The way he said Vritra, with such open malice, took me aback. I'd never heard it said with such bitterness outside of Lady Dawn. And doing such a thing was dangerous, even for a high blood. Severin looked at the floor, and my sister wouldn't need to be a pawn in the Vritra's games, he mumbled quietly. I felt my control of my weapon slipping. His mention of his sister made something in me soften. I turned away, looking at the wall, anywhere but the man who had somehow tracked me here. The truth was, I didn't want to make the lives of Alacrians better. I wanted to see a semblance of earthen generosity and kindness once more. But the longer I spent in this zone, the more I felt it was gone forever. You'll fail in your quest to discover this tomb's secrets, I said with tired certainty. Severin Denor would die in the relic tombs, consumed so only his dagger and cloak remained. And Sira Denor, Severin's sister, already knew well the horrors of the world, the truth given to her by her mentor. He would not become a part of that social change he desired so deeply. You can't change this world, can't make it any better, no matter how you try. Are you telling me that? I heard Severin ask, or yourself? I turned around, looking down at the man who had saved my life not 10 minutes ago. And even before that, I would have died to what was left of Aelin's wife if it weren't for his intervention. A deep, brutal part of myself whispered it would be wiser to simply kill the man. Nobody would be able to trace it back to me, and the others would simply assume he'd been claimed by the tombs. But his offhanded, seemingly thoughtless comment a moment earlier continued to ring through my head. And my sister wouldn't need to be a pawn in the Vritra's games. I'd reasserted a vow at Norgan's grave, hadn't I, to try and make this world a bit better? I looked at promise, the warped metal proof of my current weakness. Would I let another promise be lost so quickly? My weapons shakily sheathed themselves into their scabbards. I fell slowly to the floor, the effort of putting weight on my injured leg too much to bear. I wasn't supposed to ascend alone, I said after a tense moment. My brother was supposed to join me, but he was taken from me for an act of selflessness. I thought of the reasons for Kaelin Jones' brutal butchery of my only brother. It was for saving Duenna from Loris Jones' beating. Simply protecting a middle-aged woman from abuse resulted in death, and the system protected her. There were no repercussions for Kaelin's murder of my brother under broad daylight. Severin gave me a sympathetic look, still slumped on the floor. This world just takes and takes, doesn't it? I sighed. Does anybody else have a way of tracking me through the relic tombs? Severin shook his head. No, he said. What I made here was loosely based on simulates in my own research. I haven't given it out to anyone. I blinked, refocusing on the Denor air. As I thought about it more, the implications of such a device began to mount in my head. Nobody? I queried again. Not even your scythe? Severin's face took on a repressed sneer. No, it's my own invention. With one hand, I reached into my pocket, retrieving the metal card containing the Denor's contact information. The possibilities for this technology were far, far greater than just tracking me through the relic tombs. If a man put this card down in a zone and then went through the relic tombs again, he'd be able to reliably enter the same zone twice. You could revolutionize exploration of the relic tombs, I said quietly. Make charted, predictable paths. And this incredible technology, you didn't present it to your scythe? Severin's face became more guarded. This was a prototype. There's no reason to bring it up to my side yet. Not until I have reliable tests, of course, he said a bit defensively. I looked into his teal eyes, seeing the lie for what it was. This man never intended to present this technology to his side at all. I chuckled slightly. If Severin withheld such revolutionary technology from the Vritra, not even his high blood status would protect him. It was like keeping critical information secret during a military operation, tantamount to treason. Again, I thought of Arthur's first meeting with Sira. The Vritra-blooded Lady Denor was right about one thing. If you couldn't trust somebody, mutually assured destruction was a close second. I stowed the metal card back into my pocket. What? Severin Denor said, raising a pure white brow. Not going to destroy the bug I planted on you? I'm not, I said, resting my head against the back of the wall. Because if you tell anyone about what you've seen regarding me, I'll show them this card and what it might mean. Severin sighed, standing slowly. He plodded over to me, looking down at my prone form for a moment. Then he held out his hand. You have my word that I'll keep my silence, he said. After a moment of deliberation, I reached my hand out, clasping his own and hauling myself to my feet. My leg immediately buckled, but thankfully, Severin was there to support me. He spared a glance down at my leg. Are you sure you can walk? I huffed. Just move, I said, tired. Severin rolled his eyes, but soon we were making our way through the building, hopefully toward our companions. I hope they were safe. Chapter 86, The Limping Return. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @Afra_. Torin Dane. Our journey toward where the unblooded party had gone was a slow, fitful process. Several times I had to take short rests, fighting off the need to sleep. My leg ached like the devil, forcing me to rely on the Denor Air's assistance to even move. As we slowly moved up the floors of the building, I made sure to focus on my hearing, trying to listen for any shuffling corpses. To my surprise, I heard none. Wherever we went, all we were greeted with were comatose undead, laying unresponsively on the floor. From the lingering mana around them and lack of wounds to the head or heart, I knew this hadn't been the work of the unblooded party and the others who had come through here before. What did this? I asked quietly, unnerved by the abnormal display. Severin peered down at one of the corpses, its eyes open wide and unblinking. After I ended that strange corpse that was about to kill you, all the nearby undead started acting strangely. Running into walls, writhing on the ground, or simply standing still, staring off into nothing. I didn't see what happened to them after that, but if I were to guess. Once Promise had speared the flesh titan, the thing that had been Aylin's wife had pulled itself out of the sordid wreckage, ready to finish the job. But it seemed that whatever effect it leveraged over the masses of undead didn't just break at its second death. It had a catastrophic domino effect on those under its influence, not unlike how the death of an acid beam hive mother crippled all the hornets connected to its hive mind. I looked down at one of the zombies a ways ahead of us. It appeared to be a woman, but the thinning, patchy hair that seemed to be threaded through its decaying scalp could only tell me so much. The body was missing an arm. I hadn't actually been able to recall much from the aftermath of that fight besides the pain. Thoughts of that battle made me think of the aftermath, and the very much awake beast representing my basilisk blood. I felt a shiver of fear coat my skin and goosebumps as the thing pushed against my mind. I didn't know what would happen because of this. Would the thing go back to sleep, returning to the status quo? Or was this permanent damage, caused by my recklessness and inability to trust Lady Dawn? I swallowed, turning away from the corpse. But as Severin and I walked, I was surprised as the man slowed. Considering I had an arm slung around his shoulder, his body the only thing helping me forward, I was forced to halt my pace as well. What is it? I asked, worried. I hadn't detected anything amiss, but Severin Denor had a strangely disturbed expression on his face. What do you sense? I don't sense anything, he whispered, his eyes focused on the same undead I'd stared at before. It's just, I think I recognize that body. I felt my breathing ratchet up. What? I said, some of my repressed fears about this zone rising to the surface once more. Aylin's wife had been ripped away from the Twin Frosts, only to return as that thing. You saw her die in this zone? No, Severin replied confidently, albeit slightly disturbed. But I recognize her clothing and what's left of her hair. Look, see the eroded symbol on her gambeson? That's from Blood Horcrust. I saw this woman die in a convergence zone a few months back. Her team left her body where she fell, as is tradition. I blinked, looking down at the body. This complicated my initial suspicions about how this zone got its monsters. After seeing what was left of Aylin's wife, I was thinking of calling it a commander. I had the niggling suspicion that the undead who threw themselves at us in waves were sourced directly from those fallen in this zone. But on closer scrutiny, that didn't make sense. If so many Ascenders, easily thousands, had vanished in the last few weeks, there would have been a public panic from the Ascenders Association. It would be something too big to cover up. But if the bodies were taken or maybe even recreated from those who died in other zones of the relic tombs. Are you sure? I asked, almost tripping as we carefully maneuvered around the prone bodies. I'd regained enough of my mana to maintain a weak, close clinging sound dampening shroud around the two of us. I mean, it could simply be a look-alike. I killed the beast that ripped her arm off, he said in reply, silencing any further questions. That's her. I looked forward once more. At this rate, it would take several hours more to reach the base marked as the Ainsgar Exiles hideaway, which Darren had told me he would retreat towards. I could only hope the rest of our trek would be this simple. Our speed picked up over the next few hours as I recovered my mana. Gradually, I began to use my magic as a splint for my wounded leg, using the sheathed oath as a makeshift cane. As we progressed, we eventually ran into moving corpses once more. Evidently, the range of effect the commander undead had over the nearby corpses was limited. Once we exited that sphere, our caution ratcheted up a dozen notches. But each movement still hurt. I was feeling phantom aches from my core, echoes of the hell I'd barely escaped with Severin's help. As the hours dragged on, I realized with unnerving clarity that there was no familiar buildup of mana around my wounds that preluded my healing factor. I knew that my ability to heal slowed down significantly in the wake of using my will, but this was something different. Instead of a drastic reduction in speed, there was simply nothing at all. Eventually, Severin and I started seeing traces of people's passing. Remaining steel and earthen constructs jutted out here and there, signs of quick battles and spells digging furrows into the ground dotted our path. I felt my spirits rise at these signs. And finally, Severin and I reached the outskirts of the Ainsgar Exiles base. The Exiles had set themselves up in a similar position to the Twin Frost party, at the top of the building, with defenses instated all around. I heard them before I ever saw them. And you just let them stay. I heard a familiar voice cry. Now we've lost our best chance to escape, and with what happened to Shayla, who knows if we'll have to. What did you expect me to do? Darren's voice, surprisingly angry, cut the other off. Force them to follow? We were going to be overwhelmed. Somebody had to watch our backs. So that's all you have to say? Dima replied. You couldn't help it? It was out of your control? That's not what I said, Dima. Darren cried. What should I have done? Tell me, why'd I keep failing? Quote. There was a beat of silence. Severin chose that moment to knock on the door. I immediately felt half a dozen mana signatures ramp up in response. I sent an uncertain look at the Denor Air. I didn't want to listen to that anymore, he said with a sigh. Better let them know we're alive, EH. The door opened the barest of inches, a pair of eyes staring out. They widened when they saw us. It's Lord Denor and Dane, they called, shuffling back. They're alive. Don't open that door. Darren's harsh voice thundered over. Look at their eyes. Are they still human? Quote. I cleared my throat. I'm disappointed you thought I'd die so easily, Darren, I said, amplifying my voice slightly with magic. But I really need a nap. There was a commotion on the other side of the door before it was flung open. Darren stared back, a disbelieving cast on his face. His normally neat exterior had frayed. One of the edges of his shirt was untucked from his pants and his hair looked like it had been sent through a hurricane. He scrutinized us for a moment before smiling shakily. Come on then, men. Can't leave you out in the cold. Severin helped me on, one arm still draped around his shoulder. The steady click 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 of oath's sheath on the tiled floor heralded my entry into the Exile's little base. Taking a quick glance around, I was relieved to see there were no missing people. A few had more bandages on than I last remembered, but no missing limbs or people that I could see. Dima was giving me a complicated look, standing where most were sitting or simply out cold on bedrolls. I gave her a slow nod, which she returned hesitantly. I was surprised as another person hurriedly approached. Jana had set her shield to the side, and her eyes were creased with worry. Torin, are you hurt? She looked uncertainly at my leg, noting the seeping bandages. Come on, I'll help you to a bedroll. Severin moved aside as Jana hastily draped my arm around her shoulder. Before she could move, however, I called back to Severin. Could you tell Darren about? I've got it, Torin. Take a rest. You look like you'll collapse. I nodded, allowing Jana to pull me away. She moved me to one of the available bedrolls. I almost tripped with how fast she was moving, hissing through my teeth as I put too much weight on my leg. Jana stalled. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's fine, I said tiredly. I had been up and moving for nearly 16 hours, and with my constant battling, exhausting assimilation process, I felt like I was fighting off a coma. I'm not at my best, I added shakily. The shield paused before the bedroll. Well, we aren't always, she said quietly. She let me down gently onto the roll. You were kind to me when I was weak. It is only fair to repay the favor. I swallowed, feeling uncomfortable meeting the earnest woman's eyes. Instead, I focused on something I knew. Your bandage needs to be changed, I said, noting how it had been soaked through. She looked down at the stump of her hand. With all that was happening, it must have slipped my mind. She looked up at me again. Are you sure you're fine? Do you need anything? Just rest, I lied. Thank you. The shield hovered around my roll for a few seconds longer, seeming uncertain, before standing up and marching woodenly toward where Severin was talking with Darren, Dima, and Haradal. The back of my skull hit the sad excuse for a pillow the bedroll had. But despite my utter exhaustion, I was unable to force myself to sleep. The events of the last few hours replayed in my mind. Especially the trust I'd shown Severin Denor. I did not know if it was the wisest choice. In fact, the cool, utilitarian side of my mind said it most certainly wasn't. But that trust opened up other wounds I'd been forcing to the side. If I could trust Severin Denor after his betrayal, practically a stranger, how could I ignore the other? As if sensing my thoughts, a small, barren emotion traced its way over my mental tether. Just as I felt it right before asking Severin for his help with assimilating, that bit of worry and hope threaded over my bond's connection with me. Well, I sent, feeling tired yet still defiant. What do you want to say? The unseen world washed over my vision once again. Lady Dawn knelt nearby in Caesar position, her heels tucked under her thighs. Her hands were clasped over her torso, and the Asura seemed to have trouble meeting my eyes. What I did was wrong, she said slowly. I know any attempts to atone will be insufficient. I think of my time in Agrona's dungeons, and what that stolen time took from me. I never saw my son grow, or assist him in his life. And I think of what you must have lost in your own world. She turned her head away. Of what I took. I exhaled forcibly, cursing my current weakness. I wanted to punch something, to release my anger as a physical force, yet my limbs only lethargically answered my call as I slammed a fist into the tiles beside my body. You knew the pain it would cause, I thought scathingly, yet did it anyway. Lady Dawn was silent as I simmered. I wanted to degrade her, to hurl insults, calling her sincerity into question. Here was another lying deity, no better than Kezes, no better than Agrona. But I couldn't. I had felt her emotion pure as any mountain spring flow over our bond. Her regret was true. Her desire to mend our bond burned was as bright as any star in the sky. It's easier for we Asura to degrade you as lesser, Lady Dawn said, drawing my attention back to her. Makes it easy to justify lording over you, using you as we wish for our own ends. The phoenix stilled, looking down at her hands. Her feathery hair cloaked her face. I speak as if I am better than the High Sovereign, as if I am separate from his immorality and cruelty. Yet I see in myself the same callousness, the same willingness to forfeit life, no matter how small, for my own ends. My breath caught. It was my turn to look away from the phoenix now, the sincerity and pain in her words hurting something in me I didn't know could be wounded. I can't be your bond, I thought shakily. My fists clenched, my fingernails digging divots into my palm. I felt blood making my hands slick, but the pain was distant. Every single second I'm in this zone, I'm forced to look at what I've lost. The relic tombs grabs me by the scalp and peels my eyelids open, forcing me into the agony of looking at something infinitely close to what I mourn for. Yet I'll never have it. And then I turn inward and find the reason for this in my closest ally. Lady Dawn wilted. A long, painful silence stretched between us. I stared up at the ceiling, counting the drywall tiles in a vain attempt to ignore the clenching in my chest. It may be possible to sever our bond, Lady Dawn said, though the words were stone. If that is what you wish. I do not know what will happen to your soul if we try, however. Our connection runs deeper than flesh. To cut that would be to carve out a part of what makes you whole. I looked back at the phoenix. And what would that mean for you? I suspect I would finally find the beyond, she said solemnly. I kept my eyes trained on the Asura for a few moments before rolling over and turning my back on her. I don't want that, I finally thought, putting words to my emotions. For all you've done, I can't lose you, too. But I can't look at you right now. Every time I see a skyscraper or a vending machine or a simple traffic light, seeing you beside it burns me more than anything. I took a shuddering breath. I need time, please. I didn't know what this conversation meant. I didn't know how much time I needed to accept Lady Dawn back into my life. But right now, her presence only served to remind me of what I'd lost. I understand, the phoenix said quietly, a bit of inflection returning to her voice. I shall wait for when you are ready to accept me. The unseen world washed away from my vision, leaving me in the darkness of the office building once more. I ruminated on my new life as my consciousness slipped from my mind like sand. Chapter 87. To Escape. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between Asuran clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. I was awoken by a slight prodding at my shoulder. I groaned as I opened my eyes. Dima was crouching by my bedroll. Time to get up, Dane, she said. You've slept for over 12 hours. We're having a meeting here soon. 12 hours? Damn, I was exhausted yesterday. My thinking struggled to catch up as my still tired mind loped along. Can't you let a man sleep for a few minutes longer? I asked, feeling my leg ache as I tried to move it. You're needed at the discussion, Dima said, standing up. Considering your abilities are what will get us out of this hell. I lay face first in the bed for a few more moments, absently wondering what in all the hells Darren had seen in that woman to be her lover. Anyone who woke you up too early was not a good person. I sat up, brushing my hair out of my eyes. I'd need to tie it back into a short tail soon. Calling on my mana, I searched through my dimension rune for a very specific item. Finding it, I pulled it out with a flourish. The first item I'd ever found in the relic tombs that resembled my earthen life stared back at me. The crisp aluminum can with a misshapen Dunkin' Donuts label stared back, a crude orange and purple resemblance to canned coffee from my previous life. I popped the tab, savoring the satisfying hiss it made. I sniffed at the liquid inside, trying to see if it had gone bad in the month or so it had been since I'd picked up the coffee. It smelled heavenly, the familiar caffeinated brew pulling at my mind. My mouth watered as I stared at the pale brown liquid. I tilted it back, taking a sip. I closed my eyes in a bit of bliss as the liquid trailed down my throat. Just like the can it came from, the coffee was off and away. It tasted a bit too sharp, with the aftertaste not lingering as long as I'd expected. But the part that stung was that I knew there was more about this drink that was wrong, but the time I'd spent away from Earth had dulled my memory. I couldn't point out what was off about the coffee. I downed the rest of it anyway. It presumably had caffeine, and I'd been living in a semblance of my previous life for nearly a week already. A bit of bean juice wasn't enough to throw me off. When I finished the drink, I crushed the aluminum in my hands. I let the can sink back into my dimension ring before I slowly struggled to stand. My leg didn't like that, however. I had to use a few steady telekinetic pushes to make it to my feet, then use oath as a cane once more. I looked around the sparse living area the Ainsgar exiles had used, spotting the majority of the group conversing around a table a few yards away. I slowly made my way toward them, the click-clack of my sheath on the tile alerting the group. Haradal had been the one speaking, and I could see him pause as I approached slowly. Jameson and the exile's other shield I'd never learned their name hung behind their leader. The twins simmered on the side, sending glares my way. Jana stood several feet away from the twins, but she smiled slightly when my eyes passed over her. Alandra hung close to Jared, who leaned on his own shield. Darren stood at the fore, seemingly taking charge alongside Haradal. Severin leaned against a nearby support pillar, seeming disconnected from the whole thing. He gave me a nod. Since Dima seemed so happy to wake me up, I said, still feeling a bit grumpy about that, I'm betting you all need my opinion on something? Haradal nodded slowly, sparing a glance toward Severin and Jana. It's good to see you alive, Dane, he said before continuing. Jana says you told her to burn Aylin's body. You said that was how the undead added to their numbers. The man seemed to force the words out. Lord Denor refrained from telling us what he knew, saying you would be able to do it better. I paused, the final click of Oath's sheath echoing like a stone dropped through an empty cavern. I gave the Denor heir a sideways glance. It took me a while to piece it together, I said quietly. I've heard of old folktales where the dead would rise, adding the living to their number with every kill, I said, using the lie I concocted to explain my knowledge of the undead. So I didn't discount something like that happening from the start, but your accusation confirmed that suspicion. Haradal frowned. The rest of the group seemed to lean forward in nervous anticipation. What do you mean about my accusation? We were attacked by a member of the Twinfrost, the shield blinked. I think I see. Yeah, I said, exhaling. The Twinfrosts claimed to have lost a member a long time before you were eventually attacked. And considering what they lost in that encounter, I found it hard to disbelieve. So every single person, Alandra said, her voice tinged with horror, every single undead in this zone is somebody who died here. I winced. I don't think so, I said. Just the ones like Aylin's wife. The commanders. Severin can tell you more. Severin shot me a look for passing the torch to him, but he obliged after a moment. He told the group the story of how he'd stumbled across the body of a woman he saw get ripped apart, and the theory the two of us had crafted because of it. As he answered a few questions, however, I felt one of my own rise. Wait, I said, drawing the attention of all present back to me. Janna, did you burn Aylin's body? The woman cringed inward. I immediately felt guilty for what was essentially digging into an open wound, but I needed to know if we'd have to face another commander. I wasn't sure if I would be able to fight them effectively. The eyes of all were trained on the bronze skin shield for a few moments. I lost it. I had to protect the twins. I couldn't take his body with me when I needed to hold my shield. The admission seemed to crack something within the woman as she looked at the floor. And now it's going to try and kill all of us, too, a shaky voice said from the side. I turned, noting the pinched expression of Newmar Frost. Aylin's going to rise from the dead and kill us all because you couldn't hold onto a single corpse. A surprising number of people looked away or inspected the floor. Janna seemed to wither, shame radiating from her like heat off a stove. I narrowed my eyes. Newmar was wrong to blame Janna for that. I stepped forward, my cane clicking on the ground. I slowly approached Newmar and Beard, my back hunched from my injuries. Yet the boys still shied away at my approach, the intent leaking off me palpable. It's true that we'll probably have to face another commander undead, I allowed. But what isn't fair is the blame you place on the woman who keeps sacrificing for your ungrateful hides. Beard puffed out his chest slightly. And what would you know of us? You have no right to judge. I sneered. I had a brother once, I said. With my limp, my imposing height was closer to that of the twins in front of me. Yet I still felt taller. He died after protecting an innocent woman from people like you, I said with a snarl. I pointed a finger at Janna, who looked like an empty shell. That woman continues to sacrifice for you. First her hand, and now she let her friend's body be possessed by the unholy magics of this zone. Her friend who treated her with more respect than I've ever seen you display. And still, you mock her. With every word, the twins cowered more. The other mages around looked at me with unnerved expressions, a few of them seeming ashamed of their subconscious blame for Janna. I don't care about your stupid need to look big and strong. You can posture all you want, but Janna prioritized your petty, ignorant lives over the body of a dear friend. Never disrespect sacrifice. My shoulders sagged. Never, I said with a whisper. I turned on my heels. I had just slept for 12 hours, but I felt as if I could sleep for 12 more. I began to walk away, the crowd of mages parting from me as I stalked past. My magic is as potent as ever, I said, keeping my eyes forward. You can expect me to perform just as well helping you escape. You'll have your sound mage. The basilisk in me seethed. It was several hours later that the meeting dispersed. I'd kept a distance, brooding on one of the nearby couches. They'd gone through different plans, finally ironing out one that would give them the best chance of escape. The largest problem, as the group quickly realized, was not actually evading the zombies as we would move closer to the portal. No, the problem came from the massive lake that surrounded the island the portal was on. Darren suspected, and rightly in my opinion, that there would be something lurking beneath the waves, and the company still needed a reliable way across. Thus our shields and the caster the Ainsgar exiles employed would be vital. They could create a pseudo-raft for us to float on, allowing us to gradually paddle our way across. As the mages dispersed to tend to their late afternoon routines, Severin plopped down on the couch beside me. I turned a skeptical eye toward him. How good of a chance do you think we'll have to escape this zone? He asked absently. I felt very mixed feelings about the Denor heir. On one hand, he'd saved my life multiple times, putting himself in harm's way when he clearly didn't need to. Furthermore, we had an almost unspoken synergy when we fought and worked together. It reminded me painfully of the instinctual teamwork Morgan and I employed. On the other hand, he'd also stalked me through the relic tombs, having correctly deduced I would have an adverse effect on the zones I traveled through. He'd seen more of Earth than any other person on this world, save for the other reincarnates. The relic tombs are a trial, I said slowly. I remember the Madden Jin's words. We make a test for you, twin soul, to grant you insight. They present a challenge to overcome, a puzzle to solve. We just need to prove ourselves in the trial. And do you think you can? Severin asked quietly. I swallowed, watching as the many mages around us began dinner preparations. Jared conjured a flat metal sheet, using it over a fire Alandra had created to cook something I couldn't see. Jameson worked with Dima and Darren to coordinate the movement of people and the timing of food preparations. I'd had a long time to consider what the Jinn meant when he said, we make a test for you. And after the harrowing ordeals of this concrete jungle, especially what I saw in the intent around the commander undead, I had a feeling I was narrowing in on the trial of this zone. I'll have to, won't I? I said, not meeting Severin Denor's eyes. He had a far deeper grasp on the workings of these tombs than Seer ever implied. But I don't think you'll get the answers you seek. The answers we seek aren't always the answers we need, the Denor heir deflected. I have a feeling about you, Torrin Dane, and I've learned to trust my gut. I snorted. Careful with that feeling, Lord Denor, I said. I have a tendency to break promises. I grasped my dagger with my telekinesis, hovering it for dramatic effect. As you can see, the Denor heir narrowed his eyes at the Damascus-patterned red metal. That's a basilisk blood alloy, he said quietly. They're notoriously difficult to even damage. Are those finger marks? What did that to your weapon, Dane? I felt my mood sour further as I thought once more of Mardith and his stranglehold over East Fiatra. He thrashed me at my best, using me as a plaything. Then he discarded me like trash, ordering me to get stronger. To become the Kezes to his Agrona. And all the progress, all the hope the rats and I had brought to the downtrodden had vanished like smoke. I thought of the oath I'd sworn, drawing my own blood with promise. I would kill Mardith. I have my own enemies, I said vaguely, ones I need to be strong enough to kill. The Denor heir looked at the metal with an almost disbelieving expression for a while before I sheathed the dagger. Deciding I needed to change the track of my mind, I searched inside my dimension ring for something else. Finding it, I withdrew my violin case, feeling the old metal settle onto my lap. Once I clicked open the case, Severin's brow rose. I didn't take you for a musician, he said, appraising Ly. You seem too stern for it. I didn't take you for a high-blood heir, I shot back, not without humor. You seem to hate frolicking with people too much. Severin sniffed. Point made. I settled the clear wood instrument against my jaw, closing my eyes as I rested the bow across the strings. In the many days I'd been in this zone, I'd had a long time to contemplate what my music was missing. I began to play a slower, classical tune from my old life. Fur Elise drew itself from the depths of my subconscious, Beethoven's old classical piece translating beautifully to the ether beast hairs of my violin. I let myself drift deeper into my own mind. I thought of all the skills that worked together to form my unique intent-driven music. There was the ability to enforce my will on the ambient mana, commonly known as killing intent and king's force to the educated. My regular conversations with Lady Dawn over our bond gave me practice in sequestering and focusing my emotions over a narrow passage. In the relative weeks I'd spent ascending through the relic tombs, I practiced constantly with this method of conveying emotion. I'd gotten proficient, but it was lacking something that had allowed me to create the wondrous connection to the people of East Fiatra. That night I played Auld Lang Syne. But after witnessing the commander creature and the way it wielded intent through the ambient mana, I had a feeling I'd found another bit of a hole. The almost nebulous cloud that drifted around the undead constantly was a sign of muddled intent, but when the commander activated its abilities, that wafting cloud had condensed. Purpose was bestowed upon the directionless, and drive was achieved. And so I played, drawing on the vague insight I'd achieved by accident. My arm moved in slow, measured draws over the strings, echoing fast-paced chords as Fur Elise went on. I allowed my emotion to flow, not quite controlled in the way I did when communicating with Lady Dawn, yet not so free that it would muddle the waters. I exhaled as I drew out the last note. My eyes had been closed for the entirety of my piece, allowing me the focus necessary to draw from my emotion within. When I opened them, I was greeted with wide, awestruck faces from every angle. The food preparation had simply halted in its tracks. Jared's food was close to boiling over, Alandra's flame licking the side of his pan. The twins, who had been in the middle of carrying something, watched me with uncomprehending eyes. Darren hovered near the edge of the food prep area, his usual jaunty smile finally back in place. Damn, Jared said, breaking the silence and brushing his beard as he lifted his little plate higher. And I thought that bard at the Shimmerkin's Horde was good. Shows what I know. Haradal worked his jaw. What was that? Some sort of spell form that made your music so? He seemed lost for words. Compelling? Alandra offered, her eyes glazed over. Haradal nodded mutely. I cleared my throat, trying to hide the flush in my cheeks and setting my violin back into its case. No, actually, it's technically magic, I suppose, but I use intent to convey what I feel. I'm not forcing emotion onto you like some monarchs do. Severin's eyes narrowed from the side, but I ignored it. That doesn't make sense, Beard said, pushing through his shock. You touched our emotions. That was unnatural. It must be a spell form of some kind. I frowned, trying to think of an analogy. It's not, actually. When one of you sees a child crying, you feel sympathy, yeah. I said, a part of you remembers being a child yourselves. You know somewhere, deep down, what it's like to weep like that. This technique works similarly. You see what I feel and sympathize with it, except to a greater degree due to the purity of what I convey. And it's not a spell form. Any mage can use killing intent, after all. The twins exchanged uncertain glances, looking unconvinced. The lull stayed for a while, the mages out and about seeming uncertain of how they could go back to their work after my display. Eventually, however, the hustle and bustle of cooking continued. I looked down at my violin, feeling a complex web of emotions. I'd succeeded in replicating what I'd shown at the New Year's festival in its entirety, yet I was left grasping for more. I thought I could improve this even further. The commander undead, Severin said quietly. It did something similar to this, somehow. I didn't answer him, stowing my instrument back into my dimension ring. That ring held all my essentials, plus a few extras, namely, the gun replica I'd picked up on my last ascent and the glowing phoenix feather the djinn had left behind. I still was unsure of what I wanted to do with that feather. When I got the chance, I asked myself where the djinn could have possibly gotten it. Did they have some sort of connection to the hearth, or was it another conjuration of the relic tombs? Unfortunately, I wasn't sure I'd ever know. The maddened djinn who had left it behind probably wouldn't answer my questions. The existence of that old, decrepit ancient mage in that town zone raised enough questions as is. Darren sat next to me with a thump, a satisfied smile on his face. I think that was just what everyone needed to get their spirits up, Torin, he said. Thanks for that. I huffed but silently accepted the thanks. My attention, however, was drawn to Jared and Alandra as they cooked together. They'd always work well together as a team, regardless of their spats, but they seemed close tonight. The burly shield scratched at his eye patch, unbalancing the little skillet he'd made. Alandra quickly leaned over the man's lap, adjusting the skillet before it could tip. Her auburn hair draped over her face. She snapped something at Jared, who said something back. Darren followed my gaze, his smile becoming wider. You look very confused, Torin, he said. Well, yeah, I replied. Those two? I said, disbelieving. I'd sooner expect the doctrination to proclaim the dragons the true gods of this world than those two to hook up. Alandra's always tearing his hair out, and Jared's an unrepentant napper. Darren's smirk softened. Why do you think they squabble in the first place? He said, a glimmer in his eye. Love and hate are two sides of the same coin. I sighed, my mind drifting slightly as I watched Jared and Alandra do something between flirting and fighting. Jana stepped up, her lone hand holding a plate steaming with rice and vegetables. She was a large woman, easily as tall as I was, and filled out her frame better. She smiled when she caught my eye, holding the plate up. I saw you weren't cooking, she said a bit quickly, so I thought I'd make you some food. You're our sound mage, after all. We need you to keep your strength up. I blinked. Thank you, I said, accepting the plate gratefully. I kinda forgot that I should have been cooking something for myself. The bronze-skinned woman's smile widened slightly. No worries, then? I tilted my head. Why would there be? The shield shook her head, backing away. It's nothing. I hope you enjoy the food, she said, before walking back toward the cookpots. I speared a floret of some sort of vegetable that looked close to broccoli, bringing it to my mouth. Upon seeing Darren's shit-eating grin and Severin's raised brow, however, I lowered the fork. What? Darren simply smiled wider, his green eyes twinkling. Severin slumped back into his seat. What is it? I asked again, genuinely confused. You seem so confused by Jared and Alandra, Darren said slowly, savoring each word. Meanwhile, there's an Amazon warrior already cooking your meals. I dropped my fork in surprise. No, she's just being kind, I said, grasping the implication immediately. I helped her with her bandages earlier, and with the frost twin, too. She's only repaying the favor. Darren crossed his arms, raising a brow. It took a second for my words to catch up with my brain. That sounded like a sound argument in my head, not so much when spoken aloud. I huffed. Yeah, maybe that doesn't help my point, but only if you look at it through your perspective. Come on, Torin, the leader of the unblooded party said. What's holding you back from courting that lovely woman? He spared a glance behind himself, where Jana was working. If I were you, I wouldn't mind having those thighs wrapped around my... The weight of all my burdens compelled me to lash out, striking at this sore spot that Darren had inadvertently found. What's stopping you from getting with Dima again? I said a bit snappily, cutting the striker off mid-sentence. Darren looked at me, a bit of shock in his face. I looked away from my friend, immediately regretting my outburst. I took a deep, measuring breath, then let it out slowly. I'm sorry, I said quietly. That was uncalled for. It was, Darren acknowledged. Romance is a difficult topic for me, I said, feeling too ashamed to look at the leader of the unblooded party. To lash out in such a way was the height of immaturity. I don't want to talk about it. To truly fall in love with someone, you needed a level of understanding and vulnerability that this continent would never allow me. I was from another world, waging a silent war against the godlike leaders of this society. Who could sympathize with that? Who could I confide this in that would not drop me into Agranda's hands? I would never be as close to a woman as I could be. And no relationship could stand on a foundation of lies and mistruths. I let that irritation simmer in my gut silently. It was another thing that I might have had on Earth, but couldn't in Alacria. Darren gave me a somber pat on the back before standing up. He left me to brood on what I'd lost once again. Chapter 88, Mending Wounds. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vritra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alacria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alacria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Darren Orden. I walked away from Torin, feeling a strange sense of loss welling up from his words. What's stopping you from getting with Dima again? I didn't know where we went wrong, honestly. Half a decade ago, Dima and I had been on track to settle down truly. We'd met in the relic tombs 10 years ago in a convergence zone. Back then, the unblooded party hadn't even been a name worth the dirt on a high blood's boots. But she'd fit in naturally, her sense of justice and independence like the missing cog in a machine. Once things had gotten further on in our relationship, I'd even considered retiring from ascending, even though the thought of leaving behind the thrill tugged on something in my gut. And if we were to have a family, I'd need to give up my more dangerous avenues, too. And then we had the talk. I told her what I was thinking, where I'd seen our relationship heading. And Dima went dark. She cut off all contact for a year straight, avoiding me and the rest of our party. I'd gone over that conversation for years, trying to find what I'd said wrong. Had I been too forward? Had I not shown enough dedication? Every time my eyes landed on Dima, I felt that open wound smolder just a bit more. But despite all the time that had passed, I knew the woman. If I tried to push the issue, tried to broach the open gap between us, she'd hunker down. I found that grimly amusing. That was something I found attractive about her bull-headed stubbornness. If a rock thought to stand in her path, her glare would weather it down to dust, and she'd continue on as if nothing had interrupted her in the first place. But that made talking to her difficult. I moved toward her rattle. We were the two figureheads of this operation, and both of us knew it. That was the nature of leadership, standing tall so others could stand tall in turn. But the shield and I didn't always see eye to eye. Scratch that, we rarely agreed. The man was deep in the pockets of a number of named bloods I'd had legal spats with. He didn't like me, I didn't like him. But he was a leader. He recognized the necessity of working with me, regardless of our disagreements. There was a begrudging respect between us that came from shared tolerance of the other. How long do you think it'll take to prepare your team? I asked her rattle, trying to distract my mind from the thoughts of Dima. Her rattle was spooning himself a heaping of rice onto a paper plate. Even weeks later, this zone continued to baffle me. The intricate colors on simple things like paper plates felt like a waste. Colored ink was expensive. To see it constantly was weird. I'll give them a more thorough rundown of their jobs, the leader of the Ainsgar exiles affirmed. Jameson already knows how to make bridges. Just make sure your shield can match him, else we aren't avoiding any undead at all. It had taken some painful negotiations to get the exiles and Twin Frosts on board with working together. Namely, my team and I had to sacrifice part of our potential accolade cut and any claim to a relic within this zone to convince them all to work with us. I'd promised the rest of my team that I'd compensate them from my own personal reserves once we made it out, yet it still left a lump in my gut. I smirked. Jared can outmatch anything Jameson can do, friend, I said. You should cross your fingers about yourself. How many boats have you made? Her rattle, unfortunately, didn't take my bait. A shame. I know my craft, he said. He gave his food a slight taste. I refrained from asking during the meeting. He said slowly, but how did you come across this food? I felt my smirk sink slightly. There wasn't much of a point hiding that information now that we were close to an escape attempt. Torrin spotted a strange building upon entering this zone, I said. He thought it might have been a store. We didn't have much left to lose, so I took a gamble. It paid off. Her rattle looked at Torrin Dane, who was eating his food with morose slowness. The young mage had that contemplative look he wore whenever he brooded. I wondered if he realized how much he displayed his thoughts on his face. He's a strange one, her rattle said. Even for an ascender, that music he played, the man shook his head. I sympathized silently. I'd been affected by emotion rioting spells before in the courtroom, specifically in my legal battles against high-blood Patamore. The ability to inflame emotions was banned from the court floor, but between a high-blood and an unblooded, the rules became guidelines, suggestions. What Torrin had done wasn't like that. There was an element of alien influence I could feel when emotion-altering spells touched my mind. Yet what flowed into me when Torrin played his violin? My emotions were my own. I felt compelled to believe him when he said it was hypersympathy. He looks young, her rattle said absently. How long has he been an ascender? He asked. I opened my mouth to reply, then paused. I hadn't actually considered Torrin's supposed inexperience. He worked so fluidly and acted so maturely that I often forgot his age. It felt unbelievable that the young man had only been an ascender for a month or so. He acted as if he had years of experience under his belt. Sure, there were times when his inexperience showed, but those times were few and far between. And he had no academy training, either. Most ascenders would look down on another mage for not going through the conventional channels. But if he was as skilled as he was without academy training. He's always been a solo ascender, I said in response. I couldn't afford any sort of doubts in Torrin, especially now that we were about to rely on him so thoroughly for our escape. I went on an ascent with him before this. He saved my life more than one time. Her rattle took a liberal swig of booze from his wineskin. Damn, solo at that age. He might have saved our lives holding that bridge, he said. Just have to trust him again, I suppose. I watched as Alandra spilled something on Jared's light chainmail armor. She rolled her eyes, saying something to him. The shield said something back, gesturing wildly at his soaked armor. Alandra shook her head, then grabbed his tunic and began to haul him off to the bathroom nearby. I began to laugh lightly, seeing through her ploy. Sure, there were cleaning supplies in the bathroom she could use to clean off his armor. But I knew they would be in that bathroom for quite a while. My laughter died off as my eyes met with Dima's. There was a coldness there that drained that bit of amusement from me like water through a drain. What's stopping you from getting with Dima again? Torrin's scathing voice bounced around in my skull. Alandra had finally worked up the courage to make a move on Jared. I'd watched her steal glances at the shield for years, subtly hinting at her feelings. And now, in the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring, she was finally taking that step she needed. And what leader could I be if I didn't set an example for those who followed me? I snatched her rattle's wineskin from his hand as he began to tilt it back, earning an affronted shout. I ignored it, tilting it back. Warm, burning brandy washed down my throat. The alcohol churned in my stomach. I shoved the wineskin back into her rattle's hands, ignoring his glare. Squaring my shoulders, I sauntered over to where Dima oversaw the food preparations with Jana. She watched me approach imperiously. I smiled, forcing my lips wide. Hey, I said, need any help with food prep around here? Jana perked up. Yes, actually we could. We have everything we need. Dima's voice cut across Jana's words like the crack of a whip. Though the other stations could probably use help. I turned toward Jana. Dima has a point, it seems, I said. Could you give Jameson some help with the stir fry? I said hopefully. She looked ready to protest, then thought better of it. Jana looked between us, sensing the tension. The poor shield looked mightily uncomfortable, Dima's eyes boring holes into my face. I'll go do that, she said. Good luck, I said with a wave, watching her awkwardly shuffle away. Was that necessary? Dima asked. I turned back to the woman, suppressing the surge of longing in my chest. Her eyes were so piercing. So many people thought her judgmental. They were wrong. She saw the truth of things. That was why she fought so hard for those less privileged than she. She did not take half-hearted excuses. I felt my grin slip. I couldn't keep up false pretenses with this woman. I'd never been able to. To get a chance to speak with you alone, it was, I said honestly. Dima looked down at the bowl she was stirring. I didn't recognize what she was making. You should go back to planning with the others, she said. There's nothing to speak about here. I'm afraid there's nobody else I can talk to. Torrin's busy sulking on the couch, I said. Lord Denor doesn't like talking to anybody but the aforementioned Dane. The twins? I think I'd rather take a bath in Corallian blood than speak with them for too long. A slight smile flitted across Dima's face, though her bob cut covered her eyes. Progress. Just gotta keep this up. Her rattle is probably upset I took a swig from his brandy, so that's a no-go, I continued. And Alandra and Jared. Dima took a covert glance toward where our sentry and shield had once been lounging. When she saw they were gone, she gave me an uncertain look. Alandra dragged Jared off to the bathroom, I said, a knowing smile splitting my face. I think it would be very rude to insert myself into that kerfuffle. Dima turned away again. So that's what this is about, she asked. You see the others hooking up and want to fall back into old habits? I crossed my arms. No, Dima, I said quietly. I just want to know what went wrong between us. Why we're like this now. Nothing went wrong, Dima snapped. You can just keep going on your ascents, free of care. I realized I didn't have a part in that. Something went wrong, I retorted. That night, I thought. I swallowed. What did I do? How did I drive you away? Dima looked out the window, through one of the few open slits that looked out over the streets far below. Are we really going to do this? She asked, right before this final push. There's no other time to have this kind of talk, I replied. I took a step forward. Dima shifted back, keeping distance between us. I felt a little bit of my heart splinter. We don't know how our escape is going to go tomorrow. We might never get the chance to have this conversation, to get closure. We? Dima replied quietly. There isn't a we right now, Darren. It ended all those years ago. Then why does this conversation hurt you, too? I asked. If you don't care, why'd I see the same pain in your eyes? Dima met my eyes. Yes, I saw a kindred ache there. The same longing, buried deep for years. But I knew her well enough to see it there. You can never let the past lie, can you, Derry? She asked. That's what you loved about me, wasn't it? I pushed, leaning closer. This time, she didn't edge away. That I didn't let things go. I unearthed things that shouldn't have been buried. Dima shifted on her feet. Silence stretched between us for a time, the hustle and bustle of mages around us simmering in the background. For now, it was just me and her. Do you remember the first time we worked together in the high hall? She asked instead, when one of our ascending partners was falsely accused of stealing accolades. I huffed. How could I forget? It's what started everything I did after. If a high blood could bully a mage into giving up his accolades, then there was no justice in the world. Dima lifted a fork from the food, giving it a testing bite. From how she squinted and the subtle changes on her face, I knew she wasn't yet satisfied with her craft. That's when things changed for the first time, wasn't it? She said, her eyes going distant. We'd let ourselves be blind to everything for so long, but after that court case, it was too obvious. I swallowed. The mage we tried to help, an unblooded man named Kandra, had nearly his entire wealth of accolades stolen from him under the weight of the High Hall's justice. I was young and inexperienced in the games of highborns. We failed to help the poor man. I did my best not to think of what became of him after. Though we got better after our initial failures, I said, trying to buoy the mood. Bandon, Versha, Kyle, Sarah, they managed to put up a fight against the powers that tried to put them down. And it wasn't just us who did it. People learned to fight for themselves. That was the most important step. Dima paused in her preparations, looking up at me. What I saw on her face made me recoil slightly. The pain there was a knife to my chest. I love this about you, she whispered. Your drive to help people, unwilling to bend against injustice. It's what makes you you. Quote. That's me, I said stupidly, wanting to add something but feeling wrong-footed. Why was it easier to get into verbal spars with high bloods than actually talk to this woman? Dima looked down at her food. I could have sworn I saw a teardrop escape her eye and fall into the prep dishes. If we make it out of this alive, she said at last, I'll tell you why I left. You're right, you deserve to know, more than you can fathom, but not right now, I can't. I swallowed, feeling a surge in my heart. That was good, better than I'd hoped for. If we could talk, maybe we could mend what was broken. I didn't know if we'd ever reach that same level of closeness as before, but maybe. Okay, I said in a hushed tone. I'll be there for you. You know that, right? Sometimes, she said quietly, I wish you wouldn't be. Chapter 89, To the Lake. Published by web novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Elecria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Elecria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. Each time my foot came down, pain lanced up my leg. I didn't let my discomfort show on my face, pushing away the sensation. I plodded along next to Severin Denor, using my emblem as an intermittent crutch to support myself. The ever-cloudy sky cast everything in a grim haze. The world was eerily silent this far up, no wind rushing through the sky. This zone felt dead, and not just from the corpses trailing hundreds of feet below us. The whole unblooded party, the Ainsgar exiles, and what remained of the Twin Frost slowly edged along a rooftop, no sound coming from our movements. Darren and her rattle took the lead, while our many shields kept around the perimeter. There was a vibrant tension to every step we took, a collective fear lacing our thoughts. Darren peered over the ledge as we reached it, scrutinizing the ground far below. Wordlessly, he gestured toward Jared and Jameson, who stood on standby for this exact reason. The two mages stepped forward in unison, ready to enact our plans. We couldn't risk traveling over the ground, so instead we used scaffolding in the sky. The two shields raised their hands, and I felt the mana in the air react. Slowly, a bridge began to form in front of them, a strange mix of metal and ice. It slowly layered over itself, arcing from our building to the nearest skyscraper. I was reminded uncomfortably of the last time I witnessed these two create a bridge and the desperate struggle that ensued as the entire group was pursued by a horde of undead. I'd stayed behind, engaging my phoenix will to save Severin Denor from being crushed. I winced, noting the strange sensation of my basilisk blood. I didn't think I had truly manifested my Vreetra heritage. No, what had happened was something a couple of steps to the side of that. The sense of my basilisk blood was unnerving. There was this hatred in my blood that clashed with my own senses and values, driving my emotions higher than I wanted. But it was closer to a force than the bare sentience the will displayed. I had to keep a constant grasp on the will in my core. It sensed, for lack of a better word, the basilisk blood in my veins. But Lady Dawn's will wasn't nearly as out of control as the Vreetra blood was, yet these two were like alkali metals and water. Utterly incompatible on a fundamental level. The bridge finally connected to the other skyscraper across from us, metal and ice spreading out in a grasping lattice as it anchored itself silently. Our group waited for one tense moment, fear and indecision pushing at our heels. Then, at her rattle and Darren's direction, we crossed over swiftly. I spared a glance downward at the streets below. As I adapted to my telekinesis rune in this new world, one of the chief things I needed to conquer was my fear of heights. I didn't fear heights as some people did, but what I considered normal was heavily recontextualized by my ability to strengthen my body and fall from a dozen feet in the air without consequences. As I trained in the Clearwood Forest, and indeed even in this zone, I gradually wore away the nervousness I'd instinctually feel around a great ledge. Yet as I stared at the ground hundreds of feet beneath me, I realized there was another aspect of heights I hadn't desensitized myself to. Because when one was hundreds of feet in the air, it gave you a special perspective of the streets. Hundreds of undead milled about like ants, moving in a disjointed swirl of rotting limbs and broken bodies. There was a turbulent flow to how those things shifted, a strange domino effect of corpses tripping each other one after the other. I remembered a time in my previous life when hundreds of football fans stood in a cascading wave, creating a unique effect from afar. This was like a disjointed, broken version of that, a sea of grey churn down below, and I could almost imagine the scent of rotting flesh and hear the broken groans of the undead. I wasn't afraid of falling, yet I felt so small in the face of this skyborn perspective. Come on, Severin Denor said, pulling on my shoulder. I had to pry my eyes away from the bodies down below, forcing myself to follow the path laid out for us. Eyes forward, Torrin, can't have you stalling. A quick purview showed most of the group was similarly disturbed by the sight. Alandra stood near the forefront of the group, holding her strange fire map that indicated how close we were to the exit portal. And as we got closer, the density of bodies increased exponentially. As our group reached the next building, Darren smashed a hole in the window. He peered in, turning both ways, then stepped in. The rest of us followed shortly. Darren turned to Alandra, who let her spell extinguish in a flash. Dima, Janna, Beard, Numar, and Torrin, I need all of you here. We need to sweep the floor for the undead. Darren gave Haradal a glance. Anything to add? Haradal huffed. Don't let them know you're there, Warden, he said. And get back quick. We'll only have so much time. I forced myself to pick up my pace, following after the small strike squad Darren had gathered to eliminate any undead we found in our path. We moved forward quickly, darting through corridors and through office spaces. I stuck close to the strikers, muffling any noise they made as they cut down the small clusters of undead we came across. We couldn't afford to let a single sound escape, lest the monsters awaken and rush us. Beard swung his mace in an upward strike. The metal obliterated a lurching zombie's skull in a spray of viscera, painting the once pristine floors red. I could hear the crack of bone and the squelch of flesh, yet none of those sounds left our perimeter. When they reached the edge of my sound barrier, they were shredded into nothingness. An instant later, Numar vaulted over his brother's shoulder, spearing an elite zombie through with his sword. It growled as it was impaled, grasping for his face. Yet Beard was a step behind, sending his mace to the side in an arc. Another rotting head was cratered by the steel. I raised a hand, concentrating a dozen fireballs around me. With a bare moment to aim, I brought my hand down, sending my spells forward like an officer ordering a cavalry charge. Searing orange streaks engulfed undead wherever they went, the dry undead bodies going up like kindling. An onslaught of deep fire approached me from the side, funneled by the slim hallway we found ourselves in. I thrust my hand to the side, the warmth of my emblem guiding me. A flare of white engulfed the oncoming fire, the pressure forcing it to the side. The spell smashed through a wall, searing the floor and making the structure creak. Promise lurched out of its sheath, zipping toward the few elites who had worked together to conjure that spell. It embedded itself in one of the zombies' chests, shearing right past an impromptu mana barrier. The undead dropped. Then the remaining creatures did something I didn't expect. They glared at me through purple pits, then turned and began to run. No, I thought, immediately understanding what would happen if they escaped. The zombies acted on some sort of area-wide radar that was activated by sound. But if these corpses escaped and made a ruckus around other undead? I threw a burst of fire shot at the fleeing creatures as they ducked around a corner. The spray of solid fire punched through the concrete supports they grasped it for cover, small bits of flame peppering their bodies. One of them went down, a coin-sized hole seared right into its forehead. The other, however, continued to try and escape. I gritted my teeth, then slammed my telekinesis down on the floor. I lurched forward, oath whipping from my sheath. I stumbled as my foot hit the floor, the muscle buckling from the sudden pain. I ignored it, using telekinesis to yank Promise from the desiccated corpse it had impaled. Promise zipped forward once more, drawing a line across the elite's legs. The torso toppled forward as its legs were cut off, yet the undead was undeterred from what would have otherwise been a mortal wound. Its broken nails dug into the floor beneath us, attempting to drag itself forward. Oath severed its skull soon after as I exhaled. As the deformed head tumbled from decrepit shoulders, I allowed my own shoulders to slump. With every use of mana, my basilisk blood became harder to contain. It was like feeding an explosion with more kerosene, further fueling its effects. I didn't know how if ever I could find a way to pacify the thing in my veins. But that was a problem I could only face once I left the relic tombs. I looked down. A fresh spot of red was seeping through my bandages, my wound aggravated by my recent scuffle. I hissed through clenched teeth as I used Oath for support, turning slowly toward where I'd left Beard and Numar. My eyes widened in alarm. Another zombie one far in the opposite direction of where I dashed was rushing towards the stairwell. It was going to reach the edge of my sound barrier soon, and then there'd be no way to stop it from making noise. I cycled through a dozen ways I could reach the corpse. I could propel myself forward with telekinesis and piston stamp, yet my mobility was hampered by my wounded leg. I quickly settled on a solution. I wouldn't be able to reach the zombie in time with my wounded leg, but I cocked my arm back, gripping Promise's marred edge between several fingers. I lined up my sights, prepping my telekinesis emblem. I readied myself to throw the single-edged dagger, the red-layered blade hungry for another kill. I couldn't afford to be a hair off in my aim, either the head or the heart, with no in-between. Then something unexpected happened. A weapon flashed in the low electric light, cutting off the zombie's escape. Numar stood in its path, drawing his sword up to defend against a downward cut from a conjured icy blade. Beard stormed through a bare moment later as his brother held off the undead, a flash of dark, silver-streaked hair. His mace blow sent the undead tumbling back whence it came. It scrambled for purchase, ignoring the brutal cave in around its chest. Numar was faster, maneuvering around his brother and bringing his sword down onto its face. 2 brutal chops later, the undead stopped moving. I slowly lowered Promise. Numar looked up from his kill, a savage cast to his face. It slowly melted away as we locked eyes. He turned away, marching off with his brother. I wordlessly began to hobble after them, maintaining my wide area sound bubble. I watched the 2 young teens plod forward in front of me. The twins had changed since the death of Aelin. I suspected the man acted as a pillar of support to the two, even if they had regularly abused the poor man. To watch him be killed by what was once their own teammate had shaken something in them deeply. They didn't posture quite like before. Their masks had cracked, leaving only the necessity of survival, and in the wake of their last outward pillar of support, the two had turned to what was most familiar, each other. I found in them a grim reflection of my past relationship with Norgan. It was something I understood, and I think they saw that understanding in me, too. After the twins and I confirmed there were no other undead nearby, we began to return to the main group. Along the way, Janna and Dima met back up with us. Janna gave my leg a worried look, which I silently dismissed with a shake of my head. We had greater things to worry about than my wounds. When we reached Darren, it was to see him pacing nervously in front of a wide window, the rest of the party milling uncomfortably behind him. Good to see you all in one piece, he said, visibly relieved. Tell me you have good news, he added. The undead are all cleared from our path, I said, standing at the forefront of this group. But they're acting strangely, outside our normal predictions. The leader of the unblooded party gave the rest of our little strike force a cursory glance. He seemed to hold his breath. What did they do? They seemed to use tactics, Beard said quietly, looking toward me quickly. They tried to lure Lord Dane away from a stray undead, allowing that particular one to escape his bubble. Do you think there is a commander nearby? Darren asked, giving them directions and goals. Most of the attention returned to me. After all, I'd been the one to fight the last commander. I was the expert, if there could be such a thing. There isn't one, I said with certainty. When the commanders leveraged control over the undead legions, the ambient mana warped under their intent. I gradually realized that the other mages I traveled with were unable to sense how the ambient mana reacted to intent quite like I could. The commander cast a strange spell to take control of the undead. I didn't sense the same effects here. Do you have any theories as to what's happening, then? Darren asked. I paused for a moment. I don't know, I replied. It was only the elites we faced who acted erratic. Those always did act more deliberate, at least to my eyes. Elites? Darren said, testing the word. I think I see what you mean. The ones we faced, Dima spoke up, seemed to react to us with greater intelligence than before. Are you certain there was no commander, Dane? Yes, I replied, though I'm not sure what's changed. Maybe they're simply learning. Truth be told, there's a lot we don't know about this zone still. There was a brief lull in the conversation before Darren spoke up again. All right, we're most of the way to the lake now, but I've got to warn you, it's quite the sight. From all Darren had spoken of this end of zone lake, I was cautiously worried about what we might face. He hadn't gotten too good of a look before he was unable to continue onward. Our group continued our cautious trek onward for a couple more hours. Each time we entered a new building, I would join a small strike team and eliminate any undead we found in our path. The elites we faced showed basic tactics and planning just as the ones before, yet they became predictable before long. As we moved from building to building, I got bare glimpses of the area beyond. I knew we were getting closer to the lake from the sudden lack of buildings after a certain point, but the other odd occurrence was in the drop-off of undead numbers. Where on approach they numbered easily in the thousands, the last few skyscrapers barely had any patrolling around. On the streets below, their numbers thinned. It was another oddity to add to the strange reactions of the elites. This shift in expected behavior, especially so close to the end of the road, made the hair on my arm stand on end. There was something eerily wrong about this. I trailed behind the shields as we neared the last window. I knew it would look directly out onto the lake. Darren had warned us of what felt like ages ago. The mages in front of me were gaping silently out, staring at something I couldn't yet see. I frowned, feeling that worry spike. I wordlessly jostled my way past Haradal, who didn't even seem to notice my intrusion. And I immediately understood why. I stared out the window over the wide expanse, working my jaw. The still water of the lake was easily a mile in diameter, reaching far into the distance. It was ringed by hundreds of yawning steel buildings, skyscrapers competing to brush the clouds with their metal tips. Yet they were all overshadowed. For at the center of the lake was a looming spire atop a small island. It thrust into the sky like a spear, easily twice as tall as the largest building I'd seen in this zone. All around me, the other mages glued their eyes to the monument of steel with slack jaws, awed at its majesty. It cast a long, dark shadow, as if there were a sun blazing down overhead. The island it rested upon seemed far too small to support such a colossal structure, like a single man holding up the weight of the world. How? I heard someone whisper. I didn't know who, my mind having stuttered to a halt at witnessing the tower. If they could make something so grand, how did the Asura ever destroy the ancient mages? I vacantly wondered the same thing. If the Jinn had such utter mastery of the mind, of the soul, that they could take what I saw before me from my memory, how did the Indrith clan ever pose a threat to them? Because the central spire of the vast, mirror-like surface of the lake was familiar. Uncountable windows dotted the skyscraper in rows, going up in a steadily tapering sequence. Yet I didn't need to count to know that building had 102 floors exactly. The design emphasized vertical lines, giving a sense of scale to all who watched from afar. A thin, needle-like spire topped the building like a cherry, one final push to the clouds. A perfect replica of the Empire State Building waited for me, entirely separate from its world of origin. Chapter 90, Arc. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torin Dane. Darren was the first to break out of our collective reverie. He turned back to us, gesturing to the shoreline below. We gotta get down there soon, he said. I shook myself out of my surprise. The Empire State Building was intimidating, but was it truly beyond anything I'd seen here before? The ground below, however, drew more immediate attention. There are no corpses about, I said quietly. Sure enough, only the dark gray of asphalt welcomed my eyes. Instead of a zombie-infested city, I felt I was looking down upon a ghost town. There was a palpable unease traveling through the group. We'd grown used to watching out for hordes of undead down below. This zone seemed to take pleasure in planting expectations like a watching farmer, tending them and nurturing our perception. And when we thought we understood our place, our entire crop was ripped from the ground and tossed to the side. We planned for the potentiality of a horde waiting for us, Darren said. But we couldn't account for everything. This seems to work in our favor, doesn't it? The striker's words seemed to resonate with the group, instilling them with a measure of courage. So, Jared said from the side, how are we going to get down? Darren exchanged a look with me. Have you ever heard of elevators? He asked the group, a wide smile on his face. In short order, our group managed to find a set of elevators, primed and ready to take us to the ground floor. There was no elevator music on the way down. I had hated the music the last time it had scraped against my eardrums. But now the silence felt hollow, devoid of any sound or emotion whatsoever. I found myself tapping my foot against the metal floor, the claustrophobic mishmash of bodies ramping up my anxiety. When the doors finally opened, I was among the first to shove myself out. The other mages were suitably intrigued by the elevator, just as Darren had been, but I needed to occupy my mind. I scanned the bottom floor, which revealed a wide open lobby space. The ceiling was easily 30 feet above us, giving the lobby a sense of grand scale. Pristine marble floors and statuesque reception desks revealed this to be some sort of grand hotel if I hadn't been able to tell from the rooms above already. And the fact that the words, Marriott, were plastered everywhere. That was kind of a dead giveaway. All right, Darren said, stepping out in front and scanning the lobby. We need to get to the edge of the water, then Jared, Jameson, and Haradal can start forming our raft. A few people made nervous noises. Dima looked like she wanted to ask a question, but she visibly centered herself. There was something undecipherable in her eyes as she looked at the leader of the unblooded party. The group slowly moved toward the exit, eyes on every surface. I hobbled along in the center of the group, suppressing my limp the best I could as we made our way to the automatic doors. We were ready for a huge fight, too, Alandra said with a bit of a chuckle. The sentry was hanging very close to Jared, who in turn kept wary eyes forward. It's a good thing we aren't getting swarmed. I don't think we could have held off those undead hordes. Alandra's words seemed to buoy the spirits of the group. Everyone was tense at the unexpected ease of our passing, and ascenders learned to never expect the relictunes to hand them an easy escape. Don't let your guard down so easily, Haradal said with a grunt as he stepped out under the dreary sky. This zone has been nothing but hell. It's foolish to assume we'll be given any sort of reprieve. This is a trap of some sort. The mood quickly dampened, dipping even lower than it was before. How am I able to read these people's emotions so well? I wondered absently. It wasn't just gaining a sense of their body language, emotions and such. It was as if I could taste their thoughts in the air. The pervading sense of doom tingled against my senses. The undead can still swarm us. True, I spoke up, feeling the depression in the air as a physical force. Our meager band was unraveling at the seams before our escape even started. But we planned for this, yeah? Just keep your eyes on the prize. Only a little more to go. My words seemed to reach some of the men and women around me, but not nearly enough. We moved in covert silence after that, shuffling out onto the waterfront. The sand crunched under my boots, the moisture inside a strange contrast to the last time I trekked through the sand. The desert zone had been dry and extremely hot, yet here it was slightly cool with the scent of freshwater in the air. I looked up at the Empire State Building, standing tall in the center of the lake. The Testament of Steel was a menacing final goal. Alandra's little sentry spell did point toward that island colossus, yet said nothing of which floor we'd need to reach to actually exit. Would we have to scour all 102 floors? My attention was drawn from the scene as Haradal stepped forward. A wand was clutched tightly in his hands, and I felt the mana react as he began to focus on his spell forms. Jared stepped forward text, gently brushing Alandra's hand from his shoulder. Jameson, the quiet shield who had always solemnly stood by Haradal, was last to stand in position. As one, the three mages raised their weapons, a wand, a large shield, and a simple staff. Together, the mana fluctuated at their call. Slowly, ice began to spread out from the still water, creating slight ripples in the mirror-like surface. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. I turned about, expecting now to be the time when the shoe dropped. We were exposed on the beach of the lake, forced to wait for these mages to complete their spells. There was no better time for us to be attacked. Janna shifted nearby, the only other shield on standby. Severin rested his hand on his dagger, feeling the same sense of wariness. Darren watched the slowly growing ice flow with a stony expression, as if glaring at it would make it grow faster. Yet the seconds ticked by without interruption. Small waves coursed out from the center of the block of vaguely oval-shaped frozen water as it displaced the lake, casting strange distorted reflections of all the discomforted mages by the edge. I licked my lips, my hand feathering across Oath's hilt. Something had to happen now, yet I had to be missing something. The undead wouldn't simply let us escape, would they? As the ice raft slowly extended its bulk deeper into the water, Jared's touch on the construct slowly began to form. Thick metal sheets slowly slipped into place along the sides, reinforcing the edges from any potential assault. The metal spread like water flowing over the side of a bowl, slowly encompassing every side. Something's wrong about this, Severin whispered at my side. It was too quiet for anybody else to hear but me. I suspected he knew that. The relictunes won't just let us go. We're missing something crucial. Quote. We can't account for every flaw in a plan, I said quietly, parroting something Carcian had once said. Granted, the advice felt a little stale, considering what had gone wrong in our assault on the Jones distillery. We'll take it as it comes. React as we need to. It was the only advice I had to give. Very rarely had my designs ever gone well in this new world. First, my plans to slowly grow in strength were disrupted by the Jones. Then the rat had stolen me into his crew. After that, my assault on the distillery had gone horribly awry. I'd been living on the seat of my pants for the past few months already. This wasn't much different. Part of me wondered if there was some sort of life lesson I should take from this. I could imagine Hoffel drawing on his pipe, a contemplative look on his face. Buildings are never made exactly in the architect's image, he'd say. There are always places where planning breaks down. A mudslide at the construction site might ruin a foundation. Rain on an unfortunate day can wipe away all the paintwork of a week prior. Thinking of the burly shield back in Fiatra settled my resolve, allowing me to believe my own words. Severin, however, clearly wasn't nearly as soothed by my reassurances. I knew from discussions that the ice I looked at wasn't just frozen water. It was extremely dense. In fact, its mass was nearly too concentrated to float on water. Haradal and Jameson had worked to keep the central, core part of our little buoy far more concentrated than the outer layers. Such precise spellwork strained the limits of their runes, costing them precious mana and time. Yet the completed product looked like something out of the Arctic. If it weren't for the metal rimming, I would have considered it a natural sheet of ice in my previous world. All right, Haradal said, heaving for breath slightly. His hands twitched on his wand, clearly wrung from exhaustion. That should do it. We need to leave, now. The group shuffled onto the makeshift raft, the movement making it shift slightly. It was at least 30 feet from tip to tip, more than large enough for our group. The moment we were all on the ice, however, was when the first sign of change came. I heard it before I saw anything. The sound of shattering stones erupted from all around us, malformed hands thrusting their way through solid concrete in an uncountable number. I cursed, using my telekinesis to pull oath and promise from their sheaths. Simultaneously, I prepared a dozen fireballs around me, each primed to strike anything that got too close. As undead dragged themselves from their street prisons, the mages around me were quick to react. Our three large area shields Janna, Jared, and Jameson threw up their defensive barriers, and prepared for an onslaught. Meanwhile, Haradal, still noticeably weary from working on the raft spell, conjured half a dozen icy paddles. Take these, he said with a note of anxiety, gesturing wildly with the conjured items, and row for all you're worth. Yet before any of the others could grab a paddle, I intervened, latching onto each of the oars with my telekinetic emblem. Outlined in a shimmer of white, the icy oars positioned themselves on either side of our raft. I'll handle this, I said with gritted teeth, fighting against the strain of keeping so many spells active. You all take down those undead. And plant your feet. Without another minute to spare, I directed each of the paddles to dip into the water, a perfectly synchronized movement beginning to propel us forward. The men and women around me lurched, unprepared for the sudden spur of movement. Then the first salvo came. The undead at the shoreline had finally arrayed themselves against us, a loose collection of corpses lobbing meager spells our way. Gyrating spheres of earth, bullets of wind, and tendrils of electricity all created a mishmash storm of death as it sought to cover the lake in a tapestry of mana. Shields rose above our heads, made of interlocking layers of ice, metal, and earth. A shadow was cast over our little raft as our defenses blocked out the sky. Our three shields worked in tense tandem, angling their barrier so most of the projectiles would skitter off. Nothing happened for a heartbeat, then two, then three, and on the fourth erratic thundering in my chest, the shields took a deluge of attacks. From the sides, I watched as most of the spells plunked against the water harmlessly, except for spreading their own ripples. The lowest ranks of the undead had horrid aim with their spells. Yet some still struck against our protections. I heard it as dull, echoing thumps and cacophonous zaps. Our shields grit their teeth as the barrage persisted, but they gave no quarter. Our little raft moved toward the central island without further contest, skimming the new waves boldly. The undead spells were weaker than the average mage's attack, yet in such overwhelming numbers they packed a hell of a punch. Once the barrage ended, there was still taut silence. The mages aboard the little ice raft collectively held their breaths as the attack ceased. That can't be everything, a voice said shakily. There's no way they would let up. I sensed the attack coming before anybody else, the familiar nature of the spell alerting my senses. My eyes widened in alarm, but it was approaching too fast. I opened my mouth, Inkomi. A huge storm of fire crashed into the water near our position. Tremors rocked our little vessel, the sprayback sending the entire ice floe crashing across the water like a skipped stone. Water sprayed everywhere as bodies tumbled, mages losing their balance at the explosion. Wounded as my leg was, I was unable to maintain solid footing on the metal floor beneath me. I was thrown into the air as the flow churned, the disruption breaking my hold on the oars pushing us forward. I slammed back into the ice with a grunt, but grabbed Promise which hovered nearby. I stabbed it into the hull, grasping onto the dark leather hilt for purchase. Not everyone around me was so lucky. Alandra was nearly flung from the raft, but Jared's meaty hand grabbed her own, hauling her from the water. Severin had anchored himself similarly to me, holding onto the thin metallic wire that connected to his dagger. Most of the other mages were in tangles of limbs around us, yelling and crying for reprieve. But I could see with perfect clarity as Darren was launched into the water like a spring, trying desperately to reorient in the air. He hit the water with a crash, throwing another spray of water onto our vessel. He'll be fine, I thought absently. He's one of the strongest mages I know, but we need to get back up, reorganize our defense. If we don't, those attacks will come again, and... My eyes trailed upward, looking back at the shoreline. I felt my words catch in my throat, the sight there something that would stay with me to the end of my days. Thousands of undead lined the beach. Uncountable violet eyes gazed eerily toward our little raft, the sole attention of an entire army's worth of monsters focused solely on our little group. At their head, near where we had launched ourselves from the sand, were 5 large, monstrous amalgamations of flesh. 5 commander undead stood at the head of an army, glaring out at our little raft. No, I realized, feeling the weight of the intent in the air. It was a choking, viscous force. In such absurd numbers, the collective weight of their will suffused the ambient mana like a piercing blanket. They aren't focused on our group. Their eyes, each and every one of them, were focused on me alone. Fuck, I thought, my heart thundering in my chest. Darren might make his way back to the surface eventually, but we had no time to wait. With my unique advantages, I had no doubt I'd be faster underwater. I wrenched Promise free from the raft, pushing myself to my feet. I ignored the sharp pain in my leg, focusing on the necessity of getting the group back together. Oath and Promise sheathed themselves on my waist as I prepared. I spared the mages around us a glance. Only Severin was stable enough to meet my eyes. I took a deep breath, then I slammed a mindfire stamp into the ground, propelling myself into the water in front of me. I was shocked by how utterly cold the liquid was. It suffused my entire being, drenching me with a feeling that seemed to reach even my mana core. Yet I only remained surprised by the temperature for a moment. I could sense Darren's mana signature far deeper in the lake. Too deep. I reached outward with my telekinesis, pulling on the water in front of me. Simultaneously, I pushed with full force against the water behind me. I shot forward like a rocket, blurring through the water almost as fast as I did in the air. I felt a brief moment of surprise at the effectiveness of this improvised swimming method, the water streaming off my glowing telekinetic shroud in a haze. I slowly felt myself heat up as I seared through the water. I followed Darren's errant mana signature, but something about it was wrong. It was sinking fast, far too fast. If the leader of the unblooded party were safe, he'd be swimming up, not venturing deeper into the depths. I didn't have time to contemplate the implications. As fast as Darren was sinking, I was faster. I felt the burning in my lungs as I went deeper and deeper, darkness slowly overtaking my vision as the light above became distorted by hundreds of feet of water. I neared Darren's mana signature. It was getting weaker by the second, tapering off as his oxygen presumably ran out. The deepness around me was all-encompassing, and I had difficulty seeing a yard in front of my face. My eyes scanned the water, the mana reinforcing them, trying to search for the slightest contrast in the blackness. I was so close, and the light emitted by my telekinetic shroud gave me the barest of visibility. But I heard it before I saw it. Sound travels strangely in water, muting and dampening noise in a familiar way. Yet sound still travels through liquid, carrying its messages to waiting ears. And the slithering displacement of something massive brushed against my eardrums. I saw a faint shadow in the distance, pressing against my light for the briefest of moments before retreating. The barest reflection of dead scale revealed itself before my eyes before retreating. No light reached me at this depth. It was pure and utter blackness, the kind you saw in the darkest of nights. I'd often heard the sea compared to the sky, yet there were no glimmering stars to light my way or a moon to see by. But I could see something. The waves of a being moving jostled my body to the side, causing me to stall in the water. The pressure at this depth was notably high, yet my telekinetic shroud held against even this. But as the source of the movement revealed itself, I felt my telekinetic shroud was woefully inadequate. Eyes as large as my torso peered at me from the depths, slitted pupils blinking with intelligence. Their purple glow illuminated a massive, serpentine skull, rife with decaying flesh and sloughing scales. Around me, I could see the after effects of the colossal snake's body coiling against the water. And at the forefront of it all was Darren Warden, his leg trapped in the jaws of this mighty beast. Chapter 91. To Break the Water. Published by Web Novel. Discordant note, TBATE. Torrin Dane was weak, crushed under the oppressive boot of the Vreetra's strength-based society. But after the desperate last gamble of a failing deity imbues him with more knowledge than he ever dreamed of, he is forced to enter a proxy war between the Surin clans that has lasted for untold generations. Armed with knowledge of the future and the potential to change it, Torrin will have to face high bloods, corrupt churches, dangerous beasts, and power-hungry Asura to get what he needs. If he wishes to survive, he will have to alter the future in a way that will keep him and those he cares for safe from the approaching tide of war and death, all while hiding a burning secret in his core from the very leaders of the continent he lives on. For Alakria, and by extension, Torrin himself is a mere piece in a larger game between the gods. And when deities play chess with the lives of mortals as pawns, only bloodshed follows. Semi-SI into Alakria. Updates daily. Cover art commissioned by @_Afra_. Torrin Dane. I felt a deep flash of terror as I looked down at the beast. In my previous world, the largest creature to ever exist had been the blue whale. In the hundreds of millions of years of evolution Earth gave the depths of the oceans, the blue whale outclassed everything to come before it. At 100 feet in length, it dwarfed even the mightiest of dinosaurs. The water afforded creatures sizes impossible on land. And yet as I stared into the primal violet eyes of the serpent in front of me, I thought the blue whale must have been quite small. My sight was limited by the deep darkness around me, yet I could tell the serpent's head must have been at least 30 feet long. My heart thundered in my chest as I locked eyes with the thing. It paused, inspecting me with a predator's intelligence. And for the first time in an age, I felt like prey. My confrontation with Mardith was the closest thing I could compare this to, but even he treated me like an opponent to beat. This creature, it simply saw another morsel of food. Darren struggled mutely against the creature's face, but his movements were slowing. The serpent's jaws had closed around his leg, and the scent of blood wafted around my nose. It was holding onto him like a cat playing with its catch, watching their prey struggle futilely against their captivity. Darren would drown before long. I broke myself out of my frozen terror, thawing my fear with an application of magic. I needed to get him out of there. I was Darren's only chance. I shoved on the water behind me, conscious of the limited air I had in my lungs. I surged forward like a bullet, squinting my eyes against the pressure. My telekinetic shroud flared at the sudden increase in pressure, but I ignored it. I landed feet first on the serpent's upper lip. My feet sank into the monster's flesh with a strange squelch, rot and refuse bursting around my shoes as necrotic flesh gave way under my boots. Yet I focused on the leader of the unblooded party in front of me. He made the barest of movements acknowledging my presence. His eyes were glassy, his struggling growing weak. I clenched my fist, focusing on one of my tried and true template spells. The water buzzed around my hand strangely as sound mana built around my clenched fingers. After a few moments, I brought my strike down like a hammer on the nose of the monster. Noxious skin and muscle caved under my blow, the shockwaves vibrating out like a quake. The snake stirred slightly, but nothing more. It continued to drag us both downward, utterly uncaring of me. Undeterred, I brought my fist down again on its face. Again. Finally, I achieved the barest of movements. I hadn't truly hurt this titan. I'd irritated it, just like I'd been able to sense from the uncountable corpses. This thing had an air of intent about it too. The mouth began to open as my pesky attacks finally drew enough of its attention away from Darren. The striker drifted out of its mouth limply, his mana signature simmering away into the depths. I latched onto his body desperately, throwing him over my shoulder like a sack of potatoes. Without sparing the eldritch serpent another glance, I shoved on the water behind me with telekinesis. I surged upward, my lungs fighting for air. I couldn't put it off much longer. Darren sat limply on my shoulders, unresponsive. And because of the deep darkness around me, I wasn't able to see the obstacle in front of me. I crashed into a wall of solid bone and flesh, the collision sending cracks through my telekinetic shroud and making me spiral through the water. I almost let go of Darren's body, but the barest of instinct kept me clutching him tightly. Shadows writhed around me, and I realized that I'd slammed into the massive bulk of the serpent's body. Its maze-like twists and turns blocked my ascent to the surface. I recognized the sound of it shifting through the water. It was a low, liquid rumbling that seemed to seep through the entire lake. I suppressed my fear, my eyes darting around for a way out. I could feel the slit eyes of the thing boring into my back. Settling on a plan of action in my mind, I surged forward like a fish in a slipstream, rocketing up at a slight angle. When the creature tried to move its bulk in front of me once more, instead of striking my skull against the shadow of flesh, I pulled on the creature's body instead of the water. I felt myself whoop with joy inside as this allowed me to pivot around the sea serpent, zipping past its confines. I ascended at a rapid pace, the light of the surface starting to reach me. Water was one of the elements I was at a disadvantage against. It doused fire and dampened sound, two of my greatest strengths. Though spellfire could burn underwater if enough power suffused it to outpace its extinguishing, this required control I didn't always have. Something I'd picked up from the demon tree zone was that water created a barrier between flame and oxygen, both lowering its temperature and cutting off its source of fuel. But if that fuel was mana instead of oxygen, such an imbalance wasn't as stark as it first seemed. Yet I was still horribly mismatched against water, so if I wanted to survive, I needed to get out. And then I made the mistake of glancing downward. The monstrous serpent was ascending with me, murder in its slitted violet eyes. Yet with the barest hint of light, I was able to truly see the serpent's size. Its head was 3 stories long, a cruel mimicry of a snake. The body slithered behind it slowly, undulating in waves. Thin, catfish-like tendrils floated from its face, and a long frilled ridge trailed from its head all along its body. It must be hundreds of feet from head to tail, I thought with numb horror. At its widest, it was as thick as a shipping container was long. How do you even fight something like that? I asked myself, momentarily forgetting the ache in my lungs. I had used a blue whale for a comparison earlier out of instinct, yet I knew now that was an insult to this monster. It could have swallowed half a dozen blue whales without a sweat. How did the djinn expect someone to fight this thing? I briefly entertained the idea of activating my phoenix will. I didn't see any other way to beat this monster, and I wondered if I could even kill it with the backing of Lady Dawn's power. An instantaneous inspection of my body dissuaded me from that idea. The basilisk in me was coiled just as the serpent I ran from, ready to strike at the barest inflection of my bond's will. Very rarely had I ever felt such a burning surety about something, yet I knew the moment my will and my blood collided, it would be akin to an atom splitting within my core. The snake lunged for me, flaring massive jaws wide. Its rows upon rows of serrated teeth lined a jaw that seemed to swallow the world. I was never truly religious in my past life, yet I believed with all my being that the unending maw I gazed into was a portal to hell. Beyond the teeth, dozens of waiting, fleshy hands grasped and writhed in its throat, the digits seeking flesh. I darted upward in a frantic push, feeling the lack of air make my muscles stiff and my core ache. The basilisk within me seethed at the mockery of its kin. I didn't have the heart to try and force that sensation back down. But I was too slow. With Darren on my shoulder, I couldn't move with my normal speed and agility. The serpent's jaws snapped shut, just barely missing my legs. Yet the force of that massive gateway crashed shut in a resounding boom. The shockwave sent me spinning through the water once more. I made a split-second decision as I tumbled down, recognizing the futility of trying to reach the surface with Darren's body on my shoulder. I latched onto him with my telekinetic emblem, his mana resistance is pitiful in his weakened state. With barely a note of resistance from his innate defenses, I gained control of his body. I thrust my hands upward, sending Darren up like an arrow. His body careened like a missile upward, and I knew he'd reach the surface with his momentum. Part of me wondered if he'd get the bends from how deep down he went. I could only hope a mage's empowered body would fight against decompression sickness. I released Darren's body just in time. I hastily pushed myself out of the way of the snake's form, easily many times wider than the thickest redwood tree. I sensed the barest of intense beneath me, using it to maneuver my next dodge. Yet as the body passed by me, something erupted from its flesh. Like a macabre chrysalis, hands thrust from the serpent's sloughing flesh, grasping with decaying fingers. I felt a sense of déjà vu, remembering how the commander undead had manifested the spells of the other undead they'd absorbed. I tried to lurch forward once more, but a concentrated pulse of gravity sent me spinning to the side. I wasn't practiced with maneuvering underwater, and each jostling movement made me overcorrect to compensate. Waves of telekinetic pushes met the next barrage of spells, shattering them as they moved through the water. A splinter of ice cracked against my telekinetic shroud, but the damage slowly sealed over. But the spells had served their purpose. I realized it a moment too late as I looked around, noticing how the unending circling of the serpent had changed. I was surrounded on all sides by walls of wrath, the colossal snake having encompassed me from every angle. The serpent finished its knot, tightening its body in a constricting motion. I let out a breath of air as the flesh engulfed me fully, the sensation as if the atmosphere itself rejected my desire to breathe. I watched the last bubbles of air leave my lungs, panic suffusing my bones. This pressing force wasn't like a constrictor, where the combined pressure of 100 sighs slowly forced air from their prey's lungs. No, this was worse. The flesh around me was mushy and soft from the time it had spent rotting underwater. Instead of holding me firm, I was subsumed into the snake's body as it squeezed. My lungs burned as the pressure mounted. My telekinetic shroud cracked, crystalline lattices my only source of light. But my vision was darkening at the edges, my need for air finally unable to be ignored. I gasped instinctually, desperate for air, yet instead of oxygen, or even water, I took in putrid rot. The taste suffused my mouth, the stench of decay invading my nostrils and scouring my throat. I began to suffocate, not just from the pressure but from the invading blight. I thrashed, lashing out with as many spells as I could force. Fire sparked around me, and waves of sound resonated through the monster's body. Chunks of flesh were obliterated by my ripping telekinetic force, yet more putrescence rushed in to fill the gap like a dam was broken. And in turn, grasping hands manifested from nowhere, ripping and tearing at my body. I felt their cold fingertips grazing my skin. My struggles began to weaken as my lungs filled with dead flesh, my mana core fighting in vain to free me. My vision began to truly shadow, my will weakened by constant fighting. I'm going to die, I thought with absolute certainty. I'm going to drown in rot and pus, another body added to the horde. Yet something bubbled up from my core, something familiar surged to aid me, refusing to give up on me. Lady Dawn. I felt my phoenix will spread from my core, suffusing me with familiar yet unknown knowledge. The chain on my arm glowed a deep crimson, fighting against the blackness around me. The basilisk within roared in challenge. Despite our differences, despite the lingering anger I still felt for the phoenix, she refused to let me die here. They're going to tear me apart, I thought fearfully, my vision suddenly sharpening once more. The injection of power bolstered my ability to use mana to strengthen myself, fighting off the effects of suffocation. These two powers inside of me. You shall be rent apart nonetheless. Lady Dawn's voice slammed against my mind. You cannot stay here. Move, Torrin Dane. Escape this, and you may yet live. I pushed outward with an unfocused telekinetic wave. Where before flesh leaked back in to fill any gaps, now the force I was afforded kept it back like a dam holding back a river. Not wasting any time, I tore at the flesh above me with frantic telekinetic grips. Not even waiting for a passage to be made, I blasted through the flesh, emerging like some sort of broken butterfly. The water seared against my skin as I ascended at speed. But the battle within had already begun. The clash of these two powers made my mana lock up, causing me to stall. A searing pain scraped against my nerves, and I could swear I felt my body's slow descent towards ruin. Sparks of deep black fire puffed into existence. Distantly, I could feel the decay attribute mana manifesting around me, breaking down even the water. A drop of awe leaked through my horror. Decay mana wasn't just rot and plague. It wasn't a fire that scoured everything to ash. No, the decay mana arts of the Vritra clan were the weathering wind that broke the mountain. They were the crashing sea that smoothed over the earth, filing down even the sharpest of edges. This was the effects of time, the ever-turning wheel of cause and effect. Where the will inside me created and preserved, there needed to be a force of ruination. My blood itself served that opposite but needed end. Yet when my skin touched the soul fire, it burned me, too, scouring away the very flesh that rotted. My own mana burned me. The pain came a moment later as the small motes of black fire ate into my flesh. I screamed soundlessly, feeling them torch my mana channels. But the serpent was unwilling to relinquish its prey. It lunged at me again, and I flailed my arm at it wildly. A torrent of soul fire burst from my palm, eating away at the flesh around my fingers even as it reached for the undead snake. My hand fell limply as my tendons and muscles were exposed to the water. The serpent swam straight through the Vritra tinged mana, motes of soul fire clinging to its skin and eating away at its flesh. Grim white bones shone underneath as the decay mana scoured away the putrid rot with its own weathering. But not fast enough. The snake headbutted my body, and I lurched even further upward as my body cracked. Blood streamed from me as I floated up. Lady Dawn battled the basilisk in my blood, trying to keep it at bay. Yet this tempest of power wasn't something that was separate from me. It was me, and every clash between my will and my blood only served to break me further. Soul fire seared along my mana channels, scouring away my flesh. Spots of black fire sparked around me, the chains on my arm flaring and retreating in time with my rapid heartbeat. The strength in my bones which I had grown so accustomed to began to dwindle. The paths the mana knew to take no longer present. Move, Torrin Dane, pull yourself to the surface. You must. I groaned, knowing half my bones must have been broken by that single attack from the monster. Yet soul fire clung to my ribs, healing them and mending their structure as it weathered me away in other places. Feeling panicked, I pulled at the water. I lurched forward, my face reaching the surface. I coughed out rotten bile, gasping for air. My body constantly broke itself down and healed again in near equal measure, yet I was slowly hurting more and more. My own soul fire scoured away my body and healed any wounds not made by the black flames themselves. Then something wrapped around my foot, dragging me back underwater. I whirled, lashing out in a rapid movement. Plasma seared from my palm, severing a long tendril of grey goo that had latched onto my leg. Even in a lake, my spells burned hot enough to fight against the water. I turned, about to try and surface again, when my instinct screamed at me to move. A hastily erected barrier of soul fire spared me the worst of the attack. A torrent of rot streamed through the water, erupting from the giant serpent's maw. Yet I had no idea how to work with soul fire, no experience in its function. Everything I did with it was on pure survival instinct, a desperate bid to spare my own life. The same trick didn't work twice. The serpent plowed through the attack again, then whipped its body to the side. My body crunched from the glancing impact as it streamed dark blood, trailing deeper down into the depths. The serpent roared in triumph, perhaps sensing as my soul fire ate away at my body. I drifted listlessly, groaning in agony as my own body attacked itself. I felt the minutes tick by as I slowly died. Absently, I saw my own heart fire as my vision wavered. Where before it had been a roaring red, now it was flecked with black specks. My life force seemed to dwindle as my own body cannibalized itself. Do not let yourself be